Hey guys, hope you are well. So, welcome to the Anime Fictions 2.0. This is the story about what if Naruto neglected by Hinata. Part 5. Hope you loved previous parts. Check out full playlist. If you did, do subscribe for more awesome whatif. Share with your friends and enjoy them. Check out the other videos I have created. Comment down your opinion. Share with your friends. So, without wasting any time, let's jump into the fifth part. Chapter 16. Talking. Thinking mental conversation. Demon god or the like. Jutsu. A lot can happen in a month. It had been a few days since the conclusion of the semifinals and Konoha was still a hotbed of activity. Minato had kept his forces prepped for any possibility after Orochimaru's ability to infiltrate the village and not only set up a successful attack on the exams but also apparently positioned forces within the walls of Konoha themselves. The interrogation department along with the Yamanakas were running sweeps of their entire shinobi forces, while search teams of Anbu scoured the surrounding villages and borders, searching for any sign of the Sannin. However, after a few days even Jiraiya had to admit that it wasn't likely they were going to be able to locate the traitor. Minato was seated at his desk, one hand propped up so that his fingers dug into his blonde hair, while the other lay over the desk over a mess of spread out reports that had just come in on the most recent interrogations. With a small smile he saw that while Orochimaru had managed to get a few chunin into the mix, his jonin ranks seemed secure. "Thank Kami for small favors," whispered Minato as a slight breeze from behind him signaled the arrival of Jiraiya through his usual venue. Leaning up slightly, the blonde man spun his chair around slowly to see Jiraiya sitting astride the windowsill, a small concerned smile on his face as he looked down at Minato. "Geese kid, you look like hell," said Jiraiya as he looked over his student's form. Minato took a moment to look down at himself, letting out a small huff of agreement as his eyes took in his own sorry appearance. The Hokage's usual pristine white coat was covered in ink, dirt, and the small evidence of several office-setting meals. His vest was much the same, most of the pockets flaps oven or otherwise folded around form his position at his desk all day. He could only imagine what his hair and face must look like, given he had been only stopped his work long enough to splash water in his face and hadn't been able to sleep for the past few days. Taking all of this in, Minato gave a small sad little smile before looking back up to face the toad sage. "Hi, I suppose I do, but what can you expect with all that's been happening?" replied Minato, a small bit of anger in his voice as he said it. The past few days would have been hard enough on their own, but thanks to his actions along with Jiraiya, he had not had the support of Kushina to fall back on. In its absence he only felt a hollow sadness. He had even forced himself to turn all of their family photos face down, just so his mind wouldn't show him her lovely face contorted into that look of disappointment she had looked at him with. Jiraiya picked up the bite of anger in Minato's response and seemed to soften slightly at it. To see his student in such a state was painful for the man. "Well, I guess it's a good thing I'm bringing some good news then. Kami knows the kid looks like he needs it." Though Jiraiya as he looked into the tired face of his student. "I know kid, but we'll make it through this," began Jiraiya before Minato fixed him with an angry glare that froze his next words in his thought. "What the hell do you know, sensei? Why don't you tell me what you know?" started Minato, his voice a mix of anger and exhaustion that nonetheless still rang with a power belonging to a man like Minato. Jiraiya looked about to answer when Minato cut across him, continuing on before he could start up. "How about you tell me how your spy network wasn't able to locate your old teammate before he was breathing down our necks? Or here's a though, why don't you tell me what you know about having the women you love, the one you would do anything to see smile, look at you like you are some kind of monster? Or how about you tell me what you know about having everything you love in this world destroyed around you and not being able to do a damn thing about it? Tell me that, sensei," shouted Minato, his voice coming out in an angry roar that caused Jiraiya to flinch slightly, almost losing his grip on the window sill. "My daughters were attacked in that fucking forest and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. So you tell me, Jiraiya, what do you know? Tell me what I should do. Tell me." Minato finished his words, falling out near the end into something close to pleading. Jiraiya, hearing this, stepped off his window sill and towards the blonde, reaching out to grasp both the Hokage's shoulders in his hands as he did so, forcing the man to face him. "Minato, Kami kid, what the hell happened to you?" asked Jiraiya, his tone worried. Minato had been stressed about the girls and about Orochimaru, but he hadn't fallen apart like this a few days ago. The toad sage mind whirled, trying to figure out what could have happened in the past few days to bring the man to such a low. At Jiraiya's words, Minato took several steadying breaths, bowing his head slightly as he fought to gain control of himself. It took him a minute or two to regain enough composure to breathe easy and at least straighten himself against his chair a little more. Once Jiraiya was sure the blonde was stable, he leaned back himself, his eyes never leaving the blonde. "Okay Gaki, now what the hell happened?" repeated Jiraiya as he looked at the man before him. Minato drew in a deep breath before starting to tell Jiraiya of his past few days. Flashback. It's good to be back lol. After the preliminaries, Minato had paused only to congratulate his girls on their performance before heading back to the office to organize the Anbu teams that were still scouring the village and organize the investigation of his forces within the village. It had been about a day later when he had just finished sending out another team of Anbu along with Uraya to begin searching some of the outlying villages that it had happened. The first sign was a soft knock at the door that drew the blonde's tired eyes up from his desk to his office door. Muttering slightly to himself, he idly wiped away some of the exhaustion from his face as he spared a glance over at the clock on the wall to see it was around 8 in the evening. With a small sigh, he cracked his neck slightly before speaking up. "Hi, coming in." He called out, his voice a bit strained from exhaustion. For a moment he didn't think whoever it was had heard him, but a moment later the door to the office was pushed open slowly and a woman's silhouette was present in the door. Minato had to blink one before focusing and seeing a familiar tail of bright red hair that identified the woman standing before him. Without a sound, Kushina stepped into the office, her shinobi gear absent, her form covered instead by a simple green and white dress she had favored when they had first been married. The simple vestige of her in that dress was enough to almost bring tears to Minato's eyes, but he fought them down and instead put a happy smile upon his face as he looked over at his wife. Minato began to rise, but Kushina raised a hand signaling him to halt and stepped forward to sit down across from him in one of the office chairs, her hand folding across her lap as she did so, while her soft violet eyes looking at him with a sad little determination. "Kushina-chan, I'm sorry I wasn't able to talk to you after the prelims, but I had to get the forces moving, with Orochimaru out there I just couldn't risk it," said Minato, a true note of sorrow in his voice as he spoke. And he meant it, he had hated not being able to speak to Kushina, especially after the way their last conversation had ended, but the situation had him tied down. Kushina gave Minato a small shake of her head, dismissing his comment before responding. "No, Minato, I understand perfectly well where you were and why you had to be there, and I'm not angry that you had it out like you did," started Kushina, her eyes not leaving Minato's face as she spoke. Minato seemed slightly relieved at those words, but as Kushina continued, his relief faded quickly. "No, Minato, what I'm here to do is to continue where we left off that night. I'm sorry, Minato, but this isn't something I'm willing to wait on anymore," continued the reader, tone never changing from the somber tone she had been using. Minato slumped slightly in his chair at her words, idly raising one hand up to his head to rub slightly at his temples before speaking, his tone carrying with the exhaustion he was feeling. "Kushina-kami, can we please do this another time? Please, I promise that we can talk about this later, but there are bigger things happening right now," replied Minato, giving Kushina a pleading look. Kushina didn't waver in the slightest at the blonde's words, simply shaking her head once again before speaking up. "Minato, you and I both know that our promises for another time are worth nothing. We lost it the day we chose to lie to Naruto 7 years ago," replied Kushina, softly, drawing a look of slight surprise from Minato, but before he could speak the reader continued on. "I'm done waiting, Minato, you and I have hurt Naruto. We hurt Arsachi and I'm doing everything I can to make it up to him, and you don't even seem to care. And I don't understand. What happened to you, Minato? What happened to the man I loved more than life itself?" asked Kushina, her voice laced with sadness as she spoke, but never allowing it to waver. Minato froze for a second before his voice cracked out. "Kushina, we had to the village, the girls," started Minato, but once again Kushina just shook her head before looking back at Minato, her eyes carrying with them a small amount of moisture. "I know you did, Minato, but that can't be all, can it? Please tell me that you didn't do all of this for such a stupid reason," asked Kushina, her voice carrying with it an almost pleading note to it. Minato looked into her violet eyes and felt as though someone was squeezing his heart. Here was Kushina, the woman he loved, past her anger at him, past her hate and betrayal, begging him, pleading with him to tell her that he hadn't sacrificed what he had. That he hadn't changed like he had. Minato couldn't meet Kushina's eyes any longer, turning his head away from her, his mind racing. "Kushina-chan, please. Please don't look at me like that. Don't make me answer you. I've already damned myself in Naruto's eyes. I accept that, damn it, I may even deserve it, but please don't tell me that I've lost you too. Please," thought Minato as he took a few steadying breaths in an attempt to control himself. Kushina waited, never moving, just sitting there looking over at Minato, small tears running down her cheeks as she looked at Minato. "Minato," said Kushina, softly drawing the blonde's face back towards her own before continuing. "You and I have almost destroyed the most precious thing in our world. And you don't even seem to care. You almost seem to do it out of habit, like at the prelims I saw you go and congratulate the girls, but not once did I see you spare a word for Naruto. Minato, I am trying to hold our family together, I'm trying to fix my sins, but they aren't mine alone, and I can't fix your mistakes if you aren't going to be there to help me." She finished pushing herself up from her chair as the last words left her mouth. Minato looked about to move to try and signal her to stop, but Kushina raised a hand to him, once again halting the blonde hokage. I didn't come here to fight with you anymore, Minato. I didn't even come here expecting an answer out of you. But I am begging you to help me save our family." She finished, turning slowly to make her way back out of the room, the sound of her feet the only noise as she made her way to the door. Minato felt a sense of panic as he watched Kushina leaving. His mind kept screaming at him that he had made the tough choice that had to be made. While another side of him, louder than his mind, was bellowing for him to forget his damn choice, forget the prophecy, and forget the village and the world, and to stop his family from suffering any longer. As Kushina reached the door, Minato let out a choked little sound that caused her to pause, turning her head slightly to face back, obvious hope in her eyes as she looked at the blonde. "Kushina, please. Please, I'm sorry. Please," spoke Minato in a half-broken voice. Kushina looked at him for a second before her head dropped, the tears falling fresh again, her voice coming out almost as broken as Minato's. "I'm not the one you should be apologizing to, Minato. I'm just your accomplice," replied Kushina before she turned and exited the room, the door swinging shut behind her, even as her tears fell faster from her eyes. Minato in the meantime sat there in his chair like a broken man, not able to do more than let the self-loathing he felt beat down upon him. Flashback end. Jiraiya sat there for a few stunned seconds after Minato finished recounting what had happened. The ending was pretty much what anyone could guess. Minato had all but fallen apart after that night, keeping himself isolated from his family and diving into his work, trying and failing to escape the pain that was tearing him apart. After a few more moments, Minato managed to pull himself together enough to look back up to meet Jiraiya's eyes. The old man's face was stricken with sadness as she looked at the blonde before him. But he was a shinobi first and there was a world to save, so with an effort he forced himself to look past his student's pain and focus on what came next. "I'm sorry, kid, but we can't change the past. And even if we could, we shouldn't," spoke Jiraiya, drawing a fresh angry look from Minato as he spoke, but didn't allow it to slow him down. "You and I both knew what we were doing when we made our choice. We both knew that it wouldn't be easy, but that is what men like us have to do. We have to be strong enough to be hated, to take the pain and continue on, because if we don't, no one will," continued Jiraiya, taking a step back from Minato and looking down at the Hokage with a strong tone in his voice. Minato seemed to falter slightly under his sensei's gaze, his mind tracking back everything he was saying. "This is what I means to be a Hokage, kid. I told you that the night that my sensei passed. It means that you have to lay down your life, your happiness for the sake of the village, and we don't always get to do it clean. Sensei go to leave as a hero, but we all won't be that lucky. We will have to watch as we are dragged through the mud, spit upon and hated, but that is what makes us worthy of being that kind of man. I know it hurts, but without us this village, the people we know and love will be in danger, and if the cost is our own happiness, well kid, that's a price we have to pay," finished Jiraiya, fixing the blonde man with a sad look as he finished. Minato remained silent for a moment before replying, his voice with a mocking little anger twigged with it. "Oh, and what does it cost you?" spat Minato in a cruel tone towards Jiraiya, looking up to see Jiraiya with a sad little smile on his face. Jiraiya looked back at the blonde for a moment, the silence stretching out to hang over them like a cloud for several seconds. "Did I ever tell you about how Tsunade stayed free in the elemental nations after Nawaki and Dan died? Those years before she came back?" asked Jiraiya, the question causing Minato to stop for a moment, the question confusing him more than anything his sensei had ever asked him. After a second he managed to choke out a response. "What, she had her sage status, she just wandered around for a time before she came back to visit Kushina and decided to stay," replied Minato, a confused little note in his voice. Jiraiya shook his head slightly at that, the sad smile never leaving his face as he did so. 257. Spoke Jiraiya in a heavy tone, looking out the window with an apparent weight to his voice. Minato just looked at him confused for a moment before speaking. "What?" asked Minato, trying and failing to piece together what he was listening to. 257, that's the number of shinobi that I had to kill in the shadows to give her time to grieve. The number of faceless graves that are scattered over her path," said Jiraiya, clearly no hint of concern in his voice. He may have been discussing the weather for all it mattered. Minato just sat there shocked as he looked at the white-haired man's back for a second, trying to understand what he was heading. "You see, the other village figured out she was out there and in a fragile state, too great a target to pass up, so the assassins gathered and I made sure that not even one came within an inch of her. Heck, Ma and Pa had to take me to Mount Myaboku just to clean off the blood half the time. But it didn't matter, she was safe," continued Jiraiya without pausing. "Then she comes back here and I get to see her smile again with you and the girls, and you know what, I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about the nightmares, the memories, all those faces I had seen screaming as they died. It didn't matter as long as I could see her smile. But I couldn't go to her any longer. I wasn't the same man I had been. She had dedicated herself to saving life, and I had become a monster to protect her, so I had to be happy seeing her happy from the shadows." And that's what it means to truly love someone, kid. That's what it means to be a shinobi, to be willing to give up everything you love, every happy wish you could want, and throw it away for the chance that those you love can smile in a brighter world. One we can't ever be a part of. Finished Jiraiya, letting out a sad little sigh as he finished, never taking his eyes off of the window. Minato just sat there, stunned into silence by Jiraiya's words, unable to speak or move, fighting to understand what he had just heard. The toad sage slowly turned back to Minato, a sad smile still hanging on his lips as he did, and fixed the Hokage with an intense stare. So kid, it comes down to the question of how much you are willing to suffer for those you love. Because I'm willing to burn with a smile if it means that the world that she has found happiness in can go on spinning for just one more day. Said the toad sage, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Minato slightly worried just looking at it. Minato took several seconds before nodding his head as if in surrender, but even as Jiraiya moving to start reporting on what he had found, and the two sat about discussing the next step and preparing for the coming month, the same doubting voice spoke up softly from his mind before fading back to silence. Yes, the world will spin on. But will anyone want it to at such a cost? Spoke the voice even as the office became the center of work for the Hokage once again. The next day found the majority of the Namikaze and Uzumaki family all seated in the living room of their home, awaiting the arrival of Minato. The night before, Minato had sent a message to Kushina informing her that he needed to have a meeting with the whole family present, so with a bit of effort, the Redeed had managed to get all four of the children up and ready for the meeting. While Naruto, Minami, and Naruto had been easy enough to convince to head downstairs, Mito had presented a bit of an issue. The little girl could be quick, insistent about not leaving her bed in the morning, and with her chains, it was less a matter of getting her to wake up than getting her to let go of the darn thing. She had a bad habit of wrapping her chains around the mattress when she wasn't in a mood to leave. Luckily, Kushina had gotten more than a little practice handling her youngest, and within minutes she had dragged a soaking wet and pouting Mito from the room, her two chains tied up by one of Kushina's own, as she walked the girl into the bathroom to get ready. Aside from the impromptu hostage escort, Kushina had managed to get all of her children settled in the living room a few minutes before the scheduled meeting time, and so was able to relax a little, sinking back into one of the room's armchairs with a satisfied sigh. Looking around, she caught Naruto's eyes as he leaned over to ruffle Mito's hair, again making the girl turn to him with a small childish pout, which of course opened her back up for Minami to do the same along with Naruto. The scene brought a small smile to Kushina's lips, and for a moment her mind recalled the conversation she had shared with her Sachi the night after her discussion with Minato. Flashback Mark 2. While Minato had been having his come apart after his meeting with Kushina, she was busy fighting to keep in control, at least till she made it back to her room and bed. She had just entered the Namikaze residence living room when she felt a set of eyes upon her. She turned to see Naruto sitting calmly on the couch, giving her a smile that was just a bit too knowing. Before the Redeed could say a word, Naruto had pushed himself up from his chair and walked over to her, embracing her in a gentle hug as he reached her. Kushina felt her sorrow flood over her as Naruto simply held onto her. She found herself sinking slowly down to kneel on the ground, her arms around the blonde, her tears flowing out once again while she struggled to catch her breath. After a few moments she managed to steady herself enough to blink over at Naruto and mouth a single word of confusion. Naruto gave her a small smile before, with a small twitch of one finger, a small black orb the size of a marble drifted out of Kushina's hair and over to him. With a sudden flood of comprehension, Kushina realized that her pollen had been on her over the entire course of the exams. That meant that her conversation with Hitomi, and even the one that night, had been within the range for Naruto to be able to hear them. Realizing this, she turned wide eyes to her Sachi, who gave her a sad little smile and shake of his head. "Asen, you're not an accomplice, and you aren't to blame," started the blonde, giving Kushina a slightly happier smile before continuing. "You're my cousin, and you were there when I needed you most, so please don't blame yourself anymore, leave the past in the past, and smile for me, okay?" Naruto said, the smile still present on his face. For a second Kushina seemed at a loss at what to say, but before she could organize her thoughts, Naruto spoke a final phrase before going back to simple cradling the women. "And don't worry. I promise to help you fix our family. Even if it may take a while with some." Naruto finished, a slightly humorous tone in his voice as he finished that caused Kushina despite herself to break out into a smile of her own as she whispered back to the blonde boy. "Hi Sachi. We will," she replied. Flashback MK2 House Party Protocol. She gave a happy little smile as she saw her three eldest pestering Mito happily. The four of them hadn't been able to laugh like this for a long time, and even if it wasn't anything more than some sibling affection, it was enough to make Kushina believe that there was hope for her family. Her eyes drifted around the sitting room for a moment. The children were all seated across from her on the large L-shaped couch that took up one of the walls. The morning light shone in through the glass sliding door that opened to the backyard. The light falling across the room's pale wooden floor and the small table and lamps scattered about the room, where a number of photos sat their occupants smiling around the room. It was a comfortable place, and with the sound of her children's happiness, Kushina felt more at home than she had in the past few years. Meanwhile, Mito had just managed to figure out her predicament and had grabbed Naruko's outstretched hand with one of her golden chains, turning a mischievous grinning face to her elder sister, even as Naruko flashed back one of her own before pulling on the chain, yanking the little retreat into a playful hug that Mito giggled and struggled to break out of. After Mito's cheering for her at the prelims, Naruko seemed to have gotten her second wind towards trying to bond with her sister, and with a small push from Naruto, Mito had leapt into the effort as well. True, the two were still far from being close as they had been, but there was a hope there, and that seemed enough for the time. Before Mito and Naruko could go any further, and before Naruto and Minami got involved to try and save the sitting room from the coming playful spat, a bright flash of yellow announced the arrival of Minato, as well as the familiar shape of Jiraiya. The two's arrival drew everyone's eyes, even as Naruko and Mito fell off the couch, both their eyes looking sheepishly over at the two men. Minato couldn't help but crack a happy smile at the children as he cast his gaze around to find Kushina looking at him without a discernible emotion on her face. With a small effort, Minato forced himself to turn away from her, not able to meet her eyes, as he made his way over to sit in one of the room's chairs positioned so that the children were on his right and Kushina was on his left, Jiraiya taking a position opposite him while lazily leaning against a wall as he did so. For a second there wasn't any notice as the group looked at one another mostly in confusion. Something was hanging in the air between them, even if not of them could be consciously aware of it. Luckily for them, Mito was the equivalent of Quiet's archenemy, and after just a few moments of silence, she has waving her arms above her head while making small attention-getting noise like she was trying to be called on in a classroom. Everyone turned to face the girl as she let out a little huff and stretched her arms up with a kind of determination, as if willing them to call on her. After a second, Minato finally with a small note of amusement called on the girl. "Yes, Mito, what is it?" he said with a curious little smile. Mito let her arms drop, a happy smile playing across her face as she beamed at him before speaking. "Thanks, Tausen," began the girl before taking a deep breath and beginning to speak. "Kasen said you needed to have to talk to us, but I was sleepy and she dumped water on me again and then she pulled me out of bed and then Minami-chan and Nikki kept poking me and I have to see Hanabi-kun today and I'm really hungry and Naruko cheated and pulled my chain and," said Mito in a rapid fire that only young children are capable of producing. Everyone else in the room was practically frozen at the girl's rapid-fire questions, unable to get a word in edgewise. After a moment, most the group broke out into small grins at the girl's antics before Minato pushed himself up and walked over to put a hand on the hyper little girl's head, causing her to look up at him with a confused little look. "Okay, Mito, sorry for making you get up early. After we are done here I promise we'll get you something to eat, okay?" spoke Minato in a calming tone that seemed to relax her a little. Mito then looked over at his other three children, pausing a moment longer on Naruto's gaze than the others before speaking. "Now on to why I'm here," he said, moving to sit back in his chair. "First let me say how proud I am of all three of you in making it, though the prelims you all did an amazing job and made both me and your Kasen very proud." He started gaining two large smiles from Naruko and Minami, while a forced little smile from Naruto which he tried not to notice. "I wish I could say that I would be free to help train you during this break, but thanks to the incident with Orochimaru, I'm having to stay and help prep the village in case he tries to pull something again." He continued, getting small frowns from the girls and a confused little look from Naruto. "Wait, why would he be telling me this and not just Minami and Naruko? For that matter, why the heck is he even bothering to include Mito and Kasen? Something seems off." Though the blonde, while sending a small pulse over towards Kushina's pollen so that he could ask her the same question. Kushina in turn sent him back a small mental shrug in response, her own mind following much the same path as his own. "Well, I guess all we can do is wait and see," spoke up Yubi, just as lost as the others in what was going on before them. As if Minato had been able to hear them, he continued on without almost any pause. "But that doesn't mean I haven't got something lined up to help you all out," continued the blonde man with a small smile. "I've been talking to Jiraiya and the Toads, and I've managed it so that Jiraiya can take you to Mount Mayaboku to train for the month to train," said Minato, looking around at the three, who looked surprised at his words. Naruko and Minami could remember all of the stories they had heard growing up and were excited to get the chance to see the mountain for the first time. Also, there was the knowledge that it meant they were finally going to be getting to sign the Toad contract. Minato had been telling the girls that they would get to sign his contract once they had visited the mountain for the first time, so the girls' eyes were practically alight with excitement. "Tausen, does that mean we're going to get to sign your contract?" asked Naruko, excitedly bouncing up from her spot on the couch to stand up. Minami, while not as vocal, also looked over excitedly between Minato and Jiraiya. Both men smiled slightly before nodding towards the girls. "Hi Gaki, that's right, I'll be taking you to there to meet the toads before starting your training and summoning the toads." The white-haired man said, a happy little tone in his voice as he spoke, drawing the two girls' smiling face over towards him. After a second, Kushina spoke up, her tone forcibly calm. "What about Naruto?" she asked without giving away anything from her tone. Minato looked over at her without missing a beat before speaking. "Kushina, I said all, Naruto is coming too." Minato said as though the woman was asking something obvious. That caught Naruto and Kushina off guard, while even Minami and Naruto gave Minato an odd little look before letting their own excitement to move back to the forefront of their mind. The blonde's words seemed to confuse the two for a moment. Jiraiya cast Minato a small annoyed look at this. After he had gotten the blonde calmed down the night previously, he had suggested the trip as a way to both protect the girls and to get them the training they would need for the finals. Minato had agreed but had put in a condition: he wanted Naruto to go along with them for the training. Jiraiya had begun to argue, but Minato had argued that Naruto had been targeted just the same as the girls, thanks to his run-in with Kabuto. It had taken some work, but Jiraiya had eventually agreed to leave a shadow clone with the boy to look after his training while he was focused on the girls. Minato gave a heavy little smile as he looked over at Kushina and Naruto, hoping that what little he could do would be enough. Sadly, the two were still more confused than happy. Hokage-san, could you Kasen and I talk for a second?" asked Naruto, his tone betraying just how shocked he was at the whole situation. Minato seemed to falter slightly before nodding while looking down at the three girls. "Hi Naruto, Minami, Naruko, could you go outside with Jiraiya for a second while I talk with Naruto and Kushina?" asked the three. Naruko was still so excited about her future training that she just nodded before making her way over to her godfather. While Mito followed after her, giving the room a quick confused look before a poke from Naruko forced another giggle out of the girl and causing her to run after her sister. Minami was the last to leave, giving Naruto a sad look, inwardly hoping that he would be coming along with them to train, while knowing that whatever was about to be discussed would be making that a remote possibilities at best. As Minami made her way outside and the glass door shut with a snap behind her, Minato turned to face the combined look of both Naruto and Kushina, trying to keep a happy look on his face as he did so. Naruto in the meantime was looking at Minato with a slightly cocked head, as if trying to figure out exactly what he was looking at. After a moment, Naruto finally spoke. "Why Hokage-sama?" the blonde finally asked, his tone expressing nothing. Minato flinched slightly internally at his son's tone. He had hoped that getting the boy some training would be enough to avoid such questions, but his life didn't seem to be giving him a single break as of late. With a small sigh, he turned to face his fellow blonde. "Well Naruto, I thought it was about time that I started getting more involved in your training, and I wanted you and your sisters safe while Orochimaru is still out there. I'll be stopping by the mountain every few days to help with the training and making sure that your Kasen and Mito can visit," replied Minato, speaking in a hopeful tone. Naruto seemed to mull the idea over for a second before giving Kushina a sideways look. "Kasen, I'm sorry, I don't think that I can do this yet." Naruto shot to the women through their pollen connection, his voice carrying with it a heavy worry. He had promised to help fix the family, but he was still not quite ready to approach his Tausen. Kushina for her part was torn. Here was Minato apparently trying to take a step towards making it right with his Sachi, but she also saw the obvious discomfort in Naruto's eyes. He had just recently learned of the blonde's actions after all, and she herself couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort in letting someone else handle her student training. "Sachi, I don't know what to say, but don't do this for me. Just make the choice you want," replied Kushina, giving the blonde a small comforting smile as she did so. Naruto turned back to face Minato, who was ignorant of the two's conversation. After a second, Naruto spoke up. "Hokage-sama, I have to ask what kind of training I would be doing?" asked Naruto. Minato froze for a second, silently cursing at the simple question. He had been so convinced that Naruto would jump at the chance he hadn't been thinking about how to sell the training to the boy. Well, first we would have to get a feeling for your level. I mean, I saw you in the semi-finals and you did great, but we need to understand your strengths and weaknesses a little better so we can get you the best possible results," responded Minato, trying to assure the boy. However, his poor choice of words caused Naruto's face to go slightly dark, while Kushina gave Minato an incredulous look. Inside Naruto's head, a memory flashed of a small boy sitting in his bed and being promised the same thing. Those nights waiting, wondering what he had done to make his parents so disappointed in him. Next came the memories of all those times he had been left out, all that time waiting. The blonde had to bite back the anger he was feeling at that moment, forcing him to look at the floor away from the Hokage. After a few moments, Naruto managed to calm himself to respond. "I think I'd prefer staying in Konoha, Hokage-sama. I want to stay and train with Kasen and my team," replied Naruto, his tone one of forced calm. Minato gave Naruto a sad, puzzled little look as his Sachi spoke, but managed to keep his focus long enough to reply. Naruto, I know Kushina is a great teacher, but between Jiraiya and I you could catch up to the girls in no time. I know it's taken a lot of time, but don't you still want to train with me? Minato tried to reason, causing Naruto to shake his head slightly before pushing himself to his feet and moving to walk out the back door. No, Hokage-sama. That's what I used to want. The boy who waited for you is gone, and it's going to take a lot more than the same old promises to bring him back. Naruto said before opening the sliding glass door to the backyard and walking out. Minato sat there too stunned to do more than stare after the boy for a moment before turning his head to see Kushina sadly looking towards the door Naruto had left. Hey Kushina. Started Minato, an air of worry to his tone as Kushina looked over at him, her face with that same sadness etched in it that had been whenever she had looked at the blonde. This is the family you made, Minato. And Naruto's right, some empty words aren't going to change anything. Kushina finished pushing herself up to follow after Naruto, leaving Minato alone in the sitting room even as the sounds of talking drifted in from the backyard. The day passed and Naruto and Minami had said their goodbyes and headed out with Jiraiya to begin their training. Minato had authorized Kakashi to take Sasuke out for some personal training, so Team 7 was effectively absent from Konoha for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, the other teams were settling about to begin their training for the upcoming finals. Over with Team 8, the three genin were waiting in their usual training, fired for their sensei to arrive as they chatted about their matches and who they would be fighting in the coming matches. So Sakura, what do you think about facing off against Minami in the finals? Asked Yakumo as she rested her back against a nearby tree, casting her gaze up from a sketch she was working on to spy her pink-haired teammate. Sakura was over by a training post throwing a few practice jabs, but stopped as she heard Yakumo's question, turning to face her. You know, Yakumo-chan, I really haven't got a clue. I mean, all I can really do is keep working on what I already know and do my best. Replied Sakura with a small shrug. Yakumo fixed her with a wiry look that caused Yakumo to dip back behind her picture for a second before responding. Well, come on, you and Shino did great and you have to show off for teammate in the finals, I'm just wondering is all. Replied Yakumo, a little shyly, thinking back to her own match. It hadn't lasted very long. Niji had closed in on the girl before she had been able to do more than pull out one of her cards. Unfortunately, she hadn't been able to do more than receive several sharp strikes by the Hyuga that put her out of commission. Yakumo had been really embarrassed at her performance, but Kurenai and the rest of her team had been supportive of her and assured her that it was just a bad matchup and that it happens to everyone sometimes. Shino, who was sitting up in the tree that Yakumo was leaned against, stopped his examination of the tree long enough to look down at the two's conversation, his eyes catching Yakumo's drawing and focusing on it. With a smooth motion, he hopped down from the tree to land softly between his teammates, looking over at Yakumo before speaking. You don't need to be concerned, Yakumo, we both know you only want us to do well, and you don't need to feel like you have somehow failed our team. You are a valuable member and a strong shinobi. One fight does not decide your status. Spoke Shino in his usual stoic voice, getting a comforting smile from Sakura directed at Yakumo as well. Yakumo looked up over the picture and gave her teammates a thankful smile, along with a nod. Sakura walked over and gave Shino a small nudge with one of her elbows, giving the boy a knowing smile. Shino may not have been the most vocal person, but when he cared about someone he always made sure that he did what he could to look after them, and she knew it. Shino in the meantime accepted the shoulder block from Sakura without comment, but under his coat, gave an appreciative smile. So what are you drawing? Asked Sakura, stepping forward towards the girl leaning over to try and see the picture. Before she could get a look, Yakumo pulled the picture into her with a small blush on her face as she did so. This caught Sakura's attention as she smiled over at her teammate with a knowing expression. Oh, I see you're painting that forest friend of yours again. Come on, girl, we don't even know what that thing was. Joked Sakura, her tone amused as she did. Yakumo gave a huff before letting the picture away from her chest, enough for them to see the creature's big purple eyes staring up at them from the picture. Sakura gave the girl a small smile while looking down at the picture with a chuckle. I swear, Yakumo, here we have half of the rookie teams and their senseis freaking out about these things, and here you are drawing pictures of them. Chuckled Sakura as Yakumo let out an indignant little huff and turned her blushing face away from her teammate. Still, it does seem to be a mystery, whatever that thing was, it apparently brought 4 teams to a standstill alone. From what we heard from Kurenai, they weren't part of the exam, so what do you think they were? Asked Shino, looking over at Sakura and Yakumo. The two girls looked at one another for a moment before turning back to him with a shrug. I don't know either, Shino. I mean, maybe Shikamaru was right and they were some kind of new jutsu. I mean, he was right about them being mimics and all, so why not that too? Responded Yakumo, giving a small shrug as she responded. Shino nodded his head as Sakura gave a small sigh before speaking. Well, I guess we'll never know, heck, it's not like we are likely to see it again. Spoke up Sakura before she paused. As Kurenai neared, she gave a simple wave of greeting as she stepped forward to stand before her team, giving them all a small smile. "Sorry for the wait, I had to finish up something before I could get here," said Kurenai absently looking around the group. The genin shared a knowing little smile between each other before giving Kurenai a small smile. "Anyway," continued Kurenai pretending not to notice her students' knowing smiles, "I wanted to have a meeting to discuss the training for the rest of the month. Sakura, I know you have been working with Tsunade-sama recently for your training, so I am okay in letting you train with her as long as you meet with us at least twice a week so that we can keep up our team exercises," began Kurenai, causing Sakura to give her a happy little nod of thanks before Kurenai turned to Shino in turn. "The same applies to you, Shino. I know your father wants to help you in managing your third hive over the next few weeks, so just make sure that you are here a few times for training, okay?" Spoke Kurenai, getting a stoic nod from the boy as well. Finally she turned to look at Yakumo with a smile. "That leaves you and me, Yakumo. I have to say your Jinjutsu has gotten to amazing levels over the past few months and I couldn't be happier, but your match showed that we both need to work on our close quarters skills a little more. So you and I will be working with Team 10 on conditioning and weapons training. Azuma-san has agreed to help us out some, and with any luck, we will be able to up our abilities in no time." Finished Kurenai, to which Yakumo gave an enthusiastic nod of agreement. After they had finished, Kurenai set about going through some simple training exercises, getting the team stretched out and ready for the day's work. A few hours later the team was resting beside the same tree as previously, Kurenai passing out a few lunches she had brought for the team. After some simple conversation, Kurenai spied a picture hanging out of Yakumo's bag and without much effort leaned over to where the girl sat on her right and tugged out the picture. It was the one that Yakumo had been drawing earlier of the strange creature. Yakumo turned to see her sensei giving her a small knowing smile of her own that caused Yakumo to blush slightly, causing both Kurenai and Sakura to giggle happily. "Hey, give that back," said Yakumo, swiping for the picture, but the black-haired woman just pulled it up out of her reach with a chuckle. "Sorry Yaku-chan, but I have to inspect this. After all, this is a picture of a known danger to the village, I may have to confiscate it," giggled Kurenai as Yakumo folded her arms and shot a small glare at the women. "Oh well, maybe I'll draw a few pictures of you and Azuma the next time you two have a date and see how you like it," called Yakumo with a grin. It was Kurenai's turn to blush and look embarrassed as Sakura and Yakumo giggled at their sensei. After a few moments the group settled down and Kurenai handed back the picture to the girl. "Okay Yakumo, you win, but really you better be careful. That thing is apparently linked to some kind of security risk and I don't want to see you get in trouble, okay?" said Kurenai in a bit of a lecturing tone as she did so. Yakumo gave a small nod as she accepted the picture back, tucking it away, just as Shino spoke up. "I have to agree with Kurenai-sensei, Yakumo, even if that thing was helpful to us, we don't know its intentions or purpose," spoke Shino as he finished his lunch, setting down the box and pulling his coat back up over his mouth as he did so. "Beside," Sakura said in a gentile tone, "it's not likely we will be seeing whatever that thing was again, at least not if we don't go back in the forest or something," reasoned Sakura. The higher power must have been listening and decided to have fun with the girl, because just as she finished speaking a resounding crack rang out through the clearing as a black figure came hurtling through a clump of trees and skipped several times on the training field before coming to a rest a few yards away from where teammate had leapt to their feet readying for battle. The impact threw up a large dust cloud as whatever it was impacted the ground, and as teammate watched, a figure stumbled slowly out of the hole. It bore a striking resemblance to Yakumo's picture, except for the odd bits of padding that seemed to have been tied to it with mixtures of ninja wrappings and string. Teammate stared at the creature open-mouthed as the dust settled finally, and what was standing in front of them was clearly the same creature they had encountered in the forest, albeit covered in pillows and looking dazed and confused as it wobbled drunkenly trying to stay on its feet. It seemed to stop and take notice of them for the first moment, and its large purple orbs turned to see each of them in turn before it let out a happy little hum and promptly fell face forward onto the ground with a soft thump. A few moments later there was another sound of movement and Naruto came running out of the forest, followed by Mito, Hanabi and Hinata, all looking around hurriedly and spotting teammates still frozen at what they had just seen. "Oops," said Hinata quietly as she saw the whole scene before her, as Mito and Hanabi rushed by the girl with concerned shouts as the two ran up to kneel beside the downed figure that was letting out a soft hum as though it was sleeping. While teammate had been waiting for Kurenai to arrive, Team 11 along with Mito, Hanabi and Hinata had been in a secluded training field along with Tsunade and Shizune, all discussing the coming training. Kiba had already said he would meet up with the group later and was busy training with Tsume and Hana back at the compound. The group was huddled around each while glancing over to where Hanabi and Mito were busy actively preparing the seedling a short distance away. It will be okay Hinata-chan, you need to figure out your new abilities and I have faith that you will be able to manage the contract too. Spoke Hitomi in a soft voice as she looked over at her daughter. The night before Hitomi had spent time digging back through the main branch's library and had come across a few articles that dealt with the Hyuga clan's history. Unfortunately it seems that any techniques or descriptions of Hinata's new abilities were either missing or destroyed. Hitomi had been about to give up when she had stumbled across a simple scroll that she recognized from when she had been a small girl. She recalled her own cousin showing it to her once long ago. Flashback. You see this Hito-chan, this is our clan summoning contract, it's been lost to us since the time before I was your age. Spoke a soft voice even as the owner gave the little Hitomi a small pat on the head. The little girl giggled slightly before looking up at her cousin with a confused little expression on her face. Cousin, how's it lost if it's right here? Asked Hitomi, her face screwed up in a look of confusion as she asked the question. Her cousin gave a small chuckle at the girl's expression before taking her hand and leading her out of the library. Well my Hito-chan, you see the summons won't answer anyone in the family anymore, but an old story says that when the eyes of a Hyuga are opened at last the summons will answer us. Replied the woman even as Hitomi tilted her head still in confusion. Flashback end. After her cousin's time Hitomi had been one of the few to remember about the old scroll. The clan had moved on from old legends and useless scrolls. Hitomi however had managed to remember the scroll and was convinced now that Hinata would be able to bring life to the old contract. Hinata in the meantime was still puzzling over her new abilities and more than a little afraid at the possibility of it changing her. Luckily for her Naruto had been right beside her giving her a source of comfort just as he had always done. So she sat beside the blonde while the group spoke, leaning into his arm just enough so that she could feel him beside her without forcing him to hold her up. That was what she had decided, that she wouldn't lean on him anymore, but stand with him. So the Gakis look like they are just about ready to get started with the seedling. Hinata, are you ready to try this new ability out? Asked Kushina, her tone softly curious. Hinata looked over at Kushina with a small smile. Hi sensei, I'm ready I think. Replied Hinata as she leaned up from Naruto, taking a few deep breaths as she did, focusing on opening her new eyes. For a second nothing happened and then there was a faint glow as chakra gathered around the girl's head, forming into two white horns that vaguely resembled a rabbit's ears, and Hinata opened her eyes to show the shining moons of violet present in their black poles. Hinata let out a breath of air as she relaxed, still trying to get used to her new eyes and what they showed. For her everything came into sudden focus and everyone around her seemed to glow slightly with their own chakra. She no longer saw the simple lines of chakra but instead was able to see it present in everything, the air, the trees, and in the smiling faces that looked at her. It was breathtaking. Naruto for his part just smiled over at Hinata, giving her a small one-armed hug as he did before she pushed herself to her feet. So Hinata-chan, what does it feel like? Asked Shizune as she looked at her student, who she had to admit looked adorable with her new features. Hinata turned to Shizune with a small smile and she seemed to pause, trying to find the words to describe the sensation. Well, I guess it's like seeing a snowy day when the sun's out, everything just seems to glow. It's not like the Byakugan I'm used to, there isn't any blackness or line, and I can't seem to see chakra pathways with them, it's more like I just see the chakra in everything, it's kind of hard to explain. Replied Hinata in an unsure voice. Okay, well from what little I was able to get, what you're seeing is the chakra in, now the only question is what you can do with it. Said Hitomi while adopting a thinking pose. The rest of the group fell into similar positions until Jubi spoke up. Well, from what little I recall I would say that she can sustain and move chakra around without it dispersing, but I don't really know how that helps. Finished Jubi, getting a few nods from the assembled group. For a moment they sat in silence until Hitomi slapped a hand into her fist with a smile, drawing the other's eyes. That's it. She said in an apparent voice of triumph. Prepare to fill the rest of us in. Spoke up Tsunade, giving the women a small smirk. Hitomi smiled a little before turning to Hinata. Okay, there are a few moves that have stayed with the Hyuga clan since its foundations, I only know two, but if I'm right then they were likely made to work with your new eyes. Started Hitomi, drawing a few looks from the group. You see, there are two moves in particular, the Hakishimkaten and the Twin Lion Fist, that deal almost exclusively with pure chakra. The biggest issue has always been that the chakra burns out and disperses too fast and the drain on the user is intense. They have always been an issue, but if one was able to keep the chakra from dispersing, then they wouldn't likely have any issue with making the techniques work. Finish Hitomi to a small round of nods from the rest of the group. I guess that would fit, but the issue is, does Hinata know either of those techniques? Asked Kushina, looking between Hitomi and Hinata, both shaking their heads. Kushina let out a sigh at that before pushing herself to her feet and walking over to Hitomi, settling a hand on the woman's shoulder. Well, I guess that means you will be handling most of Hinata's training over this month, Hito-chan. Smiled Kushina. Hitomi gave the reed a small shove from her chair, while smiling over it where Hinata was blushing, as Naruto just kept smiling at her, while running a hand down her new horns. As the two rest of the group turned to look at the pair, Hinata let out a small giggle, as Naruto touched the base of one of her new appendages. "So my bunny-chan is ticklish there huh?" Smiled Naruto as Hinata gave him a small push, but betrayed her true feeling with a happy little giggle. For a moment Naruto and Hinata just chuckling as Naruto and her just laughed at the funny little situation they were in. Until at least they noticed the rest of the group watching them and Naruto comically jumped behind Hinata, who was turning a bright red color similar to Kushina's hair. The rest of the group gave the pair a crowd of happy little smiles before Naruto peeked out from behind Hinata to speak. "Hey you guys, I'm trying to spend some time with my bunny-chan, would you mind?" Asked Naruto in a mocking tone that got him a slight push from Hinata as he did. With that the rest let out a few chuckles as Hinata blushed slightly before Kushina called attention back over to her. "Okay you two, time to get serious, from what we saw in Hinata's match, she can mess with pure chakra like that puppeteer's strings, so I guess the next thing to see what else it works on," said Kushina while getting a few nods from the rest of the group. For the next hour the group ran through a series of tests trying to figure out what Hinata's new limits were. What they found was that Hinata's ability to move and affect chakra that was not her own was very limited, in fact the chakra strings were one of the few that could have worked as well as it did. Elemental justice seemed almost completely immune to her abilities, likewise the chakra inside a person didn't seem to be affected unless she introduced her own into it via a gentle fist strike. However, where the new eyes shined was in her own chakra manipulation, she actually was able to keep her own chakra stable for a small distance from her body, adding an extra foot of range to her gentle fist strikes. The hour was slowing down as Hinata almost collapsed from the constant effort of keeping her new technique in action. Turns out the new addition to her abilities was more taxing than her basic Byakugan, so keeping it up for long periods of time wasn't very practical. Also it didn't help that she lost the ability to see in full 350 degrees, dropping it down to a simple 180 field of vision. As a result the new abilities were something she would have to practice before implementing. Luckily their testing dummy had been fit for the task. A few minutes earlier. "Are you sure Seed-kun will be okay?" asked Mito in a voice with an obvious amount of nervousness in it. Naruto looked down at Izumoto with a smile as he leaned down to ruffle her hair slightly. "Don't worry Mito-chan, I promise Seed-kun will be just fine, he's a professional at this," assured Naruto as he looked over at the seedling that was standing out in the backyard covered in what could only be described as pillow fort armor. Mito and Hanabi had insisted that the seedling be properly protected. To that end they had covered the seedling in makeshift armor made from every spare pillow and blanket that Tsunade and Shizune had to offer. The seedling could barely move as its arms and legs were spread out so that he had to waddle around from leg to leg. As Mito looked over the seedling hummed happily as it looked over at her and Hanabi giving off a happy hum as it did so giving her a thumbs up causing Mito and Hanabi to smile happily. A moment later Mito smiled happily nodding up at Naruto, allowing Naruto to look over and give Hinata the signal. "Okay Hinata let it rip," called Naruto giving Hinata a wave from where he stood. Hinata gave him a small smile before turning around to face her target that hummed happily at her. That was before it was thrown through a tree by a blast of pure chakra that she had thrown together. A moment later Hinata had collapsed to her knees panting heavily while Mito and Hanabi rushed over to check on the seedling and Naruto ran over to check on her. After a time Hinata had managed to get up and head back over to where the rest of the group was watching from. As the group settled down for a few moments, Hitomi pulled out an old-looking scroll that had a simple white string holding it closed before passing it to Hinata. Hinata returned to normal, accepted the scroll with a smile, unrolling it in front of everyone to show a list of names only a few long. Tsunade and Shizune gave it a quick look before assuring Hitomi that it was an official contract but seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. After a bit Hinata, following Tsunade's instructions, pricked her thumb with a kunai, signing her name on the contract before setting about memorizing the different hand signs depicted on the contract. Several minutes later she was ready to try it out while the rest of the group gave her some space to try it out. With a small effort she opened her eyes again and flew through the signs before slapping her hand down and calling out in a loud voice summoning jutsu. There was a sudden eruption of white smoke from where the girl stood that momentarily covered her from and obscured her from vision. For a moment the entire clearing watched the cloud with anticipation as a low voice carried out of the cloud, ringing with some obvious cheer as it did so. "Darn, and here I thought we wouldn't ever be summoned again and by someone so small, I have to say the kids won't believe this when I tell them," spoke a voice, unfamiliar to all of them. A moment later the cloud dispersed and everyone was shocked at what was now standing in front of Hinata, looking the shocked girl up and down from where it stood. Naruto on instinct quickly grabbed Mito before she could fling herself forward to grab the creature out of sheer instinct, while Hitomi stared, her jaw hanging open at the legendary summon of the mighty and noble Hyuga clan, while Tsunade and Shizune tried to style their own, and Kushina's giggles as they looked at the being before them. What was standing before Hinata was a furry creature that stood about 7 feet in height and was wearing a dark blue vest with the kanji for strength in bright white written across its back. Across the animal's head was a white length of rope that had been tied into a headband slightly knotted on to keep it in place. The creature had what was unmistakably a large hammer that had one longer end than the second and was currently resting on the creature's shoulder. This all would have made it quite striking if it hadn't been that the creature standing there was unmistakably a black-furred rabbit. The large animal seemed to bend down to study Hinata for a moment, paying particular attention to her newest appendages before giving out a small short of apparent satisfaction. Hinata in the meantime was staring wide-eyed at the giant rabbit standing just a few feet in front and slightly above her. It's a big rabbit. Hinata's mind raced as she looked at the creature before her, a little too surprised to speak. The rabbit seemed to notice the girl's discomfort before letting out a small huff of laughter and patting the girl softly on the head with one of his massive padded hands, letting out a soft chuckle. "It's okay, little one, I'm not going to hurt you, after all you're the new holder of my contract, wouldn't do to scare you off before I let you meet the rest of the family," chuckled the rabbit in a slightly deep voice that had the majority of the group realize with the happiness radiating from it. The creature's kind words and actions allowed Hinata to steady herself slightly enough, at least to gather herself enough to speak up. "Arigato, rabbit-san," spoke Hinata, giving the summon a small quick bow as she did so. The rabbit looked down at the girl for a moment before letting out a happy laugh as that echoed across the clearing. At that moment Naruto accidentally lost hold of Mito, who shot forward like a bolt, her eyes sparkling and fixed on the giant fluffy rabbit in front of her. Before anyone including the summon could act, Mito had impacted the side of the rabbit, causing it to stagger slightly while looking down at the little redeed who had buried herself into his fur and was currently rubbing her face back and forth in the creature's fur. Everyone froze for a second before the rabbit swiped a paw down, sweeping the girl off her feet and up into the air by the scruff of her neck to stare at the girl, who smiled happily back at the rabbit. For a second the two looked at each other before it let out a happy little chuckle before speaking. "Well, I see that I'm still popular with the little ones, well, good to know some things don't change," finished the rabbit, setting Mito back down, getting an excited giggle out of the girl before turning to address Hinata again. "Well, Hinata, I guess you are the newest holder of my people's contract, my name is Roku. Don't laugh, my cousin had over 20 kids and not much imagination," chuckled the rabbit, looking down at the pale-eyed girl, who gave him a small smile before nodding. "Hi, thank you, Roku-san, I'm looking forward to working with you," Hinata said as Roku smiled around at the collective group before his eyes settled on the seedling standing beside Naruto, his eyes focusing on the two while his hammer tumbled from his hands to thump onto the ground as the rabbit's mouth opened wide with what he was seeing. Before anyone knew it, Roku was before Naruto and the seedling, taking a quick knee and staring into the boy's eyes for a long moment before he seemed to find what he was looking for and gave a slow nod before standing. "I must thank you, Summoner Hinata, it seems that you have given me a chance to see the age when our clan can at last wipe away the shame of our old sins and help to protect the messenger of Kami we lifted our hammers against in the past," spoke Roku in a solemn voice as he stood and gave Hinata and Naruto a solemn nod. After a few moments, Yubi let out a small sigh and a pollen floated up to rest before Roku's face, and everyone in the clearing except for Mito and Hanabi was able to hear Yubi speaking once again. "There is no need to be worried, Roku-san, the wrong was not your own, and it seems that Hamura also sought to repair the mistakes he made during his life. Rest assured that I don't hold your clan responsible, but I would be grateful for your help with these children. I'm sure that your clan will be a lot of help in managing them," echoed Yubi in a happy tone that caused Roku to nod slowly, a small grin spreading across his face. "Hi, Yubi-san, my clan will protect Hinata-san and her friends, and our hammers will crush any wall or enemy that stands in their way," responded Roku proudly, thumping on of his paws happily against his chest. The next few moments had everyone getting to know Roku, and in the case of Mito and Hanabi, trying to hold onto the giant rabbit while the group chuckled at the antics. Tsunade and Shizune even summoned their own summons to meet Roku. After a while, the group decided that it was time for Roku to head back to announce the good news to his clan. "Well, Hinata-san, I look forward to the next time you need me or one of my kin. We will all be ready to assist you whenever you are in need of us," spoke Roku, causing Hinata to smile. "Arigato, Roku-san, I look forward to meeting you again in the future," replied Hinata, while the rest nodded in agreement. Roku was about to leave when Naruto called out to the summons, drawing its attention towards the blonde. "Hey Roku, before you go, I wanted to ask you something," Naruto said, drawing the rabbit's eyes towards him. Roku seemed to consider the youth for a moment before speaking. "Hi Naruto-san, and what would that be?" asked the rabbit looking down at the boy. Well, you see, Hinata-chan is very important to me and I just wanted to make sure that I could trust you to look after her," replied the blonde in a tone that did not lack any amount of seriousness and respect. Roku seemed to consider the blonde's words for a moment before smiling down at the blonde and hefting his hammer onto his shoulder. "Ah, just what I would expect from the one my summoner has chosen. Very well, what do you have in mind to test me?" asked Roku, a happy smile on his face, while his ears flicked back closer to his head as looked down at the blonde. Naruto also gave the rabbit a happy smile of his own before pointing a thumb over to where the seedling that Mito and Hanabi had tied up in pillows. "Tell you what, Hinata-chan managed to launch that seedling through a tree and the last summon I saw managed about the same. I would feel bad if Hinata-chan's new summon couldn't do at least that," finished Naruto with a smile that Roku mimicked a moment later. Hinata started to make a move forward to intervene, but Kushina laid a hand on the girl's shoulder before Hitomi joined her as well, both giving her a small shake of their heads. Jubi spoke up a moment later while the group looked around. "Don't worry, Hinata-chan, this is something that was bound to happen sooner or later, both are just looking to make sure the other can look after you. It's a guy thing, I wouldn't suggest you try and understand it," spoke Jubi, the other women giving nods of agreement as they looked over to see the seedling standing in front of Roku, giving off a happy little hum. Over the last few hits by Hinata, the seedling had found the padding on it actually work rather well in protecting it, and as a result it was actually starting to enjoy being periodically thrown through the air. So as Roku approached it, it didn't even flinch. It didn't move either as Roku's hammer swung back and then forwards level to the ground so that it could hit the seedling right in its chest. That was then the seedling did move, both horizontally and at a great velocity. Everyone watched as the seedling went flying off into the forest and they heard a shattering noise that signaled that it had broken through the ceiling array Kushina had put up to shield the training field from prying eyes. For a second the group didn't move before Mito and Hanabi both let out small shouts of concern and raced after the direction that the seedling had flown, followed soon after by Naruto and Hinata, the previous of which was muttering something about not again. Roku in the meantime gave a small happy huff before disappearing in a puff of smoke, seemingly satisfied with his efforts. The four remaining women stared after the group before looking at one another before Tsunade let out a small bark of laughter. "It's never boring with these kids, is it?" chuckled the blonde while everyone else nodded mutely at what they had just witnessed. So now teammate found themselves staring as Naruto and Hinata faced them, their two younger siblings, apparently trying to take care of the downed figure that had just flown headfirst into their training field. For a long moment no one spoke, everyone just taking a moment to try and get over the shock of what they had just witnessed. Finally the silence was broken when a voice came over from where the downed figure lay. "Naruto Seed-kun isn't waking up," called Hanabi, the boy's voice carrying a little worry as he looked between the fallen seedling and Mito, who was looking a little worried. Naruto gave the two a look before letting out a sigh and sending out a pulse towards the seedling, causing it to fold in on itself into its seed form, causing it to slowly drift over to his open palm. Teammate's eyes tracked the black orb along with the children's as it alighted upon Naruto's outstretched hand. After a moment there was a faint pulse and the black orb gave off a purple little glow before it shot back over to float in front of the children before cracking open and taking on its seedling form once again. Teammate at this point was truly beginning to wonder if they had gone mad. Here was Naruto, a boy they knew, apparently creating and molding the creature that they had been discussing not a few moments ago. As they watched the two children they recognized as the youngest of the Hyuga and Namikaze families let out sighs of relief before animatedly checking over the humming black creature that seems to have recovered without a scratch. Finally they couldn't keep silent any longer and a voice rang out across the clearing. "Okay, what the heck is going on here?" called Sakura in a loud tone that drew everyone's attention, even the seedlings, who let out a soft hum of recognition towards the pink-haired girl. Hinata and Naruto looked over at each other for a moment before turning to face the members of Teammate, the later raising a hand up to scratch the back of his head absent-mindedly. "Hi. Well, this is awkward," chuckled Naruto, his voice drawing Sakura's gaze, causing him to stiffen slightly before jumping behind Hinata for cover. Hinata gave Naruto a level look before grabbing him gently by the ear and pulling him forward to face Teammate. "Oh no, you don't, Naruto-kun, you made this happen, so you get to clean it up, right?" the pale-eyed girl said in a commanding tone. Naruto gave Hinata a pleading look for a moment before his eyes dropped and he nodded in defeat. "Hi, Hinata-chan," he said in a tone of surrender as he faced over to Teammate. Kurenai seemed to have surrendered to her own confusion for the time and was just facing ahead without comment. Shino seemed to have managed to hold on to himself well enough and was just standing there with one eyebrow cocked up as he looked over towards where the seedling was standing, Hanabi and Mito seemingly trying to work it back into its pillow armor. Sakura stood beside Shino, her arms folded and one foot tapping, looking like a pink-haired and younger version of her new mentor as she seemed to be waiting for some kind of explanation from the two in front of her. Finally Yakumo for her part was looking between the pair, the seedling, and finally her sensei, as if trying to piece together what she was seeing. "Well, I guess you guys have heard all about Seed-kun over there," Naruto said, his tone not so much one of a question but a statement. Teammate nodded their head slightly before Naruto continued. "Well then, no way around it, I guess. You see, it's kind of a technique of mine that I lost track of during the exams. The little guys are pretty harmless unless you attack them, and well, it seems like a lot of the teams did just that," continued the blonde as teammate nodded their head slowly at his words. "Anyway, you see, we were doing some training and he went airborne there at the last minute. And well, here we are," finished the blonde with a small chuckle as he looked at the stunned face in front of him. "Wait, that's it?" asked Sakura, her tone disbelieving. Naruto only gave a small shrug in response before Kurenai seemed to find her reason and started forward towards the blonde. "Naruto Uzumaki, I'll have to take you in to see the Hokage about this, that," here she gestured over at the seedling, "thing is considered a threat to the village, and I'm sorry, but I'll have to take you in so that we can clear this whole thing up," continued Kurenai, reaching point just a few feet away from the blonde and looking down at him. Naruto for his part only stared back at the red-eyed women for a moment with one eyebrow cocked before looking over at the seedling, who had just managed to trip over its own feet in an attempt to chase after both Mito and Hanabi at the same time before fixing Kushina with an inquisitive look. "You mean that," here he to gesture over to the seeding that Mito had pounced on with a laugh, "is a threat to the village?" "Yeah, I don't think so," he responded, his tone one of challenge. Kurenai hardened her gaze on the blonde before taking a few steps forward to look down at the boy, her tone becoming more authoritarian as she did. "This isn't a suggestion, Uzumaki, this is an order from a superior," continued Kurenai, not breaking eye contact with the boy. While she didn't truly believe that the thing a few yards away was a danger, she had a duty to bring it to the Hokage's attention, and besides, she didn't particularly care for the tone that the genin before her was directing her way. For a second the two simples stood there staring each other down before Naruto gave a small smirk and replied. "Well, if that's the case, I guess you have to bring us all in, don't you?" replied the blonde in a confident tone that caught Kurenai momentarily off guard. As she watched, Naruto's coat seemed to ripple slightly before 5 more black orbs shot out of his back, each shooting a few feet away before proceeding to break apart and form into a black figure of their own, all looking around while humming slightly in curiosity as they did so. Despite herself, Kurenai took a step back as she looked around at all of the purple-eyed figures that were all looking at her in apparent interest. For a second everyone was silent until a small commotion from the tree line drew everyone's attention, and Tsunade along with Shizune appeared, followed after by a chair-bound Hitomi being pushed by Kushina. For a second everyone just looked around at one another before Shizune gave a small cough, getting everyone's attention. Well, this was unexpected. Might I suggest we all sit down and discuss what's going on here? I think that's in everyone's best interests," reasoned the woman, getting a few nods from the surrounding group. Kushina set about putting up a ceiling barrier around the training field while the rest of the group, including one of the seedlings, gathered in a circle to discuss what they were going to be doing. The seedling in question had seemed interested in Yakumo's drawing of itself and had elected to stay beside her, humming as it twisted the picture back and forth, apparently examining it. Yakumo for her part was just staring at the seedling seated beside her, trying to decide what she thought about it. Sakura and Shino were splitting their time between looking over at Yakumo and the seedling beside her, trying to figure out where they sat. As Kushina finished, she made her way over to where the group gathered as Kurenai spoke up, her voice more confused than anything else. What is going on here, Tsunade-sama, Kushina-san, Shizune-san, Hyuga-san, what is all of this?" asked the red-eyed woman, looking around in complete confusion. The other women seemed to pause for a moment, giving each other measured looks before Kushina spoke up. "I guess the simplest way to explain this would be that Naruto has been working on these guys for the last few years, and the last few months, myself and everyone else here have been helping him work with them. They aren't like a normal clone and tend to act mostly like children. During the exams, they got shot all over the forest, and well," here she paused to give a small smirk over at the seedling that was sitting over by Yakumo humming happily, "made an impression apparently," finished Kushina with a chuckle. Kurenai seemed to consider this for a second. It certainly fit, after all. From what she had understood, that meant that the clones, or whatever they were, had only attacked the Konoha teams in self-defense. This did settle her mind a little, but at the same time she could tell there was something that Kushina and the rest weren't telling her. She eyed them all with her fiery red eyes, moving from one to the next, considering her next words carefully. "So these clones are just a new move from Naruto?" Here she looked over at Naruto, fixing him with a doubting look before she continued, "And this boy, who happens to be only genin level just a few months ago and apparently alone, created a brand new never before seen technique that is able to go 1-on-3 with darn near any team in the exams, and you are expecting me to believe that? What you have told me is all there is to it?" Finished Kurenai, folding her arms and looking around the group with an expression that dared them to call her out. For a moment the group looked at one another in silence until Naruto spoke up. "Well, I guess that would sound pretty odd, but trust me, the alternative isn't a whole heck of a lot more believable," he said, getting a few nods from those around him. Kurenai turned to the boy with a look before speaking. "Try me," she said in a daring tone. Naruto gave her a smirk back before sending out a quick mental message to the others. "Okay, I guess we are kind of stuck here, what should we do?" asked Naruto to the others. "Maybe we should tell her, I mean it's not like we can cover it up at this point and you were going to have to start explaining things after the finals anyway," reasoned Hinata. "I don't know, Hinata, I mean telling those close to us is one thing, but Kurenai here is a diehard shinobi, even if we explain everything she may still want to inform the Hokage," reasoned Shizune. She was still getting used to the whole pollen connection, having only recently gotten her own, along with Tsunade and Hitomi. "Yeah, but what else can we do?" asked Hitomi, not sure as what to do next. Tsunade considered what she knew for a few more moments before voicing her opinion. "Look, it comes down to two options, we tell her and she agrees to keep silent, or we don't tell her and she goes to the Hokage, which she may do even if we do tell her. Or we kidnap her and run away to another village and start our lives over as a three-ring circus for all the craziness this little band seems to find itself in," finished the blonde woman, somehow putting both humor and annoyance together into her voice. The others let out a small snort at her words, making the members of Team 8 look at the group a little puzzled before Jubi added her 2 cents worth into the conversation. "I say we just tell her, she is suspicious already, so just let Naruto tell him what he feels comfortable telling her and let's just get this thing out in the open," Jubi said, giving a mental shrug of apparent surrender as she did so. "Okay," said Naruto, calling everyone's attention, "I guess we just have to explain what's going on here, so let's start off with the biggest one. I have the tailed beast's Kasen living in my head thanks to the third ceiling and she is the reason I can make that," Naruto said, pointing over to the seedling who had just finished looking Yakumo's picture up and down and handed it back to the girl with a hum of apparent approval, causing the girl to blush slightly as she took the painting from him with a quick word of thanks. At hearing this, teammate looked at Naruto and back to the seedling before looking at the adults, as if hoping one of them would help explain what Naruto had just said. Hitomi and Kushina shook their heads in turn, looking over at the confused group with knowing smiles. "I swear I don't think I'm ever going to get tired of seeing people's reaction to that one," barked out Kushina, while Hitomi just gave her a playful slap on the head, causing the redhead to smile back at her friend. While this was happening, the final two members of Team 11 were at that moment making their way through Konoha while stretching out some of their sore muscles as they did so. "I'm telling you, Akamaru, Kasen and Onisan are going to kill us before we ever get to the finals," joked Kiba, looking down at Akamaru, who padded along beside him. Akamaru gave Kiba a little huff in response before giving off a soft yip. "Hi, but it will be worth it," responded the pup, Kiba being able to understand him thanks to his Inuzuka blood. Kiba gave a small smirk at that before raising his two arms behind his head in a lazy motion. "Yeah, I guess you're right, still that Suna Kunoichi isn't going to go down easy, heck, she managed to take out Shikamaru without much trouble, and besides, Kasen always made it clear not to underestimate an opponent and hit them fast without giving them a chance to recover, so that's what I'm going to do," Kiba said in a happy tone, to which Akamaru yipped happily in response. The two made their way down the road for a time before they came to the Konoha Park and decided to take a quick break there before getting back to training. The two found a nice spot on a small hill that allowed the shade to cover the two as they laid back for a moment, just enjoying the small breeze as it played across his face, bringing with it the smells of Konoha with it. This was something only Inuzukas could truly experience, and Kiba loved to just lay relaxed while his nose allowed his mind to take in a day like this in his own way. Just as he was slipping away into a short nap, his nose caught a familiar scent of wind. Something like desert sand mixed in with a wood polish smell and a hint of something that smelled like a cactus flowers, though it all was muted behind a smell of sweat. The smell was unfamiliar to Kiba and caused him to blink his eyes open and sit himself up to get another quick whiff of the air, causing him to look over his right shoulder and towards the pigtailed girl from Suna he would be facing in the upcoming match. Damari seemed to notice Kiba's gaze and stopped a few feet away, giving him a quick once-over before huffing out a sound that made it clear she wasn't impressed with the boy. Kiba recognized that attitude, he should, after all he had seen it enough from his Nisan. The girl was issuing him a challenge and didn't appear to be unfamiliar with showing her authority over others and not backing down easily. Kiba bared his teeth in a small feral grin as he saw this act and wasn't about to back down to her. "You know you'd be better served spending your time preparing for our match, or are you just given up on winning it already?" asked Tamari, her tone one of baiting aggressiveness. Kiba never let his eyes leave the girl as he pushed himself up so that he was now looking only slightly up to meet her eyes thanks to the slope of the hill. Sorry, not luck, you don't get off that easy, so how about you stop trying to play the intimidation game with me, I have that all the time at home," replied Kiba without looking away from the girl. Tamari seemed to become a little more excited at his tone, folding her arms and leaning slightly over to rest her weight on her right leg. "Is that so? Maybe I gave you too much credit, cause I can tell you that you wouldn't last one day in my family," responded the girl, still with the challenge in her voice. Kiba smirked back before replying. "What with Pajama Boy and the one with tanuki eyes, heck, that's nothing compared to a family full of women who have packs of dogs at their beck and call," shot back Kiba, smiling a little more despite himself. Inyazukas always tended to have a feral streak in them, and the verbal battle they were having applied to that side of his nature strongly. Tamari herself had to admit there was something refreshing about someone who wasn't backing down from her, but seemed to be treating her with some kind of respect as a kunoichi. "Anyway, I was just taking a break before heading back to work. I saw what you did to Shikamaru in the last fight, and I won't be making the mistake in taking you lightly. Heck, if I did, my cousin and Nisan would probably take me out before you got your shot," replied Kiba with a chuckle. Tamari let out a small bark of laughter as well before replying. Maybe I should be fighting them in the next match instead of you then," shot back Tamari, letting a small bit of her chakra form into a slight gust of wind that shot towards Kiba's face. On instinct, Kiba drew in his own chakra, letting it form into a gust of air that impacted Tamari's own, causing a breeze to push past both of them, ruffling their hair as it went. Tamari allowed herself a moment of surprise at the Inyazuka's wind element before a small yip drew her attention a few feet, about a foot to Kiba's right. The blonde girl looked down to see the ball of white fluff looking back up at her while its tail wagged back and forth behind it, a small content doggy grin on its face as it looked between the two. Akamaru had fallen to sleep until just a few moments before, when the breeze from the two's wind had rustled him enough to wake up. Even as the two watched, the pup let out a small yawn before stretching to look up at the two in apparent interest. Tamari looked down at the pup and fought for all she was worth to keep her face from breaking into a happy smile. True, she was a kunoichi first, and her aggressive nature was no act, but growing up in a desert had left her precious few chances to see something so unquestionably cute as a puppy just waking up from a nap. Her only memory close to it was when she had only been around 2 and her cousin had given her a stuffed ferret as a birthday present before she had died not long after bringing Gara into the world. So she froze slightly, trying to fight back the urge to simply bend down and scoop up the pup and nuzzle it affectionately. However, she forced herself to remain calm and focused back towards Kiba, who seemed to have noticed her momentary hesitation. Taking the opportunity, he took a step forward so that he and Tamari were on eye level before responding to her last statement. "Yeah, but if I let them fight, I wouldn't get my chance to show how much I've been working, so me and Akamaru will be seeing you at the finals," finished Kiba, turning to with Akamaru to leave the park. After a few steps, he paused and flashed a small grin back at Tamari before speaking. "Oh, and that perfume of yours doesn't smell too bad," chuckled Kiba, trying to catch the girl off guard. To say it worked was an understatement. Tamari's face first became confused before a slight blush twinged her face, and she slung her fan from her back to wing it at the boy. However, Kiba and Akamaru had already left, and with a sigh, she lowered her fan to rest on the park's grass while muttering to herself. "Stupid spiky-haired, red-marked, gray-coated jerk," muttered Tamari, fighting to keep her anger in check as she took several deep breaths while forcing herself to relax. When she had managed it, she calmly slipped her fan back onto her back and turned to walk out of the park and back to her training. As she went, she let her face settle into a small smirk as she did. "Just you wait, you jerk, I'm taking you out in the next round," Tamari said to herself, even as she grinned a little at the idea of standing over a beaten Kiba, holding a happy Akamaru for extra effect. A small while later found Kiba walking through his compound and back out into the clan's training field, where he found Hana and Tsume waiting for him, the latter turning to face him as he arrived. "Hey pup, about time you got back, what's the matter, we pushing you too hard?" Tsume called in a happy tone that made it clear she was speaking in jest. Kiba gave his cousin a small smirk before running over to stand before her. "Not a chance, cousin, I'm ready to go, right Akamaru?" Kiba said, turning slightly to see Akamaru let out a bark of agreement. Tsume gave the boy a grin before giving him a soft punch on his arm, grinning the whole while. They were about to get down to business before Tsume stiffened for a second, her nose twitching for a moment before a wide grin spread out on her face from ear to ear. Hana froze as well, looking over at Tsume before giving a sniff of the air as well, then slowly mimicking her cousin's actions. Kiba took a small step back from the two as the women gave him two evil smiles. "Hakasa. Hana. What is it?" asked Kiba while fighting a losing battle to not show just how afraid he was at the moment. Without speaking, both women reached a hand up to point at their noses and then took a small step forward. Kiba was confused for a second before he sniffed the air around him and froze, realizing that when he had been arguing with that girl from Suna, her blast of air had covered him in her scent. Realizing this, he froze, his mind racing as a small shiver went down his spine. "Sachi, is that perfume I smell on you?" asked Sum, her eyes flashing with a sudden intensity. Kiba gulped, looking left and right as the two women closed in on him from both sides. "Meep," squeaked out Kiba just as the two women closed in on him. While Kiba was busy being interrogated by his family for details, teammate had just finished listening to Naruto's abridged version of the events leading to what had occurred in the forest, and today. He'd been careful to leave out the elements having to do with his family and most of the events in Wave, and particularly Hinata's new condition, but other than that he had told them most of the details. The group just sat stunned looking at Naruto as though he was insane. "So," Kurenai began after a moment's pause, "you are the holder of the Juubi, and your chakra has changed, making you able to create these seedlings of yours, and you were testing some of their durability, and one got hit by Tsunade, making it fly into this field, does that about sum it up?" asked Kurenai in a curious tone as she looked at the boy seated in front of her. Naruto for his part just looked back at her with a small smile. "Yep, that's it, nothing else to it," replied Naruto simply as he pushed himself to his feet. "Well, I'm going to go ahead and check and make sure Mito and Hanabi aren't causing any trouble. Hinata-chan, Sakura, Shino, Yakumo want to come with me, I can let the seedling meet you so they will know you if they see you again," offered Naruto, looking around at the members of Team 8. Hinata rose from her seated position a moment later, followed soon by the rest of the genin, who proceeded to head over to where the seedlings were gathered, along with Mito and Hanabi. As they left, Kurenai turned to address the women left once again, but found them all staring at her with calculated eyes. What?" asked Kurenai, giving them a slightly worried look. Kushina was the first to respond. "Well, now comes the part where we explain to you that you won't be telling the Hokage about what you have learned today," said Kushina in a tone that didn't quite hint at violence, but made it clear that the deed was serious. Kurenai looked back and forth between the group, seeing the same look from all of them. Now Kurenai was no coward, far from it, but to be under the gaze of 4 women, 3 of which she knew to be her superior in strength, skill, and experience. Heck, she didn't even like her chances against the wheelchair-bound Hyuga women at such short range, and what was more confusing was that she didn't really believe that it was even the right choice to tell the Hokage anymore. Really, when she got down to it, this was a case of an authorized technique that was used during an exam where inter-fighting was expected and encouraged. Really, the seedlings as they were called hadn't done anything outside of the rules during their actions, heck, the one her team had run into had likely saved their lives. After a few more moments, she gave Kushina an understanding nod. "Alright, I'll keep it quiet for now, but I can't make any promises about keeping it a secret if these things keep flying into training fields all over Konoha," Kurenai replied, letting a small smile come her face as she finished drawing a small amount of happy-sounding sighs from the assembled women. "Well, that's a relief, now I guess we go and see what kind of trouble the genin are getting into," chuckled Tsunade as she pushed herself up from the ground. The rest soon followed, and a short ways across the training field they found a little play going on. The 5 women found themselves arranged in a line looking down into a valley-like area where the genin, as well as Mito and Hanabi, were moving around with the seedlings walking around in turn. Below, Naruto and Hinata along with Sakura and Shino were standing off to one side, watching as Mito and Hanabi were moving seedling after seedling in front of Yakumo, waiting for something to happen. The brown-haired girl seemed to be fidgeting slightly as each seedling in turn was led up to her and then away, without comment. The 4 women made their way down the hill, and Kurenai spoke up, looking over at Sakura and Shino. "What are they doing with Yakumo-chan?" asked Kurenai, obvious confusion in her tone as she looked as the next seedling was maneuvered in front of the girl. Sakura smiled a little before replying. "Well, apparently Yakumo-chan told them about the seedling she met in the forest, so now they are trying to figure out which one of them it is so that she can see her friend again," chuckled Sakura as the next seedling was brought up in front of the girl. "Then what are they waiting for?" asked Kurenai, looking at the situation, causing Shino to shrug slightly in answer. Just as Kurenai was about to ask what was going on, the last seedling was maneuvered in front of Yakumo and stared at her for a few moments before letting out an excited hum and jumped forward at the brown-haired girl that let out a small yelp of shock. Kurenai was about to leap forward before she stopped and started trying to hold back giggles at what she was seeing. The seedling in question had leapt forward and wrapped its arms happily around Yakumo's waist, twirling the girl and seeming happiness at seeing her. The seedling hadn't seen the girl after it had run into the red-deeded boy in the forest and hadn't been out since. So seeing its newest friend safe seemed to have excited the seedling, who was now expressing itself. Most of the group let out similar giggle to Kurenai after a moment, and soon everyone, including the spinning girl, was laughing at the scene around them. It was a few days later in Konoha. Minami and Naruto had decided to take a day off of their training to stop by home and see everyone. Kushina had been thrilled to see the two, as they could testify once they managed to get air back in their lungs after her bone-crushing greeting. Naruto had decided to spend the day between visiting her friends and hanging out with Minato and Kushina. Minami in the meantime had decided to spend some time with her mom before heading out with Mito for the afternoon to share some time with Naruto. The two Redeeds were currently sitting up by the Hokage monument, their feet dangling over the edge, while Mito licked happily at an ice cream cone Minami had gotten her. The two sat there while Mito hummed happily as she looked out over the village. Minami in the meantime was smiling over at Mito, enjoying seeing Hiramoto so seemingly content with herself. After a bit Mito paused looking down at her ice cream, her face screwed up slightly in a look Minami couldn't quite place. "What's wrong Mito, get a brain freeze?" asked Minami leaning over to get a better look at the brighter Redeed. Mito shook her head slightly in response before looking over at Minami for a second and then out over the village, as if trying to find what she wanted to say. Minami seemed to pick up on the girl's discomfort and decided to prod a bit. "Mito, if something wrong you can tell me, I promise it will stay between you and me, okay?" said Minami softly, causing Mito to look up at her as if a bit afraid as what might come out if she spoke. Finally she seemed to decide on something and turned to look out over the village. "Nisan, why did you and Aniki used to fight so much?" asked Mito in a sad little voice that caused Minami to freeze, the words turning her blood to ice as she heard them. Mito just sat there for a second looking out over the village before she continued. "You know Aniki used to bring me up here sometimes when you and Naruto-chan were training and he used to cry sometime, he tried to make sure I didn't see him, but I did. Whenever I asked him about it he would say it was noting and just go on smiling. And now things are better, you and Kasan and Aniki, and we're all happy, but I'm scared I don't want it to go back to how it used to be." Finished Mito, a few tears falling from her eyes even as the ice cream cone slipped from her fingers and fell down off the monument. Without a moment's hesitation Minami leaned over and wrapped her arms around Mito, running one hand gently through the girl's long red hair while making shushing sounds and whispering in the girl's ear. "Shhhhhh, it's go Mito, it's okay, I promise everything will be okay, Naruto and I aren't going to change, I promise, we're not going to change, it will be alright shhhhh," whispered Minami as she pulled Mito gently into her lap, rocking her back and forth gently as she continued to hold Mito close to her, even as Mito let a few small sobs escape her mouth and buried her face into her older sister's chest, crying softly into it. After a few moments Mito managed to breathe enough to look up at Minami, her small face showing evidence of her recent crying. "Nisan, why?" asked Mito looking up at Minami, the older girl letting a few tears fall from her eyes as she looked down at her sister, shaking her head slightly before replying. "I don't know Moto. I don't know anymore, I was scared he was going to get himself hurt and I made a lot of mistakes." Finished Minami looking out over the village for a second, remembering all the times she had judged Naruto growing up, all the times she had yelled at him about being lazy, all those times that seemed so long ago. After a moment one of Mito's chains reached up to wipe away a tear from Minami's face, causing the older girl to look down at Mito, who was giving her a soft smile, even though her watering eyes. "It's okay Minami Onachan, you're better now," said Mito as though Minami had gotten over some kind of sickness that had caused her actions. The darker Redeed turned her dark red eyes down into her sister bright pale ones and smiled down at her, giving her a soft nod. "Hi Minami, I'm better now, how about we go get you a new ice cream cone?" asked Minami smiling down at Hiramoto. Mito smiled back, brightening up a sleeve to wipe away a few stray tears. "Hi Nisan," Mito said as the two Redeeds stood up and made their way down the steps and into the village. As they were making their way through the food market, they noticed a familiar Redeed who was at that moment exiting a familiar ramen tent, calling back to the two cooks as she left. "Arigato, it was nice to see you two again," called Kushina as she turned to leave the small ramen stand. As the Redeed took a few steps down the road Minami called out to her. "Kasan, hey Kasan," she called, waving her left hand in the air while Mito waved her right. Kushina paused and turned to see the pair, giving off a bright smile as she did so and making her way over towards the pair. "Hello you two, where are you headed?" asked Kushina as she made her way over to the two. "Well Kasan, I'm just taking Mito here to get an ice cream cone, I see you just got done with some Ichiraku ramen, I swear I'll never know what you and Naruto see in that stuff," chuckled Minami as Kushina gave her Musum an annoyed little look before throwing her hands over her head in mock anger. "How could I raise a child who was not in love with the miracle that is ramen, tell me Kami, where did I go wrong?" asked Kushina as if calling to Kami to answer her. All she got was an annoyed little look from Minami and a happy little giggle from Mito. Kushina held her pose for a second before letting her arms drop and giving the two girls a bright smile. "Well, mind if I come along with you too?" asked Kushina looking down at the two. Minami and Mito nodded their heads in response and soon the three Redeeds were making their way through the village headed towards the park where the stand was located. When the three arrived in the park they heard a small disturbance coming from over where they knew the fountain to be. The three looked at one another for a moment before deciding to head over and see what all of the ruckus was about. As the three arrived on the scene they saw the source of the commotion. Two figures were standing by the fountain, while a third, what had apparently been thrown bodily into the fountain, was shouting at the two standing a short distance away. Minami took a moment to recognize the three members from the Mist Village that had participated in the prelims with her. The one currently standing in the pond was the white-haired boy known as Sujetsu. He was currently shouting at the boy named Haku and Karen. Minami realized with a sudden shock. She had completely forgotten what Naruto had said to her during the prelims until just now, and looking over at Kushina and Mito, she realized that she hadn't even thought to tell either of them anything about it. Meanwhile, as the three Namikazes watched, Sujetsu raised a hand pointing over at Karen, flashing a shark-toothed smile as he did. "That's it, Karen, we do this now, I don't care if we start a war, that is the last time you throw me like that," called the white-haired boy as he looked over at his two teammates. Haku just shook his head in apparent annoyance, while Karen just waved a hand dismissively at the boy. "Well, maybe next time you won't shoot your mouth off to me, ever think about that, water boy?" Karen asked in a voice thick with disapproval. Kushina decided to intervene before the genin from Mist got underway in their fight and possibly wreaked the whole park. As Kushina stepped forwards, Haku seemed to notice her presence and turned freezing in place as he did. Kushina for her part did the same, and the two just looked at one another for a few seconds, both remembering their brief encounter in Wave. For Kushina the memory was a nasty little reminder of what the first mission had cost. Meanwhile for Haku the effect was slightly different. Okami, please tell me this isn't happening, please tell me this isn't happening," thought Haku, seeing the women in front of him that had literally almost beaten his master to death with her bare hands. Karen seemed to notice the two's reaction to one another and decided to get to the bottom of it. "Hey Haku, what's up with you and the tomato over there?" asked Karen, her tone more curious than anything else. Time seemed to stop for a moment as Kushina's eyes narrowed and her hair started to separate into 9 tails of hair that rose slightly behind her in a dangerous fashion. Haku, apparently sensing danger, moved slowly off away from the pair of Redeed, joined soon after by Minami and Mito, the latter of which was taking shelter behind Minami's legs while giving the other pair of Redeeds a nervous little look. Kushina seemed to stare at the girl for a moment, her eyes shining with a kind of fire, while their hair waved dangerously behind her. "Would you mind repeating that for me? I don't think I heard you," asked Kushina in a dangerous little tone that caused the three watching members to take a step back from them, almost on instinct. Karen glared back at Kushina, her own eyes narrowing slightly as she did, seeming to be reading herself for a fight. Neither of the two Redeeds got the chance to fling themselves at each other, however, because at that moment Sujetsu hopped out of the fountain, striding over to stand between the two and cocky look on his face as he spoke. "Hey you red, beat it, me and Four Eyes over here have something to discuss," shouted the boy in an annoyed tone. Poor Sujetsu had unknowingly placed himself at ground zero and he didn't even recognize the danger he was in. Without warning, the two Redeeds whirled around, both slammed their fist into the white-haired boy's face, causing him to fly back into the fountain, his head exploding into a shower of water as it impacted the fountain and slipped below the water line. For a moment no one moved before Haku leaned over and in a soft voice whispered over to Minami in a hushed voice. "Don't move. They can sense fear," he whispered in an anxious whisper that caused Minami to snort slightly, letting it go into a loud giggle. Mito joined in moments later and Kushina and Karen turned to find the three onlookers letting out little bouts of laughter. The two Redeeds turned to each other for a second and back at the fountain before letting out a few barks of laughter as they looked at the situation they were in. After a few moments they stopped and the five moved over to talk, Karen catching sight of Mito for the first time and then Minami halting for a moment as she recognized the Redeed. "Hey wait, you're that girl from the prelims," said Karen pointing over at Minami, who gave a nod of agreement. "Hi, that was me, and this is my cousin Kushina and my Moto Mito, you're Karen right?" finished Minami looking over at the other red-eyed girl who turned to each person in turn and finally gave the girl a short nod. "Wait, where's the blonde, the one that said we were cousins?" asked Karen looking around in apparent confusion. Kushina and Mito froze at the other red-haired girl's words and tracked their eyes over to stare at Karen, Kushina's mouth hanging open slightly as she looked at the girl, noticing the similarities between her and Minami for the first time. Mito in the meantime had skipped the thinking phase and had jumped straight to the welcoming phase. This meant that one moment Karen was standing there looking around at the group and the next she was staggering back as a small red-haired comet impacted her chest with a cry of greeting. "I have a cousin that's so awesome, wait till I tell Hanabi-kun," shouted Mito, two of her golden chains flying out of her back to help her wrap around the form of Karen. As soon as the golden chains came in contact with Karen, there was a sudden flash of golden light that caused everyone to cover their eyes in sudden surprise at the blinding light coming from the two. Kushina practically fainted at seeing the light before her. It had been the same when Mito had first grabbed onto one of Kushina's chains when she was only 2, a bright flash of golden light had erupted, and, the next thing Kushina knew Mito had been sitting in the living room shrieking with apparent delight as she waved her hands happily at a small golden chain that had sprouted from her back. It was discovered later that when Kushina's chakra had come in contact with Mito directly, Mito's own had awakened at that moment. This meant that the girl standing before her was unmistakably an Uzumaki, and more importantly she had the same chakra as them. A few seconds later when the light faded, the group was able to see that Mito was sitting on top of a confused-looking Karen as several golden chains had dug into the ground behind the red-eyed girl, holding her up a few feet from the ground, even as Mito smiled up at her. "Wow, you have chains just like Kasen and me, that's awesome," continued Mito, looking around excitedly at the gathered figures. Haku looked like he was about to have a kind of conniption as he looked between his teammate and the other Retides, his mind whirling. "Right now they are multiplying, oh Zabuza-sama, help me," thought the dark-haired boy in a small panic. Minami just looked confused as she looked over at Karen, who for her part had passed confused about 10 miles ago and was fast approaching critical mass. She noticed idly that she was being supported by something, but it felt odd to her. Turning her head, she saw that several golden chains were sticking out of her back and into the ground behind her, holding her up, looking a lot like the ones coming from the retarded girl that was still attached to her at the hip. Karen did possibly the most sensible thing and promptly passed out, her chains shattering into golden light as she plopped softly to the ground, followed by Mito, who looked down at her in confusion. A moment later Kushina managed to shake herself out of her stopper, enough to take a few steps forwards and lift Mito off of Karen, slipping an arm under the girl as she did so. And pulling the now unconscious girl up enough to move her over to a nearby pavilion, followed by the other members, as she sat the girl down on the bench beside her, smiling slightly as she simply looked down on the red-eyed girl with something akin to wonder. Here she was, another Uzumaki. She wasn't the last, that meant that this girl's mother or father may be out there, some for her family might still be out there, another nation alive. The group sat there for a few minutes waiting for Karen to wake up. When she finally did, she saw that Minami and Mito had headed off at some time, while Haku was sitting on the bench beside her, never taking his eyes from where Kushina sat facing them. She let out a small groan as she sat up, grabbing her head slightly, as if trying to hold back some kind of pain in it. Haku didn't move his gaze but put a hand behind the girl, helping her up to sit up while she worked to steady herself. After a moment she managed it, looking over at Haku with a small smile of thanks before she turned to face Kushina, who had not taken her eyes off of her for a moment. "So," spoke Kushina, seeing that Karen was now fully awake, "you're going to feel a bit out of it for a while. That happens the first time you awaken your bloodline, particularly with our type," said Kushina, not taking her eyes off of the girl. Karen and Haku gave her an odd look before Kushina spoke up again. "I guess it kind of obvious now, but I would say that you are definitely an Uzumaki, at least on one side of your family. Parents probably changed their names and went into hiding when Yuzu fell. I won't ask you to tell me if you don't want to, but I'd like to know a bit about you if I can. And maybe your family," finished Kushina, her tone not wavering at all as she looked into Karen's face. Karen for her part just stared back at Kushina without knowing what to say in reply. Haku picked up on his teammate's distress and stood for a moment, causing Kushina to turn to face the boy. "Thank you for the offer, Kushina-sensei, but I would ask to wait until we can discuss with our sensei before we make any decisions. After all, our villages are still not in an alliance at the moment. So with respect, I would like to run this by our sensei before we continue this conversation," spoke Haku in a firm tone that held a familiar tone of a true shinobi. Kushina let out a small sigh before nodding her head and pushing herself up. "I can respect that. I will wait for a response from either you or your sensei. If possible, I will be willing to organize a meeting between your Mizukage and the Hokage for a chance at discussing this in earnest," replied Kushina before leaving the pavilion, taking a few steps away before pausing and turning her head over her shoulder to give it to a small smirk. "Hey, by the way, get your teammate out of the fountain before he drowns, will you?" called Kushina as she turned and made her way through the park. While half of the Namikaze family was over in the park, a particular blonde girl was sitting out in an open training field, her back leaned up against one of the training poles while having her knees drawn up to her chest as she looked out over the field without doing more than looking out while trying to figure out her own feelings. The last few weeks she had been feeling small hits of sadness as she continued her training with Minami and the Toads. It had started when Naruto had walked out to explain to them that he wouldn't be coming with them on the trip and continued to pop up every time she thought of Konoha and everyone there while she would talk with Minami after a training session. "So meatbag, are you just going to sit around all day or are you going to do something interesting?" asked Kyuubi, annoyed slightly at his host's moping. "Shut it, furball, I'm not in the mood for your taunting," shot back Naruto, harshly, sending a mental glare Kyuubi's direction for good measure. The fox just huffed slightly before continuing. Or you'll what? Heck, it seems to me I'm one of the few things that will actually listen to you any longer, like how you forced Naruto out of your life. Mocked Kyuubi, trying to get a rise out of Naruto. Naruto let off a little burst of chakra almost on instinct as her grip tightened around her knees, drawing them in closer to her chest. I said shut up, you fucking furball, I'm not in the mood for your crap. Naruto mentally yelled, trying to force the fox out of her head. Why, so you can go back to moping? What's the big deal? You were the one who decided to come back here instead of staying on that mountain to train. Heck, even those filthy toads are some kind of company. Replied the fox, his tone more confused than anything else. Naruto let out a harsh grunt before closing off the connection to the Kyuubi. Stupid fox, what the heck does he know about anything? Tausen was just busy today, and Minami and Mito wanted to have some time alone. I still got to visit Ino and Sakura for a while. So why should I feel bad? Naruto asked, the empty field, a burst of red chakra blasting forth from her and cracking the trees and ground around her as it released from her. From inside, a small voice spoke up to her. Maybe because you don't want to meet with your friends but with your family. The one you left behind. Reasoned a small bit of her. With a shake, Naruto stood up and was about to move out of the field when she heard a small movement from behind her. Naruto spun in place, turning to have her bright blue eyes scan back and forth around the field behind her without catching any movement. For a second she froze until she heard a voice speak up from above her position. You never did look up when we used to play hide and seek, it's why I always won when it was your turn. Came a voice from the tree a few feet from the training logs. Naruto froze as she heard the voice, looking up to see Naruto sitting in the tree above her, looking down at her, a small smile on his face. Before she could respond, the blonde boy hopped down from the tree and landed softly the center training post before letting himself fall into a sitting position on it, never taking his purple eyes from her blue ones. After a moment, Naruto spoke up. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice carrying a small bit of hostility in it, even though she hadn't meant it to. Naruto didn't even appear to have noticed the tone as he looked at her, his smile lessening a little until he was giving his fellow blonde a sad little smile that seemed to be made more for pity than for anything else. Are you trying to spy on me to figure out my training for our upcoming match? Is that it, or are you here to try and psych me out and hope it messes up my training? Naruto called towards the purple-eyed boy who just sat looking at her, his face never changing. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Is it because you're angry at me? Angry that I'm stronger than you, or is it that I got training from Tausen and Jiraiya? Well? Asked Naruto, her tone becoming more and more pained as she continued. Her voice seemed to carry with it more suffering than actual anger. Naruto didn't respond but just looked at her with his sad expression, not responding to her questions, just looking at his niece and with a sadness hanging over her. Well, tell me. Huh, what is that stupid look about? Are you still angry about the training? Is that why you didn't come with us, huh? Is that it, you're angry that you didn't have to spend your time training, that you could be with Mito and Hinata, heck, with anyone you wanted, well, Minami and I were being trained to protect the village. Is that it? Is it I never asked to be a hero for this village, but it's my job, I have to protect everyone, and what did you have to do? Nothing, that's what. So stop looking at me like that. Don't look at me like I need your pity. I don't care if you hate me for it, I'm going to make sure you and everyone else is protected. Naruto finished screaming as she did so, even as a large amount of red chakra bubbled out around her, forming first stage chakra clock as it did. Meanwhile, the blonde's nails and canines of the girl lengthened into points and her eyes changed into slits as she finished yelling, her breath coming out in sharp breaths as she glared over at Naruto, her mind racing even at the chakra, and adrenaline raced through her. For a moment neither child spoke. The wind blew through the training field as Naruto continued to watch, Naruto not moving, just watching her with that same look in his eyes. After a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, his lips parted as he began to speak in a soft tone, in stark contrast to Naruto's bellows. Was I jealous? Oh, course I was. I wanted more than anything to be right there with you and Minami, getting to spend time with Tausen and Kasen, and my Nisans learning with you together like we always were. But it didn't turn out that way. It was you and Minami that were trained, and it hurt at first, seeing you two leave me behind, getting stronger while I got left behind, but that faded after a while. Naruto said, his voice calm and controlled. Naruto relaxed slightly, listening to Naruto's words, allowing the chakra around her to slowly begin to fade as she did. What I missed more than anything though was my Nisans. Playing pranks with you on Minami, or her having to break us up after we had taken a fight too far. I missed all of that, but you and her had to train, and I just sat and watched as you two left me behind. But I held on, waiting for my chance to train with you two, waiting for when we could go back to how we were all those years ago, happy together, but something happened. You and Minami started to change. Maybe I did too, and we didn't talk much anymore, we didn't laugh and play anymore. It wasn't the training I missed anymore, it was my Nisans. Continued the blonde, the claws and chakra fading away from Naruto as she listened to Naruto speak. By the time Mito was old enough to be on her own, we were barely hanging on anymore, heck if not for meals, I doubt we would have shared more than a few words with one another, and the worst part was that neither of you seemed to mind it. Finished Naruto, letting out a small sigh as he hopped off his log and stood facing Naruto, his face set in a look of determination as he did so. But none of that matters anymore, Naruto. You said I didn't understand, that you had to protect me, protect everyone and be the hero. Naruto said, while Naruto gave the blonde a small nod to affirm his statement. Naruto continued, taking a few steps forwards as he spoke. Naruto, I don't need a protector, and I don't want a hero, none of us do. I want my niece back, I want the smiling girl that I used to play with back, I want to see her and Mito playing and laughing together like they should be, instead of looking at each other, like they don't even know what a sister should be to the other. Continued Naruto, standing just a foot in front of Naruto as he finished his last sentence, Naruto looking at him a little confused as he stared into her eyes, purple into blue. And if this world won't let you be my Neeson, if it can't keep spinning without my family being able to smile together, then I'll tear it down with my own hands and make a new world where that can happen, because I'm through watching and waiting while the things I love are taken from me. Finished Naruto with a kind of finality in his tone that made Naruto shiver slightly. The girl's mind raced at Naruto's words, hope, anger, fear, and a multitude of other emotions shot through her mind, trying and failing to form a solid cohesive thought. Her mind was at a loss at what to do next, and her mind, reaching for something familiar, snagged on the one constant in all of her time since her training began. But I have to protect everyone. I have to save them. She said, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke the words. Naruto looked at Naruto with a pained look as he shook his head slowly and turned to leave the girl behind. No, Naruto, it's you that needs saving, but you have to want to be saved. When you are, I'll be waiting. Naruto said as he turned to leave. Just as he was about to exit the field, there was a flash of yellow light and Minato arrived, looking around worried. Thanks to his seals scattered around the village, he had detected that last burst of chakra from Naruto and, fearing an attack, had headed out to get to her, concerned she was under attack. When he arrived, he found the training field torn up slightly from what could only have been the fox's chakra and a shaken-looking Naruto standing there looking at a complete lost as to what to do with herself. As his eyes panned around, he spotted Naruto apparently unaffected in the slightest, standing a few yards off with his back to both Naruto and himself. What happened here? Asked Minato, rushing over to check on Naruto, who looked like she was about to pass out on her feet while looking between her and Naruto, trying to get an answer out of either of them. Nothing, Hokage-sama, I was just talking to Naruto, that is all. Replied Naruto without turning to face Minato as he moved to walk away from the pair with long deliberate strides. Minato looked down at the seemingly shaken girl before him before turning to look back at Naruto's retreating form, his eyes darkening slightly as he did. The next moment there was another flash of yellow light and Naruto found his path blocked by Minato supporting a still shaken Naruto. Hold it, Naruto, you are going to explain what happened here first. Naruto looks like she just went through a fight and you seem just fine with that, in fact you don't even seem concerned for her and I want to know why. Minato said, his voice hard. Although the Hokage didn't want to believe that Naruto had done something, the situation he was looking at made it very hard for him to come to any other conclusion, and if Naruto was harming Naruto, his own personal failing aside, he would not stand for it. Naruto didn't seem surprised by the Hokage's tone or his words and just looked up at the man with a bored expression. As I said, Hokage-sama, we just talked. Naruto got a bit upset during one part of the conversation and let out a burst of chakra, that's all. Replied Naruto, his tone radiating a lack of interest in talking to the blonde man before him, which did not go unnoticed by the Hokage. Minato gave the boy a hard look that Naruto didn't appear to even care about. Naruto, just because Naruto is your opponent in the next round does not excuse you to come at her in any way, she is your Neeson, and I would expect you not to attempt to psych her out. Said Minato, truly feeling that was what had happened. For a second there was complete silence before a sudden feeling of absolute anger seemed to envelop the training field. Minato felt shivers run down his spine as he sensed it. It wasn't killing intent or anything like it that he could remember experiencing. It was more as if the very air around them had suddenly become heavy, as if attempting to hold some kind of negative feelings in check. And in that oppressive feeling, Naruto lowered his head before speaking. I would never harm Naruto, Hokage-sama, or anyone else I love, nor would I allow any harm to come to them. Unlike you, if I was forced to choose between the world and my loved ones, I would hold them close as it fell to ruin around me, then I would rebuild it from the ashes so that those I loved would be safe in it. Naruto said, his voice coming out in a soft voice without anger or happiness, but simple confidence, like he was stating that the sun would rise the next day or that the sky was blue. And if the world didn't let my loved ones be happy, I would light the match to set it ablaze myself, Hokage-sama, so don't you dare say for 1 second that I would do anything to hurt Naruto or anyone else I love, am I clear? Asked Naruto, never raising his head to look at Minato the whole time he spoke. Minato for his part felt a stab of sadness and anger as he heard his son's words. They matched too well with his own concerning the prophecy, and there was no doubt in his mind that Kushina had told Naruto about what had transpired the last few days between the two. Also with that came a pang of anger that Naruto would so flippantly throw away everyone's happiness just for his own apparent satisfaction. Naruto, you don't have a clue what you are saying, you're talking like you wouldn't care if the village fell tomorrow, as long as you and those you loved were safe, that's just selfishness, and a shinobi isn't meant to be a child. Shot back Minato, a slight bite to his voice as he said the words. Naruto let out a small chuckle at that before slowly making his way away from the Hokage, walking in the direction back to town, letting his words carry back to Minato as he left. If that is what it means to be a shinobi nowadays, maybe it would be better if the whole system did fall apart. Naruto said as he moved past Minato, not pausing to see the look of horror on Minato's face as he did. Besides, continued the blonde boy as he exited the field, if I make my choices with my heart I will never live to regret them. Hokage-sama, can you say the same? Finished the boy as he made his way back towards the village. Minato stood there stunned for a few moments, his mind racing with what he had just heard Naruto say. After a moment he remembered Naruto's condition and flashed away to the hospital to make sure the girl was alright, sending out a summons to Jiraiya as he did so. A horrible fear had risen up inside him as Naruto had spoken, and a sense of dread was settling down on him surrounding his only son. It was a few days later after Minami and Naruto had returned to training with Jiraiya. Naruto had recovered that same day from what the doctors said was just simple exhaustion, and neither Minato nor Naruto had spoken since the event. At the moment it was around 1 o'clock in the morning in Konoha, and a bright moon was hovering over the sleeping village, staring down as the night guards made their patrols through the town, and a few late-night parties were stumbling back to their homes. Among those that were still away, one in particular stood out against the rest. A red-haired boy sat perched on the edge of a building gazing up at the moon, a twisted smirk playing across his lips as he looked at it with a hungry expression playing across his face, transforming it into a terrifying mask of primal desire. For a long time he sat there until, without turning his eyes away from the moon, he spoke up, his voice coming out twinged with a small bit of the madness playing through his eyes. So you showed up, mother said you would, and she is never wrong. Gaara said, his voice barely above a whisper. A moment later Naruto landed on the other side of the roof from Gaara, looking up at the moon as well, his hands thrust down into his pockets as he looked up at the moon. I guess Shukaku isn't known as the smartest of the tailed beasts for nothing, replied Naruto casually, never taking his eyes away from the moon as he spoke. Gaara seemed to pause for a moment considering the blonde's words before he spoke again. Mother says that you are like me. Gaara said, still looking at the moon. Naruto seemed to consider that for a few moments before replying. Well, Shukaku ought to know, after all, what son wouldn't recognize his own mother? Heck, Kyuubi recognized her almost at once. Chuckled Naruto, actually getting a confused look from Gaara for once. I have to say, this whole back and forth is fun and all, but I'm not here to talk to you, continued Naruto, reaching behind him for a moment and drawing out one of his seeds, holding it out to Gaara. The Reed eyed the black orb apprehensively for a few moments. Go on son, grab hold, it as a gift, I will not let it harm you, my Gaara, whispered Shukaku into Gaara's ear. But mother, what if this is a trick? He's just like the others, he's aiming for my life, I can't let him. Gaara shot back in a worried tone. The constant assassination attempts had given the boy only two emotions, fear and anger. What was worse, the gear was stripped between the two. Shukaku seemed to pause, considering its next words carefully. Steering the red-headed youth was difficult at the best of times. Humans weren't meant to function in a state of almost constant paranoia. There is nothing to worry about, my Gaara, I will allow no harm to come to you now, take the gift, trust me, Gaara, replied Shukaku, getting a slow nod from Gaara, who stretched his hand out to lightly touch his fingers against the black orb surface. There was a sudden pulling sensation, and Gaara found himself blinking around in a sudden light. As he covered his eyes, he noticed he was standing in a sandy desert-like area, with a light wind blowing white fine sand that rolled slowly over his feet. Looking around, he saw that the white dunes came to a sudden end and gave way to a plain of bright green grass that waved lazily back and forth thanks to the soft breeze. For a moment he just stood there stunned until a gentle hand alighted upon his head, causing him to look up in shock at the touch. He glimpsed a heart-shaped face and two large black eyes set above a sad smile looking down at him as a voice whispered in his ear. Sleep now, Gaara, rest while you can, whispered Juubi softly as Gaara's eyes drooped slightly and his mind surrendered to the soft embrace of sleep. As the boy's mind faded, the white sand seemed to stir and several white claws formed, slowly reaching out for the boy, threatening to drag him down below the shifting sands. Before they could reach the boy, Juubi swatted them away with a swipe of one hand, causing them to collapse again into softly falling piles of sand as they did. Juubi gave the sand a small saddened glare before gently lifting the boy's form and setting him to rest on the grass a few feet away from the sand, its grains seemingly unable to encroach closer to snare him. Once the boy was settled down, Juubi rose and turned to face the sand, a small glare on her face as she did. "Why Shukaku, what could this child have possibly done to you that would make you attack him so?" asked Yubi to the shifting sands that seemed to freeze suddenly motionless, the wind halting its gentle course and everything going suddenly still. That stillness seemed to stretch on for a second too long before the sand moved with a single fluid grace, pulling back to pile upon itself, forming a figure out of its mass. After a few seconds the excess sand fell away, revealing the towering form of Shukaku sitting calmly across from Juubi, his great arms folded in his lap as his bright golden eyes looked down at her figure, a puzzled look on the great Tanuki's face. "Why Kasan, I would think the answer was obvious," replied Shukaku, an actual note of confusion apparent in his tone as he looked down at the women, just looked back. Shukaku shifting himself slightly, resting his chin in one massive palm before looking down at Juubi with one eyebrow cocked up in a look of genuine confusion. "He is a human, one of the wretched creatures that tore me from you and enslaved my siblings, your children. One of the disgusting wretches that scamper about destroying all that they can touch and understand, so I ask you Kasan, why should I not make them suffer for their sins?" asked Shukaku, his tone indicating more a statement than a question. Yubi looked up at Shukaku with a pitying look on her face before shaking her head slightly at her eldest. "Oh Shukaku-kun, is that why you have done this, is that why you play this charade of madness, just for a chance to hurt them more?" asked Yubi, sadly, already knowing the answer before she had finished. Shukaku for his part looked like she had just slapped him. For a second the great Tanuki bowed its head as if in prayer before its deep voice rang out again. "Is that why?" he replied softly, the sand around him shaking slightly as the rage rolled off of him. "Is that not enough? Have you forgiven them, Kasan? Have you forgiven him, the man who ripped you to pieces, the man who left my siblings to become living weapons, bound to sacks like that boy over there to be used as tools? Is that what you would have for me, Kasan, a slave to his words and dreams? No Kasan, I will never bow to him or any of his ilk. I will destroy them whenever and wherever I can. They will all pay for the suffering they placed on my family," howled the Tanuki in a loud rage, slamming his great fist down onto the sand, causing a wave of white to be sent crashing in every direction from the impact. Yubi did not look away or flinch at Shukaku's actions, she just looked over at Shukaku with small tears brining in her eyes as she did so. "Shukaku-kun," whispered Juubi, walking softly forward, her bare feet making soft indents in the sand as she came to stand before her eldest, her hand reaching out to gently lay against the massive Tanuki's hand as she turned her black eyes up to look into his golden orbs, a stricken look on her face. "Oh Shukaku-kun, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry I wasn't there to protect you, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect any of you, but this isn't the way, please, that bastard already condemned his sons to fight to the end of their lines, please. Please don't let him do the same to you, just let it go, let the hate go, please stop this act of madness before it consumes you. Please." Yubi said, tears running down her face as she pressed herself into Shukaku's hand, trying to hold the great Tanuki's hand with her body, giving it a squeeze, wishing she could just hold her Sachi and protect him from the world around him, just shut out all the pain and sadness that had battered the Tanuki for decades and decades. Shukaku seemed to pause for a moment, looking down at Yubi, a small weight falling on him at seeing her in such pain. As he watched, his memories showed him scenes of Yubi torched, in pain and crying as the sage of the seven paths tore his siblings from her one by one. The sound of those screams still rang in his mind, they rang every time he had struck down another human, fueling his rage and hate. With a great effort, Shukaku moved a sliver of sand to brush over to Juubi, softly separating her from his hand and slivering up to wipe away the tears of her face. As the sand retreated, Shukaku drew in a deep breath. "No Kasan, I can't let it go, not after what was done to you and my siblings. I will not stop my path, not even for you, I can't," Shukaku replied, Juubi looking sadly up at the great Tanuki with sadness. "That man may have died, but it is not enough, they all have to pay for what they have done. To you and to me. Oh now Kasan, I love you too much to raise my hand against you, but I will not allow you to stop me either." Shukaku finished as she slowly started to fall back into the shifting desert, even as Juubi called out to him, her voice racked with sadness. "Shukaku-kun, no please, please," called out Juubi, falling to her knees as she looked out at the shifting sands. As the sand finally settled, a small soft voice reached her ears from across the great white expanse. "I'm sorry Kasan, but I'm not the same Shukaku you knew from all those years ago. I won't be stopped. Not even for you mama," came a sad voice from Shukaku, drifting gently across the desert as Yubi pulled her knees up to her chest and felt tears brimming out as she looked out at the slowly fading desert. She didn't notice when Naruto arrived. The blonde seemed to have just appeared beside her, looking out over the sand as he did. "It will be okay Juubi. Naruto said, causing her to look up at him, her eyes still brimming with tears. Naruto looked down at Yubi, giving her a small soft smile as he spoke again. "He can still be saved, and we'll find a way, I promise you," Naruto said softly, causing Yubi to let a small smile to twinge her lips as she looked up at the blonde. "Hi Naruto, I'm not willing to let him go either. Even if I have to smack him around to get it through his thick head," replied Yubi, forcing her smile to broaden slightly as she rose to her feet even as the mindscape began to fade and looking over at Naruto with a grateful expression. Naruto smiled back at her and nodded in reply. Meanwhile back in Konoha, Naruto blinked his eyes open to find he was laying down on the top of the flat roof, looking up at the moon with a small pain in his back. Apparently as he had entered the mindscape his body had gone limp, causing him to fall down onto the flat of the roof. Luckily for him the slope had not been enough to cause him to slide down to the street below. Without wasting any time Naruto pushed himself up and gave the unconscious Gaara a sideways look before hopping away headed for home. Gaara spent the rest of the night passed out on the roof. To say the Suna team had been horrified when they had found him the next morning was an understatement. Kankuro had given the sleeping boy one look before diving headfirst off the side of the building with a girlish shriek and headfirst into a conveniently placed fruit stand. It had been a few days since Yubi's encounter with her eldest and she had managed to pull herself out of the sadness and towards her eldest and had focused herself towards helping Naruto and his seedlings prepare for the upcoming finals. Or at least they had been. At the moment most of the seedlings were busy with a few different actives strewn about the backyard of Tsunade's home. Two of the seedlings were busy going through a simple spar while Hanabi and Mito watched cheering the two on. The other four were currently sitting around a wide round table with a single blonde woman all looking around intently at one another as Tsunade pushed a small pile of chips forward to add to a growing pile in the center of the table with a small smirk on her face. "I've got you this time you houseplant, all in," Tsunade said, grinning down at the cards held in her right hand. The seedlings around the table looked from the cards held in their own hands back to Tsunade and then back down, letting out soft hums of concentration. Three of the seedlings put their cards face down on the table, letting out short hums, signaling them folding from the hand and turning to watch their fellows. The final seedling gave a look over at Tsunade, letting out a happy little hum of its own. Unlike its fellows, this seedling didn't appear as a mirror image of Naruto, but rather as a faceless version of Ino. For some reason the seedling tended to transform into that form whenever it was concentrating. So far neither Jubi nor Naruto had managed to figure out why it happened, but decided it had to have something to do with Ino's activities inside the creature's head. For whatever reason the Ino seedling was looking over at Tsunade over her cards before its ponytail came up and pushed a large amount of chips forward before letting out a soft hum without looking away from her opponent. Tsunade let out a small bark of laughter at that, smiling over to where Shizune and Naruto looked on, shaking their heads at the whole situation. "Well Gaki, looks like your seedlings aren't that good at learning after all, cause she just screwed up big time," chuckled Tsunade, showing her hand to the table. Tsunade showed a full house to the group of humming seedlings before folding her arms under her chest and fixing the Ino seedling with a small smirk before continuing. "Well beat that houseplant." Tsunade said, an obvious amount of happiness present in her tone. In answer the Ino seed laid her hand down, showing a royal flush of hearts, letting out a happy humming sound as her ponytail snaked its way over to the pile, pulling the chips towards it. Tsunade looked over at the seedling for a few seconds before she slammed her hands onto the table, flipping it over, causing cards and chips to go all over the porch and throwing a few of the seedlings onto their backs. "I will not be beaten by a houseplant, now give me my winnings," shouted Tsunade, charging forwards as the Ino seedling let out an alarmed high-pitched hum and turned to flee into the backyard, pursued by an angry Tsunade raging behind it. Shizune looked at the scene before her for a second before letting her head drop comically as Naruto patted her softly on the back. "You know, I thought she wouldn't get like this since they were playing for fun," Shizune said in a slightly dejected tone, not raising her head. Naruto just let out a small chuckle before sending a mental command to the seedlings to start picking up the mess on the porch, which they set about, and in moments a happy little amount of humming was coming from the group as they set everything back into position. Meanwhile everyone was busy watching as the Ino seedling had jumped into a tree and was currently looking down at a fuming Tsunade as she stalked around the base like a predator who had cornered its prey. After a few minutes of this, Naruto finally called out to Tsunade in a cheerful tone. "Yo Tsunade, mind not killing my seedling, I don't have that many to go around," called the other blonde as he made his way slowly down the steps of the porch with the other four seedlings in tow. Tsunade whirled around to face Naruto, her eyes still ablaze with annoyance as she responded. "I'm not going to kill it, I'm going to educate it, there's a difference, besides you popped one of these guys out brand new a few days ago, so what's it matter if I take this one out?" asked Tsunade, jabbing a thumb up at the cowering seedling. Naruto froze slightly at the women's words while issuing a small mental thought. "Crap, please tell me she didn't hear that." thought Naruto, turning slowly around to see if a certain someone had heard his fellow blonde's words. For a second he thought he had managed to dodge a bullet. That was at least until a small red projectile crashed into his back, driving him forwards into the ground with a cry of excitement. "Aniki, you didn't tell me you had a new seedling, where is it? I want to meet it, is it?" Fired off Mito from her perch on top of Naruto. Tsunade let out a seeming triumphant smirk, relaxing slightly. If she couldn't get the seedling, then their creator wasn't a bad second prize, she chuckled to herself. Hanabi had also headed over, shaking his head slightly at Mito's actions, and the downed boy. "Come on Naruto, you know better than to say something like that with Mito around," Hanabi said as he drew up with the blonde who still had his face buried face down in the grass. "Go away Hanabi, you're running my disguise as a recently knocked out older sibling," came Naruto's voice, slightly muffled thanks to his position. Hanabi in turn looked over at Mito, who was smiling up at her friend from her position astride the blonde. Hanabi managed to reach over and pull Mito onto her feet while prodding Naruto slightly with one foot. "Well, I think you might have killed him this time Mito, now we'll never know what happened to Seed-kun," Hanabi said, his tone slightly exasperated. Mito gave the Hyuga a slightly embarrassed look before pausing and looking over at the boy, tilting her head slightly. "Wait, Seed-kun. He's right over," replied Mito, pausing and looking around as she realized she hadn't seen Seed-kun for the past few weeks. Naruto had been training most days and had only been able to have a few of these playdates recently, and she couldn't remember the last time she had seen Hanabi's and her favorite seedling. Most couldn't have told you the difference between one seedling and another, but the two had managed to distinguish the seedling that they had spent the most time with, and with a start, Mito realized that none of the seedlings surrounding them was it. Both children turned their eyes over to see Naruto had pushed himself up slightly and was idly scratching his head and trying not to look suspicious. Without communication, the two children sprang into action, Mito wrapping Naruto up in two golden chains from head to toe, while Hanabi moved himself behind Naruto, placing an open palm to the boy's back, letting him feel the small pressure of it. Tsunade and Shizune looked over at the production with small smirks. The two may be only 6 years old, but they sure knew how to play a good game. "Aniki, what happened to Seed-kun?" asked Mito in a voice that was so similar to Kushina's when she was upset. Tsunade had to force herself to stop from laughing openly at the scene. The Hyuga boy leaned forward slightly, apply a bit more pressure to Naruto's back. "Better tell her Naruto, or I'll have to go get Nisan and Roku to help us," spoke the Hyuga in an attempt at a threatening tone. The effect was more comical than threatening, particularly given that at that moment, Naruto was rolling his eyes in an exaggerated manner. After a second, Naruto took in a deep breath and let it out with a heavy sigh before shifting slightly as the golden chains broke apart as a black orb with touches of red slowly moved out of Naruto's coat to float beside him, drawing all of those present's attention as it did. Naruto made his way to his feet, smiling down at the two kids as he did so as their eyes tracked the orb as it floated a foot away. Okay, Emoto, Hanabi, you win. Seed-kun was in a little accident recently and I wanted to hold off on reintroducing him, so if you guys want to meet him, you'll have to be ready, he's changed a bit from last time," Naruto said, looking between the two as their eyes grew wide as they looked over at the hovering ball. Mito was the first to move, grabbing onto Naruto's leg and looking up at the blonde with a worried expression. "Seed-kun is alright, isn't he Aniki? He's okay right?" asked Mito, looking concerned. Naruto gave her comforting smile as he ruffled her hair slightly before replying. "Hi Mito, he's just fine, but I don't think you'll be calling him Seed-kun anymore," smiled Naruto as the two children and even the two women present fixed him with odd looks. "Well, say hello to Kyuid," Naruto said with a large smile on his face as the seed cracked open and Kyuid took form in front of them. It started with a basic seedling body that carried small faint bits of red throughout it. For a second that was all, until there was a small pulse of red chakra that Tsunade and Shizune recognized as Kyuubi's. And the seedling's eyes both flashed, one turning bright red as its form shifted 2 spots on its head, forming and elongating into 2 ears, a mix between a fox's and a rabbit's, while 9 bumps on near its bottom burst out into 9 long swishing foxtails, the same black color as the rest of the seedling. The clothing faded slowly, while what looked like smooth black fur with the occasional red one covered the creature from head to clawed toe. After a moment, Kyuid sat before the group, its 2 different eyes glowing slightly as it let out a sound halfway between a purr and a hum as its tails and ears flicked in apparent happiness at seeing the 2 children in front of it. For a second nothing happened, then as if someone had flipped a switch, both Mito and Hanabi catapulted themselves forward, bowling Kyuid back onto its tails with excited cries as the 2 buried their faces into the changed seedling's short smooth fur. Naruto looked down at the 3 as Kyuid rolled over with the 2, wrapping a tail around the 2 and turning the hug's initial impact into a rolling wrestling contest. Soon the 2 kids were up with Kyuid in tow, happily looking over the seedling as it playfully batted at them with its tails, letting out purrs and hum interminably. Soon Naruto as well as Tsunade and Shizune were again seated on the back porch as Mito and Hanabi had apparently run themselves ragged and had simply laid down in the yard using Kyoid as a makeshift pillow. Mito in fact had managed to pull on of Kyoid's tails over her as an improvised blanket while the girl smiled happily in her sleep. Shizune looked over at the three children for a few moments longer before turning to face Naruto, a smile spreading across her lips as she did. You know, if the whole shinobi thing doesn't work out you could always open up a petting zoo. She teased, getting an annoyed look from Naruto in return before he let out a sigh and set down his head on the table with a soft thump. Between them, Akamaru and Hinata-chan's new summons, we might as well be known as Team Kawaii. The blonde boy said in a mocking tone, not raising his head from the table. Tsunade and Shizune gave the boy a small pitying look before chuckling slightly to themselves at the vision of all of them gathered together. You know, that may just fit. Chuckled Shizune as Naruto let out a defiant little moan of protest. While Naruto was taking the teasing of a lifetime, far away in the Toad Realm, Naruto and Minami were following Jiraiya as he led them over to a spot for them to recover from their last training session. The girls were dog-tired from their morning workout, the sage had been pushing them to their limits every day, without exception, but the girls hadn't complained. In fact, they had welcomed the work with open arms. Though neither of them said why out loud, it was clear that neither wanted to experience another loss like the one they had suffered in the forest. Soon Jiraiya left the two to rest while he headed over to get started preparing their next exercise. The two sat there breathing slowly in an open clearing that had a small waterfall that splashed with a steady rumble off of smooth stones a few feet from where they laid. Naruto, with a groan of effort, moved herself into a roll that ended with her head dipping into the edge of the waterfall's course, the water running slowly over her head, flattening her blonde hair to her head and shoulder as it did. She let out a happy sigh before rolling a foot away, her hair plastered to her as she smiled up at the sky. I'm alive. She called in a happy tone, turning her head slightly to spy Minami a few feet away. Minami gave her sister a small exaggerated smirk before looking up at the sky as well. After a moment Minami spoke up. Naruto, we need to talk. Said the redeed, not shifting at all as she spoke. Naruto gave Minami a curious look for a second before Minami spoke up again. I was with Mito the other day and she said something to me that I think you need to hear. The redeed continued, her tone not changing. She proceeded to recount the experience she had shared between their Emoto and herself, stopping at the point the two had left the monument. For a while Naruto just looked over at her Nisan without comment. Finally the blonde turned away from Minami, looking back at the waterfall. So Mito thinks I'm sick, is that it? Stated Naruto in a hashed tone, thinking back to her encounter with Naruto a few days previously. After she had left, her mind had still been racing, and with her emotions the way they were, she had been all too ready to accept the reassuring words of Minato, telling her how proud he was of all her hard work. And how she would be able to be like him someday, protecting everyone she loved. The Hokage couldn't have known what his words would cause the girl to fall back, trying to hold on to those beliefs all the stronger. There was still a doubting voice in her thoughts, but Naruto had forced it down, fighting herself to remain in control. She doesn't understand, she's just a kid. Naruto said after a moment, the anger obvious in her voice as she spoke. Minami frowned at her Nisan's words for a second, looking over at the blonde's back, concern etched onto her face. Naruto, she began in a sad tone, that's not what it is at all, she's worried about us is all, she just wants all of us to be happy, please Naruto, think about it, remember how we were back then, Kasen, Tausen, me, you and Nisan. Remember? Asked Minami, her voice thick with emotion. There was a moment's pause before the blonde spoke. Of course I remember, but we were kids then Minami, we aren't anymore. We can't just do what we want and play all day anymore, we have a responsibility to the village and everyone we care about. I want more than anything to just go back to being happy like we were back then, but I can't do that and protect everyone. I won't risk losing you or anyone else again. Like in the forest. Finished Naruto, her voice losing a bit of its bite near the end. Minami looked over at her sister for a second before she pushed herself up and made her way over to where Naruto lay, trying not to look over at her sister. Minami bent down, grabbing Naruto's shoulder and pulling the blonde into a sitting position, taking a knee while gently placing a hand on Naruto's cheek and turning the girl's blue eyes to look into her own red ones. Naruto, I'm not going anywhere and neither is anyone else, but you can't always be there to protect us, started Minami, Naruto opening her mouth to argue, but halting as Minami continued on, not giving the blonde a chance. And you shouldn't have to either, you're right, we aren't kids anymore Nisan, but that means you have to let us grow up as well, trust us to look after ourselves Naruto, you don't have to be alone if you don't want to be. Miami said softly, giving the blonde a soft smile. Naruto looked unsure for a moment but gave Minami a small nod just as Jiraiya re-entered the clearing, looking around at the two. Glad to see you two are getting along well, you know there are a lot riding on you too. Smiled Jiraiya as he looked between the two. Naruto seemed to lighten at his words, but Minami's smile slowly fell into a small frown. Hey Caillou, is it just me or does it sound like Jiraiya-san is trying to sell us something? Asked Minami in her mind, not liking the way the Toad Sage was speaking, almost like he was trying to lead them on. Caillou, listening, shriveled up his nose in apparent agreement before replying. I agree, Minami-chan, something seems off with him and I don't like it. Snorted Caillou while turning around a few times and settling himself onto the new bed of grass that Yuubi had managed to keep in his cage. Minami gave a mental nod of agreement as she focused back on Jiraiya and Naruto as they made their way back to the training area. Finally the big day arrived and everyone was gathering in front of the stadium, all eyed each other with a mixture of anticipation and excitement as they all stood outside of the stadium's arena, waiting for the signal to march out into the arena floor. The teams stood idly around, some trading glances with their opponents, while others like Team 11 had grouped together to exchange a few words before the match began. So you two ready for this? My cousin and Neeson got here early just to get some good seats. How about you two? Asked Kiba, smiling at the two, while Akamaru let out a happy little bark of agreement. My cousin came early with Hanabi. Tausen wanted him to be sitting with the clan, but cousin managed to get him to sit over with Mito and Kushina. They could all be over together for all we know. Hinata said with a shrug, looking over at Naruto, who gave her a shrug in return. You okay, Naruto? Asked Kiba, noticing the blonde's apparent discomfort. Naruto looked over at Kiba for a moment before shrugging. Yeah, sorry, just had a little issue earlier. Naruto replied as he started in explaining the events that had occurred just a few hours previously. Flashback mark. 400 it seems like. The Namikaze family had just arrived at the stadium and Minato and Kushina were busy welcoming a few of the visiting dignitaries. Mito let out a small squeak of excitement as she spotted a figure coming towards the group, grabbing hold of Mito's pant leg and tugging in excitement while pointing towards the oncoming figure. Neeson, look, it's Princess Gale. Neeson, you have to introduce me, please, please, please. Mito excitedly chatted as she pointed towards the new queen of the land of snow. Koyuki Fujikaze was dressed in flowing green and aqua kimono, her hair drawn back into an eloquent tail that showed off her long beautiful face, framed by her dark blue bangs. She would have been very beautiful to look at, but her face was fixed into a look of apparent annoyance at everything around her, and she walked with an air of someone was not at all happy to be there. Minami recognized the women and motioned for Naruto to join her before the three girls headed over to where Koyuki was approaching. Koyuki seemed to recognize two of the figures of Minami and Naruto and let out a small sigh as she looked over at them. Hey Koyuki, remember us, it's Naruto and Minami, we were the ones who helped you become queen, remember? Called Naruto with a small note of pride in her voice. Koyuki looked between the two for a moment before letting out a sigh of annoyance. Hi, I remember you two, the heroes of spring and snow, where's the boy who needed a personality transplant? Asked Koyuki in a tone of someone forcing themselves to remain patient. Naruto didn't seem to notice as she gently stepped back, allowing Mito to step in front of her, the small girl's eyes twinkling with excitement as looked up at her favorite actress. Koyuki seemed to notice the girl's attention and looked down, quirking one eyebrow up as if taking stock the girl. Hello Princess Gale, it's really great to meet you. Spoke Mito, her tone showing nothing but happiness at meeting her favorite actress of all time. See, can you sign my friend Hanabi-kun's and my pictures of you later? If it's not too much trouble. Please. Finished Mito, her eyes looking up hopefully towards the women. Koyuki looked down at the girl for a moment before letting out a sigh and raising a hand to rub against her forehead lightly, as if a headache was coming on. Ugh, of course you do, sorry Gaki, but I don't do autographs. Replied Yuki, waving her hand in a dismissive fashion as she did. Mito looked absolutely crushed at the women reply, sagging slightly as the women spoke. Naruto looked down at Uramoto before glaring up at the princess, disgust on her face as she did. Hey, what's your problem? My Neeson and I saved your life and helped you become queen, you could at least give Miyamoto an autograph. Fired off Naruto, drawing a skeptical look from Koyuki before the new queen of spring and snow replied in a harsh tone. Don't act all high and mighty to me Gaki, you were hired to protect me, it was a job and you were paid, so that what you did. I'm an actress and a queen, I'm paid to do the same and not to look after little kids. Finished Koyuki, turning to leave, but finding her path blocked. Standing before Koyuki was Naruto, who was looking up into the Koyuki's face, a look of equal parts anger and mocking grace. For a moment he just kept looking at her before he let out a soft chuckle. So that's it, you're just a puppet, a hollow toy they move around on stage to say the lines they need her to. I knew the effects had gotten good for movies, but I never would have guessed they were this good. The blonde boy said, his voice hard and carrying a bite of anger in it. Koyuki looked like she had just been slapped for a moment as she looked down at Naruto, too stunned to reply. I guess that makes sense though, what's the point of having a real queen when you could have a puppet one, just a hollow thing that acts like it cares and feels, making pretend it has a heart, so tell me Hollow Queen of Spring, is this all there is to you? asked Naruto, his gaze never faltering from the woman's face. Koyuki gritted her teeth and pulled back a hand, swinging it forward to slap across the boy's face. Before it could connect, Naruto lazily reached up and caught the blow, giving the woman a cold smirk as he did so that froze Koyuki's blood for a moment. "Sorry puppet, try fixing yourself and maybe then you have a chance of hitting me, till then just keep playing the pretend and sitting in your self-pity, cause guess what, I don't care if you are a queen, an actress, or Kami's own daughter, cause no one talks to my Minato like that, you got me?" asked Naruto, giving the woman's hand a small squeeze to infuse his point. Koyuki nodded quickly before Naruto released her hand and walked past her even as her two guards rushed up to her to see what had caused her distress. Even as they arrived, Naruto's words echoed in her head, causing her to wonder for the first time in what felt like a lifetime what she had lost all those years ago, along with her tears, and if she wanted it to remain lost to her. Naruto and Minami in the meantime stared after Naruto as he made his way out of the area, heading for the ground floor, most likely looking for the other members of his team. Flashback end. Meanwhile in the stadium, people were just finding their seats, looking down in interest while excited chatter started to fill the stadium. Up in the cage booth, Minato was greeting three individuals who had just arrived, Kushina by his side, eyeing a particular figure intently. "Let me start by saying thank you for coming all the way to Konoha. I hope that this tournament will help improve relations between our villages in the future," Minato said, smiling over at the two cages who had made the trip to witness the tournament. First was the Kazekage, dressed in his formal robes, with his cage hat perched upon his head covering his eyes from view. The Kazekage inclined his head to Minato and Kushina before speaking. "Thank you Hokage-san, I hope that this tournament will help strengthen the bonds between our two villages," spoke the robed figure before moving over to talk to his four guards a short distance away. At the same time, one of the other figures, a woman, let out a small chuckle looking over at the retreating form of the Kazekage. "No time for pleasantries, that one," said the woman as she turned her eyes to face Minato and Kushina, allowing a smile to play across her bright red lips. The newest Mizukage Mei was a tall woman clad in an ocean blue dress that did nothing to conceal her generous curves. Her light orange hair fell down her back, with a bun defining the top of her hair and one bunch hanging down to cover her right eye. She had the blue Mizukage hat hanging lazily from her belt and was standing with her arms folded under her generous bosom as she looked at the Hokage and then over to Kushina, noticing her gaze for the first time. Kushina was not looking at the Mizukage but rather at the man standing beside her. He was a tall man with short black hair and a face covered in wrappings. He wore a black shinobi vest and the standard mist camo pants. What defined the man's dress more than anything was the giant cleaver that hung from his back, and he was staring back at Kushina, a small grin showing under his bandaged face. "Something between you two I should know about?" asked Mei in a dangerous voice as she turned to look at Zabuza, who stood on to her right looking over at Kushina with mild interest. Kushina in the meantime was glaring at the man with enough intensity it was a miracle that his head didn't burst into flames, just from the intensity. "Hi Kage-sama, we had an encounter back in Wave a few months back and she seems to be carrying a grudge for what happened," smirked Zabuza, giving a dismissive shoulder shrug as she spoke. "Personally I'm not concerned about it, it was strictly business from my end, but I can see how she might be angry at me roughing up her students," finished Zabuza while giving the retreat a knowing wink. Kushina in turn bit back her anger and nodded slowly. True, it had been nothing personal when she and Zabuza had fought, but after what had happened there she wasn't about to start chatting with the man like old buddies. Still, it had been her idea to have the Mizukage come to Konoha in hope of learning more about Karen and any Uzumakis living in Mist, so for the time she would swallow her anger and focus. "It is nothing Mizukage-sama, I assure you nothing will happen between us while you are our guest here," spoke Kushina while inclining her head slightly to Mei. The Mizukage took a moment to smile back at Kushina, bowing her head in return. "No need to worry Kushina-san, before my forces collected Zabuza he was a missing nin and I had to spend quite some time in re-educating him," finished Mei with a dangerous little smile that made Zabuza shiver despite himself. Soon everyone was settled down as Minato rose to his feet and stepped to the edge of the booth, looking out over the crowd below, his eyes darting back and forth over it for a moment before his voice rang out over the stadium. "Citizens of Konoha, guests and visiting shinobi, welcome to the finals of this year's Chunin exams," called out Minato in a ringing voice that caused the voices to halt around the stadium and everyone's eyes to turn to face the Hokage. The Chunin exams finals was about to commence. Chapter 17. Talking. Thinking mental conversation. Demon god or the like. Jutsu. Who says violence never solves anything? Soon everyone was settled down as Minato rose to his feet and stepped to the edge of the booth, looking out over the crowd below, his eyes darting back and forth over it for a moment before his voice rang out over the stadium. "Citizens of Konoha, guests and visiting shinobi, welcome to the finals of this year's Chunin exams," called out Minato in a ringing voice that caused the voices to halt around the stadium and everyone's eyes to turn to face the Hokage. The Chunin exam finals was about to commence. Down in the tunnel all of the contestants turned their heads towards the entrance where a Jonin appeared, giving them a swift gesture of his hand to indicate them to follow him. The genin formed into a line of no particular order and marched out of the tunnel and into the bright light of the Konoha day. The sun was hanging in the sky without any clouds to halt its rays from reflecting off the rough ground and small spots of grass that in the few covered spots where trees had been placed into the arena floor. The 12 genin made their way into the center of the field, creating a large line in the arena floor and all turning to face up towards where the Hokage was addressing the crowd below. When the group came to a halt there was an explosion of noise from the crowd as they called down in excitement at seeing the contestants. From several spots in the stands names of those below were shouted and arms were waved trying to announce their location to the people below. From one position in particular the noise and intensity was particularly fierce. "Aniki, Minami Nisan, Naruto Nisan. Up here hey. Yeah," called an excited Mito as she waved her arms while looking down towards the group of participants below. Beside her Hanabi was looking between his excited friend and the stoic figure of his Tausen sitting beside him with his arms folded and his face set in a forced vestige of calm. Although Hanabi did notice his eyes twitch slightly as Mito continued to cheer. Hitomi on his left had a large smile on her lips as she looked down at her eldest and waved down to her silently. After a moment she noticed Hanabi's dilemma and the boy's desire to be cheering like his friend for his Nisan. With a sly smile Hitomi leaned over behind Hiyashi's stoic form and gently poked Hanabi getting the boy's attention. As he turned to see her, she pointed to Mito then to herself and him before giving him a happy nod. Hanabi for a moment seemed to be confused before his face split into a smile and he nodded excitedly before turning back towards the arena floor. Hiyashi at the moment was in a slightly annoyed mood. He had wished to observe the match from his usual position along with the other clan heads, being able to lecture Hanabi and using the matches to better the boy's understanding of combat. However, Hitomi had made it clear that this was not on the table. Hiyashi was many things, but a brave enough man to incite the Hyuga matriarch's wrath he was not. So he found himself seated along with his wife and Sachi. And the human air horn that happened to be his Sachi's best friend trying to remain stoic. It wasn't meant to last. "Hey Hinata Nisan Musum up here you can do it," came a cry from both Hanabi and Hitomi from either side of Hiyashi joining their voices with Mito and causing the stoic Hyuga to jump slightly in his seat, looking around annoyed at the two who just smiled back at him before turning back to cheer. Ashina arrived a moment later taking a seat beside Mito and cheered down to her children just as they were marched back into the contestant booth, leaving the first two contestants on the field. Down below a jonin with short cropped brown hair, tied back with a bandana and chewing on a senbon needle looked around his poise relaxed and slightly amused as he looked between the first two competitors. On the right stood Tamari her battle fan already slammed into the ground beside her, while a breeze caused her blonde hair and its 4 ponytails to sway gently even as her teal eyes glared over towards her opponent. Biba stood across from Tamari, his grey hoodie pulled back from his head, allowing his wild black hair to blow slightly in the wind as well, while his face fell into a feral grin, exposing his fangs to match the bright red ones on either cheek. Beside the boy on the ground was Akamaru, his body tense slightly well prepared for the coming fight, his fur standing slightly up as the pup's chakra ran through its body. As the two teens stood watching each other the winds between the two seemed to bristle with energy, as if pulled between the two teens. "Okay you two, the rules are the same they were in the prelims, you will fight with anything at your disposal till one of you is incapable of continuing. Death is not preferred and once I call the match it will end, do I make myself clear?" Finished the jonin looking between the two genin. Both teens nodded curtly in response, without taking their eyes off of each other for a moment. The jonin seeing this gave a small shrug before moving back a few feet from the two and raising an arm slowly as his eyes flicked back and forth between the two. "Alright, first round of the Chunin exams finals between Tamari of Suna and Kiba of Konoha begin," shouted the jonin as he leapt back from the point between the two. For a moment the two didn't move an inch, their eyes darting over each other quickly, as if taking in everything about their opponents. Then they were off. Tamari was the first to move, taking her fan still closed in her hands and half swinging it, half dragging in before her in a semicircle so that its tip remained in the ground and created a wave of wind and dirt between the two. The wave of dust shot up some 10 feet in the air, momentarily forming a cloud of wind and dust that separated the two from each other. Before the dust had time to settle, Tamari had allowed the force of the swing and the weight of the fan to pull her around, snapping the fan open as she did. Without letting her momentum fade, she completed her spin ending with a horizontal slash from behind the wall of dust, flinging forth a blade of wind that clearly cut the dividing dust in half and flying forward towards where her opponent had been standing. However, Kiba was not there to receive it. Just as the wall of dust and wind had shot up, Kiba and Akamaru had leapt right using the cover of the dust to close in on his target. Just as the blade of wind cut through the dust divide, Kiba had already fallen into his clan's taijutsu style and had sprung forwards on all fours close to the ground as he did so. Tamari's attack sailed uselessly over Kiba's head as he dove forward under the girl's swing. Tamari had only a moment to recognize the danger before Kiba was on her, springing up under her outstretched guard and bringing a clawed hand up towards her chin, aiming to make a quick end to the match. Slamming one foot down to the ground, the boy pivoted under the girl's chin, shooting an elbow up like a blade towards the girl's face. Tamari's eyes went wide as the elbow shot toward her. At the last second she was able to throw her head back, allowing the elbow to fly up and wide from its target. Before Kiba could even register that he had missed, Tamari had arched her back, allowing herself to fall backwards into a back bend and flinging her feet up in a sweep that caught the boy right on his exposed chin, forcing him to fly back from the blow, arching with it so that he landed on all fours, not far from where he had begun the match. Tamari finished her back arch, dropping down to one knee as she landed, while drawing her fan before her like a shield. The two genin just stared at each other for seconds before both genin's faces gave similar looks of satisfaction and then a moment of confusion at the other's expression. Kiba was the first to notice the small smell of iron as he brought his arm up to wipe quickly at his chin, his sleeve coming away with the blood from where Tamari's foot had slammed into it. Kiba looked down at the blood for a second before sinking back into his stance, staring over at the blonde-headed girl. Tamari was still trying to figure out Kiba's expression when a small stinging sensation came from her cheek. Absent-mindedly she brushed the back of her hand against it, bringing it away stained crimson with the blood from where Kiba's elbow had caught the edge of her face as she had turned it to avoid the strike. The two genin seemed to consider each other slowly as Tamari steadily made her way to her feet and swung her great fan behind her back and over one shoulder, gripping it tightly as she did. Seeing this, Kiba gave a small smirk before hunching back on his legs to bring his hands up to form a simple hand sign. Up in the stands, the Inyazuka clan was smiling down at the opening bout of the match, while Tsume let out a bark of laughter down at the two genin. Not a bad opening for the pup. I guess he wasn't kidding when he said his opponent wouldn't be a pushover, right Hana? Chuckled Tsume, giving her eldest a fanged smirk as she looked over at her. Hana for her part absently scratched one of the triplets' heads while giving Tsume a small nod, not taking her eyes off the match below. "Hi Kasen, but if that is all she has, then Emoto has it in the bag," replied Hana while the dogs let off small yips of agreement. Before the group could say more, a blast of noise from below drew their attention. Tamari, seeing Kiba's hands moving to form signs, had decided to not give the feral boy time to complete whatever he had planned. With a swing like a baseball bat, she brought her fan around, slinging a great gust of chakra-laced wind towards the boy. Kiba didn't hesitate and leapt immediately to the right, allowing the roaring gale to go by him, kicking up dirt and rock as it went. As Kiba landed, he only had a moment to steady himself before a second blast of wind was loosed towards him, drawing a small feral growl from the boy as he was forced to jump back once again from the blast. This time Kiba continued to retreat until he had put a small distance between himself and Tamari, letting out a sharp whistle as he did so. The next moment Akamaru had leapt to his side with a small bark of excitement. Tamari's eyes narrowed slightly as she saw the two from her position, letting out a small curse under her breath. "Damn, that guy is faster than I thought he would be, darn it, I was hoping to get him with that first move or at least slow him down, now it's an open fight and he has the speed on me." The blonde furiously thought to herself as she drew back her fan again, readying her next strike. Kiba in the meantime gave Akamaru a small nod before the two shot forwards, weaving back and forth as they came towards the girl, both on all fours as they did so. Without hesitating, Tamari let her face fall into a smirk and charged the two, closing the distance faster. Kiba and Akamaru were momentarily caught off guard by the girl's advance, but kept up the charge. Just as the three were about to meet, Tamari snapped her fan shut, swinging it above her before plunging it down into the ground before her and flinging herself up like an odd pool vault. As the girl shot up into the air, Kiba and Akamaru were forced to skid to a halt in order to not let their target fly over them and expose their back to an attack. Both dog and boy twisted their heads up to follow the girl's path as they did. As Tamari reached the apex of her leap, she flew through a quick few hand sighs before thrusting both of her hand across her chest in a vicious lashing motion that caused two sharp blades of wind to fly down in an X-like shape towards the Inyazuka. Kiba was just a hair too slow to see Tamari's plan before the two blades smashed down into his back, drawing a small cry of pain that the twin blades hammered him into the arena floor, forcing the air out of his lungs. With a small smirk, Tamari turned her momentum downwards into a flying leg drop aimed at the boy's head. Right as she was about to land the blow, she was caught in the side by a spinning tunnel of wind and claws that forced her a small distance from her fan and the boy below her. Damari was thrown roughly to the arena floor, rolling slightly as she hit, turning the momentum into enough of a push so that she was able to fall into a sitting position, her teal eyes glaring over to focus on what had impacted her. Her eyes focused on where the small tornado blew out and deposited a small white pup that let out a small bark of challenge before racing over to where Kiba was pushing himself up from the ground, giving the pup a small smile as he did so. "Thanks pal, didn't see that one coming," said the Inyazuka boy, rising up with a groan to look over at where Tamari was rising to her feet, her eyes glancing between the two and the spot a few yards behind the pair where her fan still sat stabbed into the ground. Kiba took one look over at the fan before dropping down once again and flinging himself forwards with Akamaru right behind him. As the pair flew across the arena, the blonde girl across from them dropped the concerned look on her face and began to fly through hand signs in quick succession. From the contestant box, both Naruto and Hinata froze as they saw the combination of signs that the Suna girl was weaving. At almost the same moment, the two leaned forward over the railing to shout warnings to their teammate. "Kiba, don't let her finish those signs, finish her now," shouted the two teens in unison, drawing a few odd looks from the rest of the contestants. Kiba, however, was either unable to hear his teammates or was already doing everything he could to reach the blonde before she finished whatever she was planning. The twin blurs of white and gray streaked across the field, wind slowly gathering around that pair as they closed on their target. When they were about 15 feet from their target, the pair leapt forwards, twisting themselves as they did. With a loud cry, the two were surrounded in twin cyclones of wind and claw that twisted and writhed like some kind of great serpents as they struck towards the blonde, even as she landed on her final sign and with a fierce smile, wiped one hand over her cut cheek before slamming it down onto the ground before her. Which erupted moments later in a large cloud of smoke that the two cyclones crashed into a second later. With a thundering crash, the cloud exploded out with a sound of a great drill meeting a mountain. Bits of rock and dust shot in every direction from the point of impact as the scene became momentarily hidden from everyone's view. Before anyone could do more than stare, a sound of metal and stone rent the air, followed by a feral growl and the sound of commotion, before a figure in a gray jacket leapt back out of the dispersing cloud, clutching an right arm. Kiba looked as though he had just angled with a lawnmower, his jacket and body riddled with numerous small cuts, none clearly deep, but the sheer volume made up for that as the Inyazuka let out a heavy hacking and spit a glob of blood from his mouth as he glared back at the dust cloud that was just beginning to settle. As the dust fell, it revealed three figures standing in what looked like ground zero of an excavation site. The ground around the three had great cracks in it, as though some monstrous creature has torn and stamped the ground. Standing in the center of this was Tamari, looking a little winded but otherwise sporting a large smirk as she looked across at her opponent. The second figure was the prone form of Akamaru, who lay on his side, sporting a few cuts of his own, but seemingly fine otherwise. However, it was the figure that stood over the pup that drew Kiba's eyes the most, particularly because it had a cycle hanging down over Akamaru, apparently keeping the pup from struggling. The figure seemed to be hugging the sickle in question that was almost the entire length of its own body, which was long and lean, covered in a close-cut white fur. It wore what appeared to be a small jacket, black like its blade, with small red outlines. Its most distinguishing feature was the bandana and eye patch it wore over its face, which at this moment had its one clear eye turned up towards the girl who had just summoned it. "That was a little close there, Tamari, a second longer and he would have had you, next time don't wait to bring me into the fight," spoke the creature, obviously a weasel of some kind, as it looked up at its summoner, its tone one of lecturing. Tamari gave the weasel a small glace before shrugging one shoulder at its comment before looking back at her opponent. "You Kamatari, whatever, but I was hoping to hold off on bringing you out till I had to, still I guess this guy is better than I gave him credit for," finished the girl, looking over at where Kiba was looking between the two, his eyes taking in the situation before him. Kamatari gave a small huff of annoyance before looking over towards Kiba and then back down at Akamaru with a small nod. "Hi, these two are better than they may seem," he replied, wincing slightly at the small cut he had received when he had moved to cut the two's oncoming tunnels of wind and fang. Tamari gave a moment to notice Kamatari's injury before calling out to Kiba, her voice one of authority instead of mocking. "Hey dog boy, I think it's about time you give up, unless you want my partner here to give your pup a visit to the vet," called the girl as Kiba stiffened, his eyes darting between Akamaru and Tamari as his pupils receded into vertical slits and a small growl built in his chest. For a second Tamari thought she had managed to drive the boy feral, but suddenly she felt a cold shiver as her head spun down to look at where the pup was lying. Just as her eyes turned, both the pup and Kamatari were engulfed in a cloud of smoke, and a moment later she was forced to jump up to catch Kamatari, who had flown back out to the cloud, several long cuts dug into the handles of his sickle, where he had drawn it up at the last moment to guard the surprise attack that came from below him. Tamari turned in time to see Kiba standing where the pup had lain just moments before, his face drawn into a smile as he rushed the pair. Just as he was about to close the distance, Kamatari gave a flick of his tail, and a second sickle seemed to form itself out of the air and hurtle down towards the boy, causing him to alter his course away from the two. As Tamari landed, Kamatari hopped softly to the ground, letting his blade land point down beside him as he let out a grunt of pain before turning his one eye to fix on Tamari once again. "Don't say you told B so, Kamatari, I'm not in the mood for it. You okay?" She finished looking down at the weasel summon that seemed to flex its back slightly before responding. "I'm fine for now, but I won't be if he hits me head on. He can cancel my wind armor, and without it, it's just a matter of physical strength." Finished the weasel, hefting its sickle up from the ground beside Tamari. Meanwhile, the transformed Akamaru had rushed up to stand beside Kiba, letting out a small series of growls and barks at the boy as he reached him. "Yeah boy, I missed, sorry about that, still looks like that new summons of hers isn't going to make this any easier, damn it, I hate fighting summons," he said as Akamaru gave off a small bark that caused Kiba to snort despite himself. "Hi, except Roku, last thing we need is that rabbit after us too," chuckled Kiba looking over at where his opponents stood. "Well, let's go, bud, better not give them time to figure out their next move," called boy, speeding off towards Tamari with the pup falling into step beside him, the twin gray-clad figures racing over the arena floor. With another flick of Kamatari's tail, a sickle fell down into Tamari's outstretched hand as she and her partner raced forwards to reach the charging Inyazukas before they could set up another combo attack. The two pairs raced towards each other before with a crash the two parties meet. Tamari seemed to be slightly faster than the pair and had some experience with the sickle she was wielding as she swung it forward in a smooth practiced motion that was aimed at the first boy's head. As the sickle cut forwards through the air, the first boy threw himself into a crouch, allowing the blade to whistle over his head and back. Just as the blade passed over the boy's back, the second Kiba's arm slammed down onto his mirror's back as the twin brought his feet forwards into a forward kick aimed at Tamari's chest. Tamari twisted as the blow connected, allowing most of the force to glance off of her, but leaving her chest feeling like she had just been slugged by a sandbag. Before the boy could draw his legs back, and Kamatari's sickle shot up, grabbing the appendage like a hook and pulling down sharply. Thanks to the wind chakra Kiba was putting out, the cutting power of the blade was minimized to what the small weasel could produce. But even still, the Inyazuka had to bite back a cry of pain as the blade managed to drag into his lead and pull him forwards off of Akamaru's back. With a grunt, Kiba fell to the arena floor and Kamatari raised his sickle up to sweep down towards the stunned boy's chest. As the blade fell, however, he was forced to once again bring his weapon up to block a pair of clawed hands that shot forwards to slam two palms into the hilt of the weapon. 10 claw fingers reached around the weapon as Akamaru, in Kiba's form, let out a growl and pushed the weasel back a few feet. Just as Akamaru seemed about to overpower the smaller creature, Tamari appeared, swinging her blade forwards with a cry and releasing a gust of wind, smaller than what she could have managed with her fan, but still about the size of a doorway. The wall of wind caught Akamaru full in the face, just as he had managed to force Kamatari to the ground, flinging the pup bodily back, almost falling over Kiba as he did. Kiba in the meantime had managed to push himself up from the ground enough to roll away from the blast of wind that caught Akamaru. As the pup sailed past him, slammed both his hands down into his pack and brought out two sets of shrunken clutched between his fists and flinging the weapons forwards towards the Suna pair, causing them to fall back to deflect or dodge the projectiles. Before all of the spinning stars had reached their target, Kiba had already forced himself forwards into another spinning cyclone of wind and claws following up on the tail end of the weapons. Without a moment of hesitation, both Tamari and Kamatari darted left and right respectively so that the boy would pass right between the pair. Just as the cyclone roared by, the two swung their sickles together into either side of the tunnel, causing it to break apart as their own wind blades bit into the spinning cylinder, causing the wind to disperse and leaving Kiba unprotected as the two blades cut across his flanks, drawing crimson lines along his arms as he brought them up to shield his sides. With a sharp cry of pain, Kiba fell forwards onto ground, rolling several feet and coming up, his arms still held defensively before him. Without warning, Tamari and Kamatari were again forced to spread out as a second tornado of wind crashed in between the two, scattering sharp bits of stone all around, a few clipping the two and one particular rock managing to cut one of Tamari's pigtails as he twisted to avoid the projectiles, causing a clump of hair to fall lightly over her neck and sticking there thanks to the sweat pouring from the blonde. Akamaru used the two's momentary absence to rush over to Kiba's side, letting out a worried little whine as he saw the condition his partner was in. Kiba bit down, forcing the pain away from his thoughts as he looked up into his own worried face, forcing a smile as he did so. "It's okay buddy, it's just a scratch, I guess I shouldn't have charged in like that, huh?" he said as he gave the pup a small smile. Kiba was about to continue to reassure the pup but paused as he noticed something that made him shiver slightly despite himself. From over where he and Akamaru had been he could clearly see Tamari and her summon standing beside a familiar black object that was still stuck into the arena floor. But the small grown Kiba watched Tamari let the sickle she was holding float effortlessly out of her hand where it was joined by several more, apparently under the summon's control, as she wrenched her battle fan out of the ground and swung it wide open with a small grin of satisfaction as the fan snapped open with an audible click. "Well crap," muttered Kiba as Tamari and her summon in tow made their way steadily forwards until the two stood within earshot of the downed boy. As they closed, Tamari's voice rang out towards the pair once again. "I have to say, dog boy, you gave me a better fight than I thought you would, but it's over. I'd rather not waste the chakra to cut you in the pup to ribbons, so how about you do the smart thing and give up here and now?" She called even as Kamatari gently leapt up to land stretched out on the open fan, his sickle held close to him, while the others simple whirled apparently effortlessly around the girl. Kiba gave a look around at the blades and then back to Tamari and Kamatari, his face forced into a blank expression that didn't show the pain he was still in. "Really? I thought we were just getting started," fired back Kiba, putting as much bravado as he could into the words as he forced himself to his feet, never taking his eyes off of Tamari as he did so. "And here I was starting to think that you weren't as stupid as you looked," fired back Tamari in a slightly mocking tone as her eyes narrowed and her mind raced. "What the heck, he is on his last leg, or is he? Well, either way this isn't the time to start underestimating him, but damn, I need to have something left for the invasion or I'll be a sitting duck. If this goes on much longer, I'll be helpless." Though the girl as she steadied her grip on her large fan. "Nice try, but smack talk isn't going to work on me. Heck, my cousin and Nisan had to pound that one into me and they are twice as strong as you," fired back Kiba as he flexed his arm slightly, trying to buy some time to get the feeling back in his limbs. Tamari in the meantime found herself slightly annoyed at the boy's last comment. True, it hadn't been degrading, but Tamari was a naturally strong-willed woman and being compared unfavorably to any other female always seemed to rub her the wrong way. It also didn't help that this was the second time that he had told her that she didn't measure up to his cousin for Kami's sake, and being outdone by an old woman was not something she was going to take lying down. "There you go again with that cousin crap. What are you, some kind of mama's boy? Is there anything that I won't have to hear you say she is better than me in?" Shot back Tamari, a tick mark appearing on her forehead as she spoke and the wood of her fan creaking slightly as she gripped it tighter. Unknowingly Kiba was managing to throw Tamari off of her game, but despite this he was completely oblivious to what was occurring and so just responded without thinking of how the next words would sound, even if they were the truth. "Well, you're a lot cuter than her and Nisan," replied Kiba, not even realizing what he had said until the words left his mouth. Everything seemed to freeze as he finished speaking as Tamari and he seemed to take a moment to digest what he had just said. From over in the competitor's box, Hinata and Naruto were staring open-mouthed at the two fighters, their brains trying and failing to understand what had possessed their teammate to say such a thing in the middle of a fight. Most of the other competitors had the same expression on their faces, while a few others had small blushes and were busy stifling giggles at the situation. Meanwhile, up in the stands, several groups were also in the process of reacting to the events below. Over where several of the senseis were seated, including their students, there was a round of giggles coming from Yakumo and Ino as they looked down at the scene, flashing each other small knowing looks as they watched the two teens below stare at one another. The majority of the senseis were simply looking down at the field while shaking their heads. I had taken to shouting something about the flames of youth, but no one was paying attention to him. Shikamaru in the meantime was shaking his head, slowly letting a small smile cross his face as he looked down, muttering something that sounded like troublesome under his breath as he did. Over with the Hyugas and Namika's Mito was letting out happy giggles as she looked down at the fight while still cheering on Kiba without truly understanding what was occurring. Hitomi in the meantime was flashing Kushina a small grin as the Redeed buried her head in her hands, trying to stifle her giggles. "So Kushina, tell me, did you teach him that one, or was that something he picked up from his teammates?" mocked Hitomi, drawing a fresh series of choked giggles from Kushina as she gave Hitomi a small friendly glare before forcing her head back down to not laugh in her friend's face. Hanabi in the meantime was also unaware of the context below and so took the moment to reach over and poke Mito lightly in the arm and gesture down below where the two were seated as if asking something. Mito seemed to pause in thought for a second before nodding her head excitedly as the two 6-year-olds dove down under their seating, pushing a few square and round objects aside until they found what they were looking for and emerged holding either side of a large white sign that they had brought with them to the finals. As the sign swung up, it showed a hand-drawn scroll that spelled out "Go Kiba Go Akamaru for Team Kawaii," with small children's drawings of the pair along the outside of the sign. The day previously, with the help of Tsunade, the two children had constructed this and several other signs to help cheer for the people they knew in the finals. Tsunade had taken a liking to the idea and insisted on adding the team kawaii to it while roaring with laughter. The sign itself wouldn't have been too bad if the two hadn't taken this time to call out the words in a loud voice into the relative silence of the arena. "Go Kiba. Go Akamaru. For Team Kawaii," shouted the two in unison, drawing an explosion of giggles from those around them and even driving Kushina to fall out of her seat while trying and failing to hold in her now roaring laughter. Moments before the two children's proclamation, Tsume and Hana were looking down at the pair with matching grins plastered across their faces as they focused on their fellow Inuzuka. Tsume let out a small bark of laughter before looking over at Hana with a grin. "Oh, this fight just got a lot more interesting, wouldn't you say?" She chuckles as Hana gave a nod, smiling as well as she looked down towards her sibling. "If nothing else, Kasen, I think we have enough to blackmail him with for the rest of his life," chuckled Hana. Before the two could say more, Mito and Hanabi's cries reached their ears and the two found themselves laughing so hard they almost weren't able to catch the most important reaction of all. Down below, Tamari was frozen stiff. Kiba's words were bouncing around in her head for a moment as her mind fought to try and respond to the verbal declaration and not just shut down. Tamari had been prepared for a lot of things in this match and the coming events, but to be called out like this in front of a stadium of people was not on that list. She wasn't able to keep a small twinge of red from crossing her cheeks as she let the words play out in her mind again before she shook herself slightly and focused back on Kiba, who seemed to have pulled himself back together before her. Damn it, Tamari, it was a stalling tactic. He was just trying to give himself time to recover and you gave it to him. What the heck is wrong with you going all gaga over a compliment like that? You're a Kunoichi for Kami's sake. Tamari, though, giving herself both a mental and physical shake to clear her mind, directing her attention back to Kiba. "Damn you, what the heck are you playing at? I'm a proud Kunoichi of Suna, some pretty words aren't going to throw me off my game," Tamari said, falling back into a ready position even as her thoughts gave her a mocking jab. "Yeah, but they did throw you." Kiba seemed generally confused at the blonde's comment as he steadied himself, playing the words back in his mind and not truly comprehending what exactly he had said that Tamari was referring to. "Huh? What the heck are you talking about?" asked Kiba in a tone of complete confusion that seemed to make Tamari only angrier at him. Her eyes narrowed dangerously as she looked over at him. "Trying to distract me by calling me pretty. I'm a Kunoichi and won't go to pieces like some common village girl, so drop the act," she fired back. Kiba paused for a second, mulling her words over in his mind before he either did the most brilliant thing of his life or more likely the dumbest. What the heck does being a Kunoichi have to do with being pretty? Heck, you're one of the strongest fighters I've ever seen. The fact you're a pretty girl doesn't have anything to do with that. Heck, it may even make you more impressive," he said, the words hitting Tamari like a physical blow. Her eyes went slightly wide as her mind spun to absorb what she had just been told, but Kiba not seeming to realize the effect he was having pressed on. "Beside, that's not important now, so let's get on with this fight, cause I'm not backing down from a fight this good," he finished as he leapt back from the still motionless girl, with Akamaru in tow, pulling out a sealing scroll from his pack as he did. As he landed, he immediately spread the scroll out on the ground before him and slammed a hand down onto the scroll, causing a cloud of smoke to erupt from it. The sudden burst of smoke seemed to call Tamari back to the real world, and as her eyes found Kiba's location, she let out a small angry growl as she wiped her fan forwards, sending a blade of wind, followed by a sickle from her summons that doubled the blade's deadly cutting power. "Damn it, he got me again," she screamed inside her head as the blade and wind shot towards the source of her anger. Moments later, the sickle and wind crashed together into where Kiba and Akamaru, still in his human form, had disappeared behind a cloud of smoke. There was screeching sound of metal scraping on metal for a few moments before two pieces of the sickle exited the cloud, flying off to bury themselves into the arena floor a few feet away from one another. As the smoke cleared and showed the twin forms of Kiba both down on one knee with one arm each outstretched to the two here side by side, all five of their claws facing where the attack had come from. Only the claws weren't the simple ones of nail and flesh they had been before. Tamari's eyes flew to the twin boys' outstretched arms that were now covered in a kind of black and gray gauntlets that sported five sharpened gray claws that were pointed forwards towards her with small bright blue blades of chakra stretching out of each digit. From behind the twin steel claws, the grinning faces of the two boys flashed. Up in the cage booth, Mei quirked an eyebrow as she looked down at the fight, letting out a small hum as if trying to remember something. Her hum drew both Zabuza's and Minato's attention towards her, causing her to notice her own actions and turn to face the two. "Sorry, Hokage-sama, I was just trying to think where I had seen those gauntlets before. They seem familiar to me, but I can't quite place from where." Mei finished, inclining her head slightly in a polite gesture of respect. Minato simply bowed his head in turn, but before he could look back to the match, Zabuza let out a small chuckle, drawing the two cages' attention. "Do you have something to add, Zabuza?" asked May, her tone dropping down a few octaves as her face changed into a dangerous little smile, showing her annoyance with the man's actions. She had made it clear that while in Konoha they were to act respectful as possible in an attempt to secure an alliance that they currently were in need in after their last war. Zabuza seemed to simply shrug off the Mizukage's glare before speaking. It's those gauntlets, they belong to the demon brothers, those two who used to work for me, but looks like they had some modifications since then. Replied Zabuza lazily, as May looked from him to the arena and then back again. Wait, those two that robbed the armory during your attempt on the third Mizukage? Asked May, searching her memory for something on the two. Zabuza nodded at her words before responding. Hi, that was them, not the best fighters, but they did make it off with enough stuff to make those gauntlets of theirs, darn things cost a fortune. Chuckled Zabuza, turning back to watch the match. Both May and Minato looked slightly confused at the man's words before Minato spoke up. Zabuza-san, why would those gauntlets cost a fortune? They don't look like anything special from here. Asked Minato, May inclining her head in agreement with the blonde question as Zabuza allowed his face to form a small smirk. Cause the morons insisted on making the damn things completely out of chakra metal. Zabuza said, causing all three of the cages to look back down to the arena floor. Chakra metal wasn't the rarest material, but refining it was expensive. If what Zabuza had said was true, then those gauntlets probably cost as much as a couple of A-class missions alone. As the cage's eyes turned back below, Kiba and his twin were pushing themselves to their feet while smiling over at Temari as their new gauntlets pulsed faintly as the wind around them drew in and began to slowly spin around them, giving a look as though the boys' arms were encased in small slow-moving tornadoes. Temari, spying the boys' new weapons, had cocked back her fan with Kumari still perched upon it, ready to meet whatever the Inuzuka brought forth next. Kiba seemed ready to oblige her as he and Akamaru both bent slightly before springing forward into twin tornadoes spiraling towards her. For a moment she didn't notice the difference, but a sinister hissing sound alerted her to the extra spiral of blue-tinged wind that seemed to expand out from the funnel a small distance as the two tornadoes closed in on her. Temari cocked back her fan before pouring forth her chakra into the fan, and the fibers of chakra metal stitched into the threads that helped to amplify her wind element. From the fan came a tearing wall of winds that shaped itself into blades as it flew forward to meet the oncoming funnels. As the two waves crashed into each other, there was a shrieking sound that caused many people to clap their hands over their ears in an attempt to shield their ears from the sound. The sound continued to build as the two forces crashed into each other until something seemed to give and there was a sudden explosion of wind, impacting Temari enough to where she was forced back a few feet, digging small furrows in the ground as she was pushed back. Kiba and Akamaru in the meantime were sent back through the air, both landing on all fours, looking slightly windblown and sporting a few cuts, but otherwise unfazed. Before they could fully position themselves to launch again, they were assaulted by a hail of sickles, causing them to strike out, extending their blades of wind from their claws and biting forwards into the weapons, causing them to fall to pieces as the blades of wind cut through them effortlessly. However, this was all the opening that Temari apparently needed to launch a second blast forwards towards the pair, scaring the earth as it roared forwards. Without pausing, Kiba pulled himself in front of Akamaru, thrusting his gauntleted hand forwards and setting his feet squarely, and he closed his hand into a fist, forcing his chakra to take the wind around her gauntlet, creating a building tornado around the boy's arm as he cocked back his fist as the wave of wind closed in on him. Beat this! Yelled Kiba, thrusting his fist forwards along with all of the wind and chakra he had managed to lace together. The effect was something like a solid drill of wind that met the oncoming wall, managing to tear a small hole in the wave as it passed by, scaring the ground as it passed. Kiba let out a triumphant little cry as the wall of wind passed by him, but had to bite back a curse as the pain of firing off an attack like that took its toll on his arm and he was forced to drop to one knee due to the pain of it. Temari wasn't doing too well herself. True, she hadn't taken as much damage as Kiba had during the fight, but she had been blasting wave after wave of attacks on top of using a summon, and even her reserves had their limit. Damn it, at this rate I'll drop before the invasion, but if he is still standing I'll have my hands tied with fighting him anyway. Better to take him out here and now, then he'll be out of the fight and safe. Wait, what? The blonde girl thought, catching herself at the end at the oddity of her own thoughts. However, before she could think more on it, a movement from over by Kiba caught her attention. Kiba had reached over to his gauntleted arms and grabbed hold of what looked like a small ring right below the gauntlet's wrist, pulling on it. As the boy pulled, a length of chain that appeared to have been made of overlapping kunai came out of the bottom of gauntlet. Temari only had a moment to notice this until Kiba swung his arm forwards and the black chain lashed forwards, a light blue twinge to the metal, alerting Temari that this chain too was channeling the boy's wind chakra. The blonde made a small hop like she was jumping rope, allowing the chain to fly under her, but as she descended, she noticed that she had never been the target of the attack from the beginning. As the chain swung wide, it raced by where Akamaru was, his own gauntlet extended with what looked like a small hook at the base of wrist of his gauntlet. As the chain swung by, Akamaru slammed his own arm down, and with a crack the chain fashioned itself onto the other before drawing itself back under the wrist and locking the two together by a length of black serrated chain. The next moment, to Tamari's alarm, Akamaru had sprang forwards along with Kiba, the chain drawn taut between them, glowing menacingly as they came. Tamari only had time to snap her fan shut and channel as much wind chakra into the tool in a hope to reinforce it against the oncoming cloth's line. There was a crash of impact as the chain caught the fan between the two, and Tamari was forcing herself to fight to keep her feet steady as the two chain dug slightly into the fan as the two boys passed by her, gaining a position behind her. "Damn it, Kamatari, go!" shouted Tamari, having to focus entirely on keeping the flow of chakra up in her fan or risk letting it slice the fan apart. Without waiting a moment, Kamatari leapt up from the ground where he had landed when Tamari snapped the fan shut to hurl himself forwards, racing along the chain's length down towards where the Kiba that was Akamaru was running. Akamaru noticed the summons advance just in time to swipe his arm viciously, sending a wave down the chain that caught Kamatari under the body, biting metal into his underside and forcing the weasel into the air. As Kamatari gained height, he swung himself in an arc, letting his sickle fly forwards towards the pup. The flying blade struck the gauntlet just where the chain was attached to the metal underside, and with a squealing snap the chain came loose and Akamaru fell back on the ground just as Kamatari came down on top of the pup in a dive, his chakra swirling around him as he impacted the pup, causing a whine of pain to issue out from the pup's mouth as he was forced to revert back to his normal form. From on top of the pup, Kamatari let out a tired sigh as he tried to lift himself from the pup's form but found his body wasn't responding to him. "Darn, sorry Tamari, but I'm out. Nice fight, pup," chuckled the weasel as it puffed away in a small cloud of smoke as Akamaru let out a small bark of farewell before succumbing to unconsciousness himself. Meanwhile, back with the two teens, as soon as the chain had come loose, Tamari was able to bring her fan up to bear once more, sending a gust down towards Kiba, who was stumbling slightly from the sudden freedom from his tether. The blast caught the boy, flinging him a small distance to face plant into the arena floor. Tamari was forced to slam her fan down into the ground in front of her as her knees buckled from the exhaustion that was slowly flooding over her. It was with a great effort that she managed to remain on her feet at all, but she managed it somehow and watched to see if the boy across from her would rise again. "If he gets up again, I think I'm through. So much for me being part of the plan. I'll be lucky if I can walk after this one. Just hope that Kankuro can handle it without me," thought the blonde before she stiffened as the gray-clad figure before her shifted slightly. To her utter horror, Kiba forced himself up to all fours, turning to face her, his face covered in dirt and some blood, but set in a fierce look of determination. The Inyazuka pushed himself to his feet, shakily looking over at his opponent through half-lidded eyes. "Oh, what, where, darn, the pretty girl's still up. Wait, Akamaru. Why do I feel so tired? Wait, no, I'm in the match. You're the match. Got to. Ugh." Kiba pushed himself forwards towards Tamari, even as his mind danced dazedly around, trying and failing to focus on what he was doing. Tamari let out a curse as she saw Kiba approaching, forcing her legs to stay straight and hefting her fan up to swing forwards again. As Kiba reached her, she swung the fan like a great club forwards, out of chakra to push through it and just hoping the improvised club would be enough to halt the advancing boy before she succumbed to her exhaustion. The fan came around in wide swing and missed Kiba by inches. This was due to the fact that the boy had finally been unable to power through his wounds any longer and had dropped unconscious. His momentum carried him slightly forwards, however, and as a result, he bore Tamari to the ground with him, finding himself with his face resting on the girl's stomach. When the two landed, Tamari braced herself, thinking that the coming blow was about to fall, but nothing came. After a few seconds, Tamari shifted enough to look down and she saw the resting face of Kiba on her stomach, his face turned up in a small smile of apparent comfort as he let out a small humming sound like the kind a dog makes when he is content. For a second, Tamari just stared at the sight before a shadow fell across her, causing her to look up into the eyes of the Jonin referee, who was giving her a small smile as he looked her over. "Well, Tamari, it appears that you have won the match, but if you want to stay down there with your boyfriend, I'll understand," spoke the Jonin in a kind but still mocking tone that caused Tamari to blush and scowl in turn as she pushed Kiba off of her and shakily made her way to her feet as the ref turned to call out her victory. And a squad of medical ninja rushed out into the arena to collect Kiba and Akamaru. Tamari accepted their help as well, and soon the arena floor was clear of combatants. Up in the stands, the spectators were busy discussing the last match and commenting on how they thought the next contest would progress. "AWWWWW knew Kiba and Akamaru lost," called Mito in a wailing cry of mingled annoyance and sadness at the result. Soon the little Ritiid found a hand gently rubbing her head as she looked up to see her cousin smiling down at her. "Hey now, Mito-chan, none of that, they fought a great match, so don't be sad, okay?" Kushina said in a comforting tone that caused Mito to pause for a second before giving the larger Ritiid a small nod. "Hi cousin, but I really wanted him to win," replied Mito, looking down at the sign she and Hanabi had made, a small sad look in her eyes as she focused on it. Kushina noticed this but was momentarily lost as to what to say to cheer her daughter up. However, she needn't have worried because Hanabi, it seemed, had the answer to the situation in hand. Or more specifically, the boy had a bright red marker in his hand that he bent down to the sign with and scribbled a quick addition to the sign before leaning back and looking over at Mito, who was busy reading the addition. The sign now read, "Go Kiba. Go Akamaru. Go Team Kawaii. Great match, get better soon." Hanabi having added the final sentence below where the first had been written. As Mito finished reading it, her face became a bright smile as she turned to give Hanabi a tight hug that the boy seemed to only put up a token defense to. Both Kushina and Hitomi allowed a small giggle to escape their lips at the sight of their youngest before turning to discuss the match in detail. Over with the Jonin senseis, the majority were discussing the impressive match. "Well, now that pup of Tsume's sure has some nice wind channeling, heck, if I have time I may stop by and see if I can help him out with it, would be nice to see a few more wind users in Konoha," Asuma said, idly toying with one of his trench knives as he looked over at Kurenai, who gave him a small smirk. "That's nice of you, Asuma, but don't you think you should focus on your team before you go offering your help around to others?" commented the black-haired woman, causing Asuma to drop one of his knives as he let out an embarrassed little chuckle. I guess you're right about that," replied the man, bending down to grab his dropped knife. As he reached the blade, he noticed his figure brushing against something else on the floor of the seat he was in. Curiosity won out, and as Asuma rose back up, he had both his blade and what looked like a small black marble in his hand. Putting away his knife, he turned his attention to the small ball in his hand, rolling it back and forth, trying to figure out exactly what he was looking at. His actions caught Kakashi's and Kurenai's attention. "Hey Asuma, what are you playing with over there?" asked Kakashi, peering over at the ball in Asuma's hand. Kurenai for her part glanced at the small ball and tried to think of why the small ball looked so familiar to her. Oh, I don't know, Kakashi, it was just under my chair. Weird little thing, isn't it? Probably just a toy or something that a kid lost," chuckled Asuma after looking the small ball over and deciding it wasn't a threat. Kakashi shrugged slightly at this and turned back to his orange book without further comment. The students sitting down near their senseis were also busy discussing the recent match. "Wow, glad I didn't have to fight her in the finals, too troublesome," muttered Shikamaru as he leaned back in his seat looking up at the clouds overhead. Choji was thinking along the same lines of his friend as the medics carried stretchers bearing Kiba and Akamaru out of the arena. "That's just like you, Shikamaru, I swear you are so lazy, it's a wonder you didn't surrender before you even fought in the match," fired off Ino, causing Shikamaru to wave a hand in a placating manner. "Probably would have worked out better for me, I didn't have the information to come up with a real plan, and that arena was brightly lit, I was at a clear disadvantage and should have known when to fall back, no point in fighting a battle you can't win," Shikamaru replied lazily, causing Ino to glare over at him. Their antics drew a small chuckle from Yakumo as she turned back towards the arena. But the Inyazuka clan, Tsume and Hana, were oddly enough smiling, apparently satisfied at Kiba's performance in the match. "So cousin, what do you think? He did pretty well for himself down there?" Hana half asked, half stated, looking over at Tsume, who nodded in reply. He fought well, and it seems he managed to wise up and come up with a few good combinations with Akamaru. Give him a few years and he will be a jonin in no time. You better get working on it yourself or he'll pass you up," Tsume replied, flashing small fanged grin over at Hana. "I guess, heck, kind of makes me wish I was a wind user, but I guess fire fits well enough with me," said Hana in reply before turning to smirk over at her cousin. "But you know cousin, it wasn't the fighting I was talking about," Hana chuckled as Tsume let her smile spread from ear to ear, letting out a small bark of laugh at the girl's words. Ha Hana, he did, and a strong one at that. I guess we'll have to meet the little Suna pup at some point," chuckled Tsume as Hana joined in the laughing, in turn adding her voice to the mix. Up in the cage booth, Minato had turned to congratulate the Kazuki-age on his daughter's victory. "Well, Kazuki-age, I must say your daughter is a fine kunoichi, but I'm a bit skeptical about her ability to continue in the tournament after that last fight. The Inyazuka boy was able to force her to spend most of her chakra in the fight," commented Minato, looking over at his guest, whose face was still in shadow thanks to his cage hat and mask. A still figure of the Kazuki-age sat silently for a moment before nodding his head agreement. It would appear so, still a victory is a victory no matter the cost, wouldn't you agree, Mizuki?" came a dry voice from under the yellow hat of the Kazuki-age. Mei took a moment to consider the words, allowing her mind to wander briefly back to the civil war she had fought in just a few months ago. After a moment she nodded her head towards the man seated beside her. I must say I agree with the Kazukiage, in our line of work, worrying about a victory in the future is foolish if you aren't alive to reach it. Spoke the Redeed turning back to face the arena again. Minato thought of the words of the other two cages turning his eyes back down to the arena. Not alive to reach it. He thought for a moment before he gave himself a mental shake and focused back on the matches. In the contestant box Naruto and Hinata were both sharing slightly sad looks with one another. Man, I thought he had it, darn, I wanted to see Team 11 take the whole exam. Naruto said, giving a defeated little shrug at the match's conclusion. Still Kiba and Akamaru did amazing, didn't he? The blonde said, turning to face Hinata, who was giving an assuring nod. Hi, he and Akamaru did their best, and so will we. Responded Hinata, with a small smile, getting on and turned from Naruto. However, before Naruto could respond, a cough of apparent disapproval sounded from behind the two, causing them to turn slowly to face the origin of the sound. The two teens turned to see Neji leaning against an opposite wall, staring at them with a seemingly pitying look. Seeing this, Naruto decided to not leave the interruption alone. Sorry, did I say something you wanted to add to? Asked the blonde, a small edge to his tone as he stared over at the pale-eyed boy. Neji allowed his face to turn up into a cocky smirk before pushing himself from the wall. Hi, you did, that part about your team taking these exams, heck, the only one of you that stood a chance of even making it to the next round, now all you have is 2 clan dropouts. Finished Neji, causing both Naruto's and Hinata's eyes to narrow dangerously. Neji seemed to either not notice that or simply not concern himself with it as he continued to speak. So if you two are finished making jokes, I think it is time for my cousin and I to have our match. Finished Neji as he marched past the pair and over towards the steps that he would soon descend to enter into the arena. Most of the booth's occupants' eyes followed Neji before glancing back to the pair still standing there, glaring after him. The next person to speak was Sasuke, letting out a small snort before speaking. The Hyuga may be full of himself, but I have to agree with him on this one, you two are dreaming if you think you're winning this tournament. Right, Naruto? Spoke the dark-haired boy, glancing over at his teammate who stood beside him. Naruto looked between her teammate and the two members of Team 11, as if not sure at what to say. One part of her was telling her to agree with Sasuke's words and to tell Naruto to recognize when he was making himself a target. But another side, the one that had been speaking up more and more over the past few weeks, was telling her to smack her teammate around and then Neji for good measure. But the conflict resulted in her simply turning from the conflict and walking over to where Minami was looking at her concerned and turned to look out at the arena floor, letting her mind wander as she did. I swear you are becoming more and more whipped as time goes on. I told you, you need to keep your eyes open now, whatever those black things were, I have a bad feeling about them. Spoke up Kyuubi as Naruto was still debating with herself. His words seemed to snap her out of stupor slightly as she turned inwardly to respond. Sorry Furball, I've just been out of it for a while. Between Naruto and Minami, I'm starting to wonder what's happening around me. I mean, everything seems to be changing and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Naruto responded, casting a sad little look over to where Minami had turned to look over at where Naruto and Hinata were standing. Kyuubi let out an angry little grunt as this response before continuing. Who cares about your family affairs? I told you something big is going on, and if I'm right then you need to focus, cause I'm not going to die just because you are having family issues. Fired of Kurama, getting Naruto to twitch slightly, a small bit of anger leaking into her thoughts as she responded. Oh, here we go again, Furball, this is where you get all cryptic and start saying you'll tell me what you're talking about later. Well, enough of this crap, you want me to listen to you, then you need to cough up some more than saying you'll tell me later. Fired back Minami, the annoyance and anger obvious in her tone. There was a moment's pause as Kyuubi let out an annoyed sigh before replying. Fine brat, I guess it's better you know now in case I'm right about this. Look, those black things, whatever they are, seem like something that may have come from an old enemy of my Tausen, the sage of the six paths. I assume you remember who that is, right? Half lectured, half questioned Kyuubi. I remember Kasen telling me about him, he defeated a great monster, then split it apart, creating all of the tailed beasts, right? Replied Naruto, Kyuubi giving a small nod before continuing. That one, well, my Tausen described that creature's abilities to us once, before he died, and those black things seem to have something in common with it, and besides that something odd is up with Kayu's cage, remember? Continued Kyuubi, getting a small nod from Naruto as she thought back to the odd appearance of Kayu's cage, the last time the sisters had linked their minds during their meditation training the month previously. It had looked like someone had planted a field around the cage, lifting it out of the water, and there were spiraling vines growing all over the cage decorated with small purple flowers. Well then, keep your mind focused, if that enemy is somehow involved with what is going on, then you and I are in more danger that you could possibly imagine, so focus on that for now, and if we live long enough you can go back to worrying about your family issues. Finished the Kyuubi, closing its eyes and moving to sever the link between the two. However, before he could, Naruto shot off a final question. "Hey Furball, what was this old enemy the sage fraud anyway?" asked Naruto, getting a small grunt from Kyuubi. "It was the Juubi. My cousin." Bit out the Kyuubi before severing the link. Naruto was shocked at the fox's words as she thought about what she had just heard. However, soon her attention was drawn forwards as the Jonin referee called out in a loud voice announcing the next match. "Hyuga Niji of Konoha and Hyuga Hinata of Konoha, please enter the arena at this time." Called out the Jonin as a smattering of cheering answered his words. Niji, already by the steps, immediately strode forwards into the arena, while Hinata gave Naruto a quick hug before turning to head out to her match. As the two teens made their way into position, their family was currently undergoing a small event of their own. Above in the stands, Hiashi had taken the appearance of this match to attempt to draw Hisachi's attention back to himself and towards his own ideals instead of the childish antics he had been taking part in during the previous match. "Hanabi, I need you pay attention to this next match very carefully. Someday you'll have to face off against Niji, and he is possibly one of the greatest talents that the Hyuga clan has ever known," he said, looking over past his wife to where Hanabi was sitting, looking from the arena and back to Hiashi for a moment as if confused. "Hi Tausen, but what about Nisan? Shouldn't I watch her too? I mean, she's strong too," replied the boy with a note of curiosity present in his tone. Hitomi looked over at Hiashi as well, hoping that the man would not say something to upset the boy. Hiashi, however, held no true dislike for her daughter and was able to word his response accordingly. "Hi Hanabi, your Nisan is strong as well to have made it to the finals, but hers is a different strength than that of the Hyuga style." Hiashi began getting a confused look from Hanabi. "You see, your Nisan uses other skills in tandem with our gentle fist style to help her battle, and that means she cannot become a true master of the gentle fist, because to be a master is to have the style alone as your weapon. That way, no matter your situation or armament, you are always prepared to defend yourself, and sadly, Hinata isn't that kind of Hyuga." Hiashi finished, getting a small nod of understanding from Hanabi as he looked down at his two relatives as they turned to face each other in the arena below. But what if I'm like Nisan and not meant to be a master either?" asked the boy, not looking up as he spoke. Hiashi allowed his stoic face to soften slightly as he looked over at his Sachi. "Don't worry Sachi, you have the true makings of a great master of the gentle fist just like you cousin," and I reassured the man as he looked over at Hitomi expecting a smile from her. Hitomi, however, was looking at him with a slight touch of sadness in her eyes. After Hanabi's birth, Hiashi had moved away from Hinata, dedicating his time to Hanabi, who he expected to replace him someday as head of the clan. Hiashi didn't hate his daughter, but had labeled her as a relative failure in the clan style, and to that effect had spoken well of her on only rare occasions. Over the past few months he had lessened his negative remarks, particularly around Hanabi, thanks to Hitomi's intervention, but it was clear that while Hiashi did not hate his daughter, he felt her as an example of what Hanabi should avoid, and that stigmatism made the interactions between the families tense. "Just watch Hiashi-kun, and we'll see just how great your Musume is," thought Hitomi while moving a hand to rest on her Sachi's head. "Don't worry Sachi, your Nisan is going to show everyone her kind of gentle fist, and then you can be just like her if you want to be," smiled Hitomi as Hanabi looked up at her and gave a small smile and nod. Hiashi shot his wife a small annoyed look but decided to leave it at that. He may not relish the idea of watching Hinata be bested in combat, but it was an inevitability once she stood to face a prodigy of the true gentle fist. Down below, Hinata and Niji had moved into position across from one another, both falling slowly into their gentle fist styles, with their palms outstretched, pointed towards one another's chests. "Okay, you two, same rules apply, so keep from forcing me to intervene, understand?" asked the Jonin, looking between the two. Niji let his face turn into a small smirk before responding. "Hi, but I wouldn't worry yourself, this match will be over in no time," spoke the boy in a cocky tone, causing the Jonin to roll his eyes and look over at the pale-eyed girl, who seemed to have been unaffected by the other's taunt. "Hi Jonin-san, I am prepared," she replied, activating her Byakugan with a slight pulse of chakra. Niji soon did the same, as the Jonin gave a small shrug and leapt a small distance back from the two, calling as he did. "Okay, second match of the Chunin exams finals, Hyuga Niji vs Hyuga Hinata, go," he shouted, and both teams shot towards one another. The two figures streaked over the dirt floor, kicking up small clouds of dust as their feet slammed down, propelling themselves forwards, their eyes fixed straight ahead so that wide eyes stared back at each other as they closed. As the two met, they both threw a palm strike forwards towards the other chest, while keeping a seemingly calm demeanor chiseled onto their faces. The two palms struck forwards and were both simultaneously countered as the two threw their arms up in a sharp angle, knocking each other's blows lightly off course and expelling a flash of blue chakra from both of their palms. As the two strikes went wide, Niji cocked back the hand he had used to block the initial blow before thrusting it forwards towards Hinata's exposed stomach. Seeing this, Hinata swept her blocking arm down vertically to intercept the blow. As Niji's hand shot forwards, Hinata's came crashing down on it, forcing Niji's blow down and away from Hinata's body and down where it would disperse on the ground. However, as Hinata connected with the arm, Niji allowed the blow to push his hand down without resistance. At the same moment, he bent down, transferring the momentum into his movements and directing Hinata's blow down and to the right, causing Hinata to unwillingly bend with the blow and expose her now unprotected side to Niji. Before Hinata could correct herself, Niji spun in place using the arm Hinata had hit to slam a palm strike into the girl's side and forcing her to bit back a scream of pain as his chakra slammed into her kidney. Hinata managed to fight through the pain and used the momentum of her misdirection to fling herself forwards a short way and spinning in time to divert another palm strike from Niji, who had predicted her attempted escape. As the second blow was parried, Hinata threw herself forwards, crashing her right shoulder into the advancing Niji. The boy was not prepared for such a frontal assault and was momentarily offset by the impact, giving Hinata an opportunity to lash out with a palm strike of her own. Niji caught the blow on one shoulder and allowed it to spin him slightly as he ignored the groan of pain from his shoulder. He dropped, then taking the spin into a sweeping kick that Hinata was forced to jump to avoid. However, this left her up in the air and unable to maneuver when as Niji slammed his feet into the ground and shoot both palms forwards to slam into Hinata's exposed stomach, sending his chakra into the girl's chest. And drawing forth a shout of pain from her lips as the force of the blow shot her back through the air for a few feet before she hit the ground, rolling slightly and managing to turn the hit into a roll, bringing her up onto one knee, panting slightly as she did. Niji in turn slowly moved himself back into the standard gentle fist style, a small smirk of apparent satisfaction on his lips. Hinata narrowed her eyes slightly as she pushed herself to her feet and whipped a trail of damp hair out of her eyes as she looked over to her cousin's position. With a small flick of her arm, she drew back her sleeve, exposing a series of senbon launchers, bringing up her other hand to trigger a salvo. With a flick of movement, some 10 senbon, their forms dripping with some kind of sinister substance, shot forwards towards the other Hyuga, who gave a smirk before effortlessly sweeping his hands back and forth, catching the missiles between the fingers of his palms. As he caught the final needle, however, he was forced to leap back as a palm strike of Hinata's lashed out towards him again, clipping his arm as he pulled it up in an attempt to deflect the blow. Hinata had known the senbon would never have hit their mark, but what she also knew was how Hyuga would respond to such an assault and that it would leave a tiny opening for a strike. Her strike had been on target, but Niji had noticed her plan at the last second and managed to bring an arm up, taking the blow on his exposed forearm rather than in his chest. There was a sharp stab of pain from the arm, but Niji didn't pay it any attention as he flung his left hand towards the girl before him as he took a small hop back, sending her own senbon back at her. Hinata was forced to duck and weave between the senbon before she was off again, springing forwards to where Niji was about to land. Unfortunately for her, Niji had managed to land and set himself back into his stance just as she reached him, and the two were again set in a pitched battle of palms, strikes, blasts of blue chakra shooting out as blow after blow was diverted or avoided. It was clear that Hinata was being pushed back, however, as Niji was able to bring his expertise and size into play in a match of straight gentle fist. Hinata seemed to recognize this and was waiting for an opening to separate from the close quarters battle. As the next palm strike shot towards the girl's chest, she pushed herself to close the distance between her and the strike, throwing the timing of the strike off as he forced her own palm into the blow, getting a shock as the chakra flared between the two strikes. Before Niji could recognize what she was planning, Hinata had stepped within his guard, closing her hand over his as she did and pulling as she swept one leg forwards towards the boy's now upset stance. Without any other choice, Niji allowed himself to be pulled forwards, turning the fall into a dive that carried him over the kick and a few feet past Hinata as he rolled spinning, expecting an oncoming strike. However, Hinata was not there. She had taken the momentary opportunity to skip back a few yards, her hand flying through a series of seals as she did. As she stopped planting herself, her hands fell on the final seal and she arched herself back slightly before spitting out a stream of compressed water with a cry of water bomb jutsu. The torrent of water shot forwards towards Niji, forcing him to leap right and left as Hinata sent two more blasts towards him, covering the field with a few puddles of water. As Hinata let her arms fall and took a second to catch her breath, Niji steadied himself and turned to face Hinata, that same proud smirk present on his face. "So is that all you have, Hinata-san? I thought you and your boyfriend were going to take the exam by storm, or are you just as much talk as he is?" called Niji in a jeering tone, attempting to anger the girl and hopefully throw her off. True, he was pushing the girl back, but she had been putting up a better fight than he had expected and he was in no mood to let this become a contest between the two of them. Hinata took a few steadying breaths before allowing a small sad smile to cross her own lips. Niji, I could say the same about you, weren't you the one who was declaring an easy victory at the beginning of this fight? Hinata replied without blinking. The boy's constant verbal attacks on both her and Naruto had added up until Hinata was struggling to keep from shouting back at the boy. Deep down, however, what she felt most of all was pity for the boy. The Hyuga family had always been a competitive family, forcing their children to fight to prove their own worth in the clan, and that world of competitiveness had forged the boy before her into someone who saw life and family and nothing more than a battle and opponents, and she wanted nothing more than to make him recognize that the world could be so much more than that. Unfortunately, her words seemed to infuriate the Hyuga boy, and without another word, he flung himself forwards towards her with a maddening look blazing in his Byakugan eyes. Seeing this, Hinata began to fly through hand signs as quickly as possible. When Niji was about halfway towards the girl, there was a distortion in the water scattered around as it congealed itself into several forms of Hinata before charging forwards. Niji found himself suddenly being attacked from all sides by a literal storm of Hinatas, each swinging an arm forwards to land a different blow on the boy. As the first water clone reached Niji, he fell back into his stance and with almost no effort slapped the clone's arm aside before driving his palm into the clone's face, causing it to explode in a shower of water as his chakra tore it apart from the inside. The next clone met with a similar fate as Niji simply grabbed its outstretched arms and sent a pulse through its arm, destroying it. Next, a clone from both left and right flew into the boy, but with a spin Niji forced the two to swing wide, and as their back became exposed, he delivered two quick blows, causing the pair to fall to puddles on the ground. As the two clones fell, Niji turned in time to see Hinata land on a final seal and send out another pulse of chakra. Before Niji could react, the final three clones collapsed into puddles of water that exploded into sudden life a moment later. Niji wasn't fast enough as several whips of water shot out of the water now surrounding him and wrapped themselves around his arms and legs, effectively nailing him to the arena floor. Seeing this, Hinata let out a small breath and affixed a weak smile to her face as she looked over at the trapped boy. It had been close, but she had managed to catch him by surprise and stop him from moving. Without the ability to dispel the water with his palms, the fight was looking like it could end very soon. Hinata fell back into her stance once again and charged forwards, looking to end the fight before Niji could force himself free of the bindings around him. However, just as she closed the distance, Niji's apparent angry look turned suddenly into a look of triumph as a massive amount of chakra exploded from all of his chakra points, shattering the water whips holding him pinned. Hinata already too close to halt her momentum, and the result was that she crashed headlong into the forming dome of chakra that Niji created as he spun himself, crying out as he did so. 8 trigrams palms revolving heaven. Shouted the boy as the dome snapped into shape and slammed into Hinata, throwing her a good distance away. She hit the floor of the arena with a nasty thump and rolled several feet before stopping and letting out a groan of pain. The sudden appearance of one of the Hyuga's most powerful techniques drew a myriad of different reactions from the onlookers. Over in the contestant box, Naruto was undergoing a mental battle at the moment as his hands gripped the railing and the sound of slightly grinding metal was heard. Juubi in the meantime had almost resorted to dragging Naruto half into his mindscape and pouncing on the boy to hold him down. Damn it, I'll tear him apart, who cares about him or his clan, heck, I'll take on the whole village now, let me go Juubi. Shouted Naruto in his own head. Juubi however ignored the boy's ranting and simply tightened her hold around the boy's neck. Oh no, you don't, Naruto, you know better than this, and you promised that you would let Hinata fight her own battles, or are you going to break your promise to her? Replied Juubi in a knowing tone. Naruto seemed to halt his struggling for a moment before relaxing his fight with Juubi and his grip on the railing. After a few deep breaths, the boy responded. Hi Juubi, you're right. Sorry, it's just hard sometimes, you know. Naruto said in a half-questioning tone. Juubi relaxed her hold before letting out a sad little sigh. Hi Naruto, it is, and I suppose that if it wasn't we wouldn't know how much we loved someone. But sometimes we need to let them fight their own battles. Besides, Hinata isn't going to lose that easily, so just stand here and cheer for her like she will be doing for you later. Finished Juubi. Naruto gave a small nod before relaxing himself and then cupping his hands to his mouth. Come on Hinata-chan, show that pompous ass what you're made of. Shouted Naruto at the top of his lungs, drawing a few looks from the rest of the booth. Minami in particular had to cup her hands over her mouth to stop a small giggle at Naruto's antics. Meanwhile, up in the stands, Hitomi was radiating a small amount of killing intent, causing the other four sitting around her to edge slightly away from the women. Without warning, Hitomi swiveled her head around to face Hiashi, and there was fire blazing in her eyes as she spoke. Hiashi, if your brother doesn't fix his Sachi's attitude, then make it perfectly clear to him that I will. Do I make myself clear? She said with a dangerous smile, turning her tone icy. Hiashi had to suppress a small shudder as he fought to keep his face from showing the fear he felt. Hitomi, this is a match and at this moment Hinata is an opponent, simple as that. I may not like his attitude, but he isn't doing anything against the rules. Replied Hiashi looking down at Hitomi, who gave him an angry look. Hiashi, I'm not talking about his action in the match, I'm talking about his actions towards Hinata outside of the ring, and how this whole damn family seems to think we have to fight each other, so let me put it simply, my children will never be part of this family fight again, do I make myself clear? Finished Hitomi, looking away from Hiashi and over to where Hanabi and Mito were watching the match with looks of concern upon their faces. Seeing this, Hitomi and Kushina both reached over to pat their children softly on the shoulder, causing the two to look up at them to be greeted by two hopefully consoling smiles. It's okay Mito, Hinata will be just fine, so why don't you and Hanabi get your special sign ready, okay? Whispered Kushina, smiling down at her Musum. Mito looked up at Kushina for a moment before giving her a smile and reaching over to poke at Hanabi, who was just finishing being comforted by Hitomi. Soon the two were busy bent over shifting through signs they had stashed under their seats. The Ashi in the meantime was watching the mothers and their children and felt a small pang of sadness as he remembered how he and his own brother would run to their mother, looking to find comfort from their own father's actions. As these thoughts and other worked their way through his mind, he absently turned his head to look over to where the rest of the Hyuga clan and his brother sat watching the match below and couldn't help but wonder if maybe he was truly making the right choice in regards to his family. While this had been occurring, the senseis had been distracted from the match by something that was quickly becoming a source of concern. When Naruto had been fighting with his emotions earlier, Asuma had been distracted as the odd little marble between his figures seemed to pull itself down towards the arena for a second. "What the?" spoke up the bearded man, looking down at the small marble that gave another tug before suddenly going still again. His exclamation drew the attention of Kakashi and Kurenai, who turned to look over at the man. "What is it, Asuma? The match is still going on," Kakashi said lazily, letting his one visible eye track over to his fellow sensei. "Oh, nothing Kakashi, sorry, just this marble thing seemed to tug all of a sudden, but I guess I could have been my imagination, I mean it's not doing anything now," replied Asuma. Kakashi looked over at Asuma for a second before speaking. "Asuma, when you say it was your imagination, do you mean you didn't feel anything from it?" asked Kakashi, a small note of authority in his voice as he spoke. True, Kakashi was a naturally lazy shinobi, but no one would dare to call him foolish. He had learned a long time ago that the devil can be in the details, and simply dismissing something could have horrible consequences. Asuma seemed to consider the masked sensei for a moment before speaking. "No Kakashi, I didn't imagine it, and there was something else, when it moved there was a faint pulse from it, I don't know what, but there was something there," replied Asuma, looking over at Kakashi, who closed his book and pulled back his headband to take a closer look at the marble. After a second he slipped the headband back into place. "Well, I can't see anything special about it, it's just a black ball as far as I can tell, nothing inside and no chakra I can see, just a solid black ball." "Where did you say you found that again?" finished Kakashi. Asuma gave a small shrug before replying. "Down below my chair," replied Asuma, looking over at Kurenai, who nodded before leaning down to examine under her own seat and sitting up a moment later holding a small ball of her own and a small worried look on her face. "There was one under mine too, and I saw a few more scattered down the row on either side of us. And I swear I've seen something like this before," she responded, looking over at her fellow senseis with a slightly worried expression. Kakashi pushed himself up from his seat with a small groan of effort. "Well, probably nothing, but I'll go and get some Anbu to take a look around and tell the Hokage, hey Kurenai, mind giving me that one?" finished Kakashi, holding out a hand. Kurenai passed him the small marble and soon Kakashi was making his way up the stairs while the other two looked on after him. Before they could speak to each other, however, their attention was drawn back to the fight below. In the arena floor, Hinata was slowly pushing herself shakily to her feet. Her legs and arms were pulsing slightly with the throbbing pain of the last blow that had thrown her across the arena floor. More than that, however, was the simple shock she was fighting back at seeing Niji pull out the heavenly revolution. How he couldn't have learned that from a main branch member. "And Niji, you truly are a genius of the gentle fist. But I won't let it end like this," Hinata thought, summoning the strength to steady her legs and raise her face to look over at Niji, who was sinking into a stance she vaguely recognized. Niji sunk into a stance with one arm cocked back as though he was going to throw a shot put forwards, except without the shot put. "Do you see now why you don't belong in our family, why you were passed over for your younger brother, or clan values strength, skill, and that is what you lack?" shouted Niji, a pulse of chakra running through his body as his eyes focused straight into Hinata's. Without a pause, Niji thrust his palm forward, shouting as he did so. "A trigrams vacuum palm." The pale-eyed boy called as an almost visible wave of chakra shot out, distorting the air as it flew forwards towards her, kicking stones and dust out of its path as it shot down range. The spectators held their breath as the wave approached Hinata, who to everyone else seemed to have bowed her head in acceptance of the coming blow. As the wave rushed forwards, Hiashi himself pushed himself slightly to his feet in a knee-jerk reaction to protect somehow. For several spectators, however, their expressions had moved from concern into small knowing smirks. Among them were a pair of children, a handful of genin, and 5 adults, 2 of which had just returned from the medical wing of the stadium, catch the last few minutes of the match. Just as the wave of chakra was about to impact the girl, there was a pulse of chakra from around her, and the girl's head snapped up, her eyes having shifted. The whites of the eyes had darkened to pitch black, while the center part, usually carrying a twinge of lavender, now seemed to glow slightly like a new summer's moon. The only one who could see this was Niji, but even he only caught the barest glimpse before Hinata swung one hand up in a graceful arc, more like the movement in a dance than anything else. Niji's eyes widened, his eyes blazed, seeing as the chakra blast he had shot forward split down its center, as if cut by some invisible blade. The two halves crashing into the dirt floor on either side of Hinata and throwing up a cloud of dust and debris that momentarily obscured Hinata's form from sight. Niji's mind was racing as his wide eyes cut effortlessly through the cloud to see the figure of Hinata shift slightly before him. As he watched, he saw the girl's chakra build moving differently through her, more fluid in a way, as if no longer simply running like a small river, and more crashing around like a waterfall, pushing itself along as if by its own intuition. The chakra, however, was not what it is attention, or more specifically the chakra racing through her network. His attention was drawn to 2 points on either side of Hinata's head, a small distance up on her head level with where her ears sat. The chakra seemed to slowly be pushing out of those spots, somehow congealing as it did, building on itself until what looked like 2 horns, that vaguely looked to him like long rabbit ears, were perched on top of the girl's head. What the hell is going on? How did she deflect my attack like that? And what the hell is happening with her chakra? What the heck is going on? Thought Niji, furiously forcing himself to fall into his gentle fist stance and preparing for whatever the girl had planned. There was a small discharge of chakra from Hinata, and the cloud seemed to evaporate from around her, revealing the horned girl to the stadium. Hinata seemed unconcerned with the look she was now receiving, sinking down into the gentile fist style she had been battling in before. "Niji?" called Hinata, causing the boy to snap out of his inner monologue long enough to take full notice of Hinata's posture and recognize what it meant. "I'm going to show you just what my style of the gentle fist is capable of," called Hinata, fixing her now night sky eyes upon Niji's blazing Byakugan. Before Niji even realized it, Hinata was charging across the arena floor, closing in fast on the Hyuga boy. As she closed, Hinata thrust out a standard palm strike, no different than the ones he had thrown since she had just began her training. Niji knew this strike, it was nothing he hadn't seen a million times before, but something struck him as odd about it. Hinata had made her strike a good 5 feet before reaching the boy, such an obvious strike could not hope to hit its target. Or at least that was what he thought before a concussive force slammed into his chest, pushing into him like the gentle fist strike it was, and forced the boy back a few steps as he attempted to recover. Before the boy could recover, Hinata was on top of him, swinging her arm around in a wave-like motion. The air between where her palm and the Hyuga boy seemed to waver for a moment before another blow caught the boy under the chin, throwing him a few feet away from the girl and onto his back, causing him to let out a short cry of pain as he landed. Hinata in the meantime had slowly lowered her hands back into position without relaxing her stance or taking her eyes from where Niji lay before her. The onlookers were looking on, many confused as to what they were watching, but none more so than Hiashi, who was staring wide-eyed down at the changed form of his eldest. Before Hiashi could do more than stare in disbelief at the scene before him, a movement and sound from his right drew his attention. "Biego, Hinata-chan. Come on, Hinata-nisan," called Mito and Hanabi while hoisting a sign above their heads, waving his back and forth as they continued to cheer. Hiashi took in the sight for a moment before his eyes were drawn to the sign itself. Written there in large black letters was "Go Bunny Nisan, you can do it. Go Team Kawaii." Along with the words there was also a few pictures, obviously of Hinata sporting bunny ears and having what appeared to be rabbits hopping around the outside of the sign. Hiashi looked from the sign and then down to the arena floor before looking back towards Hitomi, looking like a man desperate for any kind of understanding to the madness that was becoming his world. Hitomi for her part gave Hiashi a small comforting smile before reaching over with one soft hand and interlacing her fingers with his, never taking her eyes away from his own or letting the soft smile part from her lips. "Hiashi, now isn't the time to start explaining what this is, for now how about we help our Sachi cheer on our sunny place?" Hitomi said, not letting her smile fade. Hiashi seemed to want to argue for a split second but stopped as he saw the happy face of Hanabi and then back to his wife's smile before the fight simple went out of him. Hiashi drew in a small breath before tightening his hand around Hitomi's and turning back to watch the match in silence. Elsewhere in the stands, the Jonin senseis were looking on in simple silence, their minds racing as they tried to understand what they were seeing. Their students in the meantime seemed able to express their feeling pretty accurately. "What the hell is going on with Hinata?" called Ino, looking left to the rest of her team and right to where Yakumo sat beside Tenten, both girls looking over at her with equal looks of complete confusion upon their faces. Shikamaru was the first to speak, his fingers intertwined and his eyes fixed upon the arena. "Troublesome, Ino, please stop shouting, it isn't going to get you any answers," he said, keeping his voice calm as he analyzed the situation before him. Number 1, Hinata was displaying a new set of skills that he had never heard of. Number 2, from the cheering he could hear, as well as the sign he had glimpsed, it seems that her younger brother and his friend Mito knew. Given this, it was safe to assume that Kushina, and by extension most of her team including Naruto, knew of her abilities. Number 3, that information seemed to be known to only a few given his and the other sensei's reactions, as the other members of the Hyuga clan he could vaguely see from where he was sitting. All of this added up to the fact that Team 11 were keeping secrets. Before he could think further, his thoughts were interrupted again by Ino. "Come on, Shikamaru, you can't tell me this isn't weird. I mean, look at her, she looks like she has bunny ears, for crying out loud. Hey Yakumo, you said you met up with Team 11 a bit the other day, did you know she could do that?" finished the blonde, causing Yakumo to look up from the arena and over at her. "Wah. Oh no, nothing like that, I've never seen anything like that," replied Yakumo honestly, but with a speed that made her sound as though she was concealing something. Ino and most of the others were too concerned with the recent development to notice this, but Shikamaru wasn't among them. So Team 11 isn't the only ones keeping secrets. Or is it the same secrets? Something is going on here and I don't like it," thought the young Nara as he put his head down to brace against his interlocked hands, looking down at his feet. As he did so, his eyes caught a small black marble that had found its way under his seat. Shikamaru bent down, slowly catching the small ball up into his hand and looking at it with one eyebrow quirked up. "What the?" he thought, but before he could start to consider the orb in his hand, more noise from below drew his attention. Niji had managed to stagger himself back to his feet and was glaring towards his cousin with apparent hate etched into the features of his face. "What the hell is going on?" She was feet away, but it felt like she was landing solid blows on me, and what are with those eyes? Oh no. This is no time to get distracted, she is still the same weak girl she always was, and nothing is going to change that. Niji reassured himself as he settled into his stance and charged forwards towards where Hinata stood ready. Hinata braced herself for Niji's assault, striking forwards once again and allowing the chakra from her strike to travel a few feet from her before solidifying into a wave of chakra that could deliver her gentle strikes without having to lay hands on the target. Niji, however, caught sight of the girl's strike coming this time and managed to angle his body down and away from the strike, using her arm to guess the trajectory of the next blow. As he weaved forwards, Hinata stepped towards him, sending another strike forwards. Niji's body acted on instinct and he lifted an arm up, flooding it with chakra as he did so to block and redirect the blow he guessed was coming. However, as his arm came into contact with Hinata's strike, the blow, instead of being turned aside, instead slammed into his arm, driving it back with a stinging pain as the muscles and bones inside spasmed as Hinata's chakra crashed over it. Niji managed to push through the pain and thrust his unaffected right arm forwards to slam a blow into Hinata's shoulder. For a second, Niji felt a moment of hope as he saw Hinata's eyes cringe slightly at the blow, but his happiness was short-lived. As she brought her first arm back before slamming it forwards to crash into his open stomach, causing him to double over in pain as her chakra shot through him, hitting everything in its path before expelling and dispelling from his back. Niji let out a pain-choking noise as his legs lost their strength and he sank slowly to his knees, his arms drawn in to cradle his now screaming stomach. Seeing this, Hinata took a few steps back and lowered her arms, her two wide orbs suspended in their pool of black, never wavering from the figure before her. After a moment her voice came out, but not in the harsh tone it had worn earlier or the angry mocking tone that Niji had used. Her tone was soft and more than a little sadness was present in it as well. "Niji, please just stop this. We are family, please, we don't have to fight like this, please Niji, can't we just be a family?" she said, speaking slowly. From Niji there came several haggard breaths before a bark of angry laughter sprang from his lips as he turned his blazing eyes up to stare directly into Hinata. "Ah, a failure like you, talking like you knew anything. The law of our clan is the strongest are rewarded while the weak follow them, and I will not follow the pathetic words of someone like you. You may have some new power, but you are still nothing," shouted the boy before he kicked at the ground, forcing him back from Hinata as he threw a series of shuriken and kunai that he had pulled out while she had been speaking. Hinata was forced to avoid the weapons as she moved as if dancing gracefully, moving in and out of them. Niji, however, had noticed something about Hinata's new style. It may give her an increased range for her strikes, but her arms were the origin point as far as he could tell. If that were the case, then if he closed in on her, he could negate her advantage. So Niji charged forwards again, not waiting for his weapons to reach their target and rushing into another pitched battle with Hinata. Hinata's eyes tracked Niji's approach and she fired off a few quick strikes towards him while still avoiding the weapons, but her strikes went wide and soon Niji was beside her. As Niji's first strike came towards her, Hinata was forced to arch herself back, allowing the blow to sweep over her head before she thrust one of her hands back towards the ground, firing off another blast of chakra as she did. The effect was that as soon as Niji's arms had swept out over her, the blast of chakra functioned like a rocket, shooting her back up and inside of Niji's guard, where her second hand was already flying forwards towards the boy's chest. Niji had just a second to notice the blow coming and twisted sharply, allowing the blow to only catch the smallest part of his chest as it shot by. He then struck at her extended arm, slamming 4 blows one after another into it and drawing out a sharp cry of pain from the girl, who swung her left arm across her body and sending a wave of chakra into Niji's side. This time Niji did not fight the blast, but instead leapt with the impact, able to mitigate the damage, but flying away from her all the same. As he landed, his face once again had a prideful smirk upon it as he saw Hinata cradling her right arm, slightly pulling up the sleeve to see several black dots forming on her pale skin. She looked from her dotted arm to Niji with small look of shock on her face. Niji let out another pride-filled laugh as he made his way to his feet. You may have some new eyes and a headdress, but my eyes see everything and all I see is a failure who doesn't know it yet. He called. However, before he could say more, Hinata had gritted her teeth and swung her left arm into her right. Niji watched shocked as he watched a blast of chakra plow through her own arm. The arm jerking as her own chakra forced its way through it, distorting the air around it as it passed through. As her chakra flooded through the appendage, Niji was able to watch as his own plugs of chakra were forced out and her own chakra flooded back down her arm. Hinata looked over at Niji, her new eyes meeting his even as a bead of sweat ran down her face. No Niji, all you can see is what you want to, you're blind to everything else. She said, her voice tinged with sadness as she did. Her tone only seemed to enrage her fellow Hyuga, however, and Niji growled out a curse as he sank into a stance he hadn't used previously. Hinata was still recovering from the last attack as Niji let out a cry and launched himself forwards. Take this 8 trigrams 64 palms, Niji called as his hands blurred with motion, slamming one after another into Hinata. 2 palms, 4 palms, 6 palms. Called Niji after each successive blow landed on the girl, drawing forth a small cry of pain as it did. As the blows continued to mount up, Hinata was forced back. Niji was about to land the final blow when Hinata managed to force a blast of chakra before it was completely sealed off. The blast caught Niji right in the leg and managed to force him back just enough to allow Hinata to spin out of the boy's next strike, managing to dodge the final blow of the 64 palms. Hinata spun back away from Niji, her body racked with spasms of pain from the successful attacks, but still able to function. She looked up in time to see Niji closing in on her again, a look of pure hatred upon his face as he reached her and began to spin. This is the end of you, failure. 8 trigrams palms revolving heaven, Niji cried out, releasing a wave of chakra from his body as he spun the wall of spinning chakra racing towards Hinata's form. As Niji's eyes shifted to look at his target, he noticed an almost pitying look playing across Hinata's face, but he had no mind for anything but crushing the girl against his swirling wall of chakra. Just as the swirling dome was about to connect, the dome halted suddenly of its own accord, exploding out from its shape and shooting forwards. Niji stopped spinning just in time to see his chakra still visible, crashing forwards like a wave to where Hinata's hands were. The girl seemed to be paying the coming chakra no mind and was busy weaving a series of signs as the chakra form Niji's approached her. Just as the wave reached her, Hinata seemed to finish her signs and reached out with one hand, as if caressing a friend. Niji watched as his chakra floated into her open palm, as if it was a pet running up to its owner. Hinata caught the chakra before bringing it down to slap into the ground, crying out as she did so. Summoning! Cried Hinata, causing a cloud of smoke to explode before her. The next thing anyone knew, there was a large rabbit standing between the two teens, its large hammer set before it, as the breeze pushed its grey furry around and catching its blue jacket, making it billow out behind it. Niji looked on in a mixture of anger and confusion, seeing the pride of the Hyuga clan, their most powerful ability, twisted and turned into a rabbit. "Hinata-sama," spoke the rabbit, turning to see Hinata bruised and battered, but giving him a welcoming smile all the same. "Roku-san," she responded, giving the rabbit a small bow of her head in welcome. Roku's ears twitched slightly as he caught the sound of cheering from a section of the stands that he recognized as the happy calls of Mito and Hanabi. There were a few more surprised shouts from above, but Roku chose to focus instead upon his summoner before looking over to where Niji was glaring at him. As Roku's eyes fell upon the Hyuga, Niji did the most foolish thing he could have at the moment. He chose to insult Roku. A rabbit, pathetic of course, a failure like you would have a joke of a summon as well. I'll finish your pet before finishing you. Called Niji, his eyes narrowing upon the pair, not noticing the way Roku's ears seemed to twitch in irritation. There was brief pause as Roku turned so that Hinata was at his back and he was looking down at Niji before speaking. "Hinata-sama, is it safe for me to assume that this is my enemy?" asked Roku, his voice controlled but laced with disgust. Hinata looked from Roku to Niji for a moment before replying. Hi Roku-san, but he is also family. If you can please help me to knock some sense into him," asked Hinata in a soft voice. Roku seemed to consider her words slightly before hefting his hammer onto his shoulder, smirk playing across his face as he did so. "Hi Hinata-sama, I think I will enjoy educating this youth," replied Roku. As the two had been speaking, Niji had settled himself back into his stance and was poised to spring forwards once again. The boy's mind was racing, trying to force itself to understand what it was seeing, but anger and bruised pride kept him from behaving rationally. As Roku finished speaking, Niji shot forwards towards the creature, intending on dispelling it quickly before finishing off the girl behind it. Roku, however, had other ideas. As Niji came closer, the great rabbit took his hammer in a batter's grip and swung forward so fast that Niji had almost no warning to the coming blow. He had just enough time to throw himself wide of the swing so that the hammer passed him by pulling the air around his cloths as it did. However, his flight put him squarely in front of Hinata, who had both of her arms cocked back with chakra slowly pouring out of them, forming two blue orbs around the palms. Niji's eyes widened as Hinata thrust her hands forwards together, letting out a cry as she did. "Twin lion fist," she cried as the two balls of chakra roared forward, slamming into the boy and lifting him slightly off of his feet. The blow racked his body with fresh pain, but he was able to hold on to consciousness for a moment longer. However, this was not much of a comfort as Roku's second strike came swinging down. Niji did not have time to act before the great wooden weapon slammed into him, taking the wind out of him, catching him in the chest, adding its own bite to his latest hit. Roku's swing, however, unlike Hinata's, was not finished so quickly. As the rabbit carried through, the boy was lifted bodily from his feet and flung back, flying across the ground. Niji flew across the field like a rocket, his mind racing with pain and anger, but also with a small clarity. He had lost. This final though managed to come to life right before the boy slammed into the wall on the other side of the arena with a loud crash. The whole stadium went absolutely silent as Niji impacted the wall. It isn't every day you see a giant rabbit slam a hammer into a boy and a girl sprout horns after all. Roku in the meantime simply slammed his hammer back down in front of him with a satisfied smirk on his face, cocking his head sideways so that he could look back at Hinata, who was slightly out of breath from her last attack. "I would say that if that didn't knock some sense into him, nothing will," chuckled the rabbit, looking down at Hinata, who let out a sigh, letting her horns and eyes deactivate. "Thank you, Roku-san," Hinata said, giving the rabbit a tired but genuine smile. Roku simply nodded in reply before disappearing in a cloud of smoke. For a moment Hinata just stood in the center of the arena, the crowd still looking between her and where Niji had impacted the wall. Then there was a soft thump as Niji's form fell from where it had been embedded into the wall and not moving. The referee approached the downed boy, bending over him briefly before standing. He lifted one hand into the air before directing it towards Hinata. "Niji Hyuga is unable to continue. Hinata Hyuga is the winner," he called, his voice echoing around the stadium. Then there was an explosion of noise as the spectators shouted down at the match, some excitedly retelling parts, while others simply shouted in enjoyment from the excitement of it all. Hinata, however, didn't take notice of all of this, her eyes turned up into the stands to find where her family was seated. There she saw Mito and Hanabi excitedly waving their sign back and forth and obviously shouting something, while Kushina was excitedly pumping a fist up in the air with one hand raised to her mouth, evidently shouting something that was being drowned by the rest of the noise. However, Hinata's eyes were drawn to the other two figures, the seated forms of her cousin and Tausen, who gazed down at her. Hitomi was openly crying, but the smile on her face told Hinata that they were tears of joy and not sorrow. At that moment the woman was too overwhelmed with pride and happiness to do more than smile silently down at her Musume. The last figure, however, was the greatest shock. Hinata looked to see that Hiashi was looking at her. Really looking at her for the first time since she could not remember. His face showed many emotions, confusion, happiness, pride, wonder, but more than anything she saw in the man's eyes pleading. Pleading that he wasn't too late to try and be a part of his Musume's life. The long moment passed as Hinata looked into Hiyashi's eyes before a small smile spread across her face and she gave the man a small nod before turning to move back to the contestant box. Hiyashi tracked her process before turning slowly to see Hitomi looking at him, a small smile still playing across her lips. "I'm such a fool, my love," he whispered, tightening his grip on her hand as he spoke. Hitomi tightened her own hold before replying. "Hi, the biggest. But you know now." She replied with a smile as the children near them continued to cheer. As Hinata was passing the medic team on her way back to the contestant booth, a pair of voices called out to her from a blonde and black-haired pair. Hinata turned to see Tsunade and Shizune instructing the medical team who was lifting a limp Niji onto a stretcher. "Hey bunny, you sure did a number on him, I approve," called Tsunade as she gave Hinata a wave before allowing Shizune to step forward to give Hinata a swift hug. "Great job, that's my apprentice. I knew you could do it," Shizune said, giving Hinata a quick hug and smiling down at her. Hinata gave the pair a happy if weary smile before they headed back to the contestant box while the two women moved Niji off. The pale-eyed girl made her way up the steps to the contestant and almost jumped back as a blonde figure crashed into her, wrapping a pair of arms around her waist and swinging her around with an excited cry. "That's my bunny-chan, I knew you could take that idiot down a peg. You were amazing," called Naruto as she swung Hinata around, chuckling as he did. Hinata let out a happy giggle as she twirled. After a little while longer, Naruto set her back down, the two smiling happily at one another. "Thanks Naruto-kun," replied Hinata before a small cough drew her attention over to where the rest of the contestants were looking at them. Hinata blushed bright red and moved herself behind Naruto with a small leap. The rest of the contests let out small chuckles at the girl's actions, momentarily putting aside their questions about her match. However, that didn't last long as Shino approached the two. "Well done with your match, Hinata, I must say you showed quite a few different abilities out there," he said, his tone suggesting happiness even though his face was still concealed by his coat. Hinata gave a small nod of thanks while a few others stepped forwards to offer their congratulations. Only one person was absent from this. Naruto stood looking over at Hinata, her eyes narrowed but more in question than anything else. When Hinata had begun using her powers in the fight, Kyuubi had gone ballistic, telling her that somehow his father's enemy was connected to Hinata. As she looked at Hinata, she felt a small shiver run down her spine as her eyes turned to see Naruto looking directly into her eyes, blue into the purple and black ones, and a horrible thought went through her mind even as the referee's voice rang out. "Okay, next up Naruto Namikaze and Naruto Uzumaki, please make your way to the arena now," called the voice. Thank you for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the next part, don't forget to turn on notifications by hitting that bell icon. Please like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know your thoughts. Check out my other videos for more content you might enjoy. Until next time, take care.